7 years ago, on the exact day the disaster struck, the city was going about its day as usual. But suddenly, a young girl caught sight of a crimson glow in the distance and turned around. That was the moment the horror began. It was an event that would later be known as the dungeon break. Monsters of all kinds poured out from dozens of rifts scattered across the country, claiming countless lives.
Seong-yun's parents were among the victims of that tragedy. In an instant, he lost everything. With fury in his heart and tears of blood streaming down his face, he swore an oath to become a hunter and eradicate every single monster down to the last root. 7 years later, at the Disaster Memorial Park, a young man sat on a park bench with a large bag resting beside him. He was lost in thought, brooding over the fact that he had just been expelled from the hunter training center. With melancholy blue eyes, he questioned himself, "What kind of hunter am I?"
A man with a deep, gruff voice called out his name, Seong-yun, stating that he wanted to speak with him directly. Staring intensely at Seong-yun, the man coldly told him never to return to the training center again. Naturally, Seong-yun couldn't just accept this and asked why he was being expelled. The instructor replied that, generally speaking, an awakened individual should only need a few months to complete their training. Yet, Seong-yun had been there for 7 long years. Seong-yun stared back at him, confused as to why this was only being brought up now. The instructor continued bluntly, "You have no talent. To be honest, you're just trash." Seong-yun froze at those words. The instructor added that keeping Seong-yun at the center would only ruin the institution's reputation. Other trainees began to gather around. One of them admitted that even though Seong-yun came to practice every single day with high spirits, they couldn't help but feel sorry for him. However, another sneered, saying there was no need to pity a clueless fool who didn't know his place. Meanwhile, Seong-yun just stood there, paralyzed, as he overheard them questioning how it was even possible that after 7 years of training, his stats hadn't increased even a single point. He gripped his drink can tightly, biting his lower lip. In his mind, he thought, "Forget about a unique trait or special abilities. Even my base stats have never gone up."
A few moments later, the rain began to pour. Seong-yun stood in front of a door and knocked. The door was opened by his instructor, who immediately ordered him to get lost. However, Seong-yun stood his ground and pleaded, "Please, help me take the hunter exam just one more time. I can't give up like this." The instructor fell silent for a moment before his anger completely exploded. "You piece of trash! You still don't get it, do you?" Seong-yun had never seen him this furious before, which made him flinch. The man pointed at his own shoulder and demanded to know if Seong-yun had only come back to demand a refund for all the tuition money he had wasted over the years. But Seong-yun fiercely denied it. He opened his mouth and yelled, "This isn't about the money!" Without warning, a heavy punch slammed into his face, sending him crashing backward into a pile of garbage bags. The man scoffed with a cynical smirk, telling Seong-yun to at least stop lying to himself. Seong-yun sat drenched in the rain among the heaps of trash, staring down in silence. He began to fantasize about what it would be like if he just possessed a unique trait. But reality crashed back in. He didn't have a single ounce of talent.
Suddenly, a system window materialized in front of him, announcing that the Tower of Trials commended him for possessing an exceptionally powerful will. Seong-yun, suddenly realizing he was submerged in water, opened his eyes wide in utter confusion, wondering who was praising him. He began to be dragged down into a swirling puddle of rainwater, panic taking over his expression. All of a sudden, a loud screech echoed throughout the entire area, prompting the instructor to run out of his house, shouting for him to shut up. But when he looked at the pile of trash, Seong-yun was gone. The instructor scanned the surroundings in complete bewilderment. He then picked up the dark brown-haired man's head, tossed it into the garbage, and muttered mockingly, "Weakling." Meanwhile, our main protagonist was plummeting down into a watery abyss. Puffing out his cheeks, he desperately tried to hold his breath. Suddenly, the water violently spat him upward, and he began free-falling into the depths below.
Then, another system message appeared, stating that the Tower of Trials had selected all eligible candidates from the surface of Earth. Seong-yun was then prompted to choose the difficulty level of his trial, with the warning that the rewards he would receive would strictly depend on the difficulty he selected. Hesitantly, he bit his lip, not fully understanding what was happening.
However, as he stared at the 3 difficulty options, his instincts told him that this was an opportunity he couldn't afford to waste. With a gaze full of conviction, the protagonist pressed one of the buttons and a blinding light instantly flashed before him. The system declared its hope that the suffering he was about to endure would yield satisfactory results. It was then announced that he would immediately descend to the first floor of the trial tower. A moment later, Seong-yun found himself standing in the middle of a vast desert. A single sword materialized and plunged straight into the sand right in front of him. The system then proclaimed that the theme of this trial was survival, and the reward for clearing this challenge would be a unique characteristic.
Reading the information, Seong-yun froze. He flashed back to his grueling days at the training center. He thought that perhaps this was finally the moment where he could attain what he had been fighting for over the last 7 years. Smiling like a man who had lost his mind, he thought to himself that all of this was absolutely insane. He began to take a step toward the sword. Suddenly, however, the sand beneath his feet shook violently. He lost his balance and tumbled forward. He yelled out loud, "What is going on?" Panic became starkly visible on his face as the system announced that the training trial was about to begin and the difficulty level chosen in the trial tower was hard. A colossal sand golem materialized before him. Seong-yun stared upward, casting a look of pure disbelief at what he was witnessing. The system notification stated that he had to survive within a limited time frame. The remaining time, 9 minutes and 58 seconds. Seong-yun immediately bolted away from the golem. Another blue screen popped up in front of him, and fear froze on his face. It explicitly stated that the penalty for failing to complete this trial was death. Seong-yun kept running until at a certain point, he himself began to doubt his ability to escape this way. With its massive size, the golem could move significantly faster. To make matters worse, he had to run on shifting sand, which rapidly drained his stamina.
Given his current physical condition, running to survive for a full 10 minutes was practically impossible. The system had given him a sword and commanded him to survive. That meant Seong-yun was left with 2 choices: die trying to run away or die fighting. He began to brainstorm a way to defeat it. Suddenly, the faces of the people who had mocked and bullied him all this time flashed through his mind. He remembered how he had always been looked down upon and even called completely useless. He was sick and tired of it all. Refusing to die a meaningless death just because he chose to run away, Seong-yun whirled around and changed his direction. If he died here, he would never become a hunter, let alone avenge the deaths of his parents who perished in the disaster. He certainly wasn't going to roll over and give up. He decided to fight to the bitter end, even if it meant ultimate defeat. According to theory, a golem monster would stop moving if its core was destroyed. That core was usually located in a spot that was hard to reach. Therefore, he intentionally baited the golem to follow him up to higher ground. Upon reaching the top, he immediately dodged the golem's strike, causing the monster to lose its balance and crash down under its own massive weight. Seong-yun used the resulting wave of sand to close the distance to the golem. He knew everything hinged on perfect timing. So he waited for a split second and leaped. A moment later, he was riding on the falling golem's body and the creature's core came into view.
With a confident smirk, he swung his sword down towards the core in the golem's chest. However, to his shock, his sword deflected right off it, leaving only a tiny crack. Seong-yun realized that the core was far sturdier than he had anticipated. With his jaw clenched and the face twisted in terror, he cursed under his breath and swung his sword again, desperate to shatter it. Suddenly, the golem's massive hand gripped his body tight, making Seong-yun let out an agonizing scream. In his mind, he knew what was coming. What he saw was no longer the golem, but the faces of the people who had once laughed at him and belittled him. With his hands bleeding, Seong-yun gripped the hilt of his sword with everything he had. A fire of pure rage ignited in his eyes as he screamed, commanding all those voices to shut up.
He threw his sword with absolute fury, driving the blade straight into the golem's core. The golem unhinged its jaw and slowly began to crumble. Pieces of the monster's massive body started falling apart alongside the cascading sand. A notification popped up on the screen. Remaining time, 7 minutes and 8 seconds. Seong-yun had successfully cleared the training trial. The golem's body broke down completely, scattering into nothingness. Shortly after, Seong-yun woke up from beneath the pile of sand. He fell to his knees, utterly stunned, unable to comprehend how he had actually managed to defeat a sand golem. A satisfied smile crossed his face as the realization sank in. He had really done it. He stood up, and the system immediately congratulated him on successfully conquering the first floor of the trial tower.
In his heart, Seong-yun felt profoundly grateful. Though he had come dangerously close to losing, in the end he had survived. The blue screen flashed new information, rewarding him with a single unique trait. He also gained 1,000 points along with an added bonus, the E+ rank rapid recovery skill and an extra 500 points. Seong-yun's mouth hung wide open in sheer shock. Standing before the screen, he thought to himself that he was deeply moved. For 7 long years, his glorious work had met nothing but mockery and insults. But now, he finally had the path to become a hunter. Then, a new notification flashed. Unique trait, F-rank necromancy has been unlocked. Seong-yun stood frozen, reflecting and realizing that all of this would only ever matter if he managed to stay alive.
Suddenly, his eyes locked onto a swirling mass of red and black energy manifesting right in front of him. Clutching his steel-wounded shoulder, Seong-yun wondered what it could be. He thought, is this black mist really rising from where the golem died? The moment he touched it, a holographic tablet appeared with text stating that his unique trait had been activated. The system then asked if he wished to absorb the sealed golem spirit. With a stunned expression, Seong-yun wondered if this black mist was the true form of his new power. He pressed the yes button. Shards of energy began rising from the golem's residual core, flowing directly toward him. His eyes widened in absolute awe. The system notified that he had successfully absorbed the golem spirit, increasing his skill mastery by 7%. Seong-yun hunched over, paralyzed in silence. He stared at his hands in utter bewilderment. Suddenly, a surge of blood energy began to seep deep into his chest. He gasped for air, panting heavily until the energy fully fused with his body. Another notification appeared, stating that his current spirit count was now 1 out of 5. Seong-yun snapped out of it, realizing he could physically feel the golem spirit's presence resting within him. As it turned out, he could store the spirits he absorbed and even utilize them. Reading through the details, he discovered that these spirits could be consumed to permanently increase his physical attributes. Without a second thought, he decided to test it. Instantly, his strength increased by 3 points and his stamina went up by 2 points. He could literally feel it, like raw energy surging through his veins.
For the past 7 years, he had never been able to raise his stats by even a single point. Yet here he was, finally succeeding. His unique trait profile opened up completely. The description stated that the primary effect of this power was the ability to absorb the spirits of the dead and command them at will. The secondary effects included permanent stat increases as well as the ability to store spirits and deploy them whenever needed. Overjoyed, Seong-yun thought that he could truly become a great hunter if he managed to make it back to Earth. Suddenly, a small portal began to form in front of him. The system screen instructed Seong-yun to wait in a designated waiting room, and he decided to step through. Taking slow, calculated steps, he walked straight into the rift. A split second later, the portal warped him to a different location, and his body collapsed onto a freezing cold floor. He lay there, groaning softly, realizing that his injuries were actually far worse than he had initially thought. Suddenly, a vibrant green light enveloped him, and his eyes snapped open in surprise. Slowly pushing himself up, Seong-yun stared at his hands and his body, which had now fully recovered. His wounds were entirely gone, as if they had never existed in the first place. He walked around slowly, taking note of the vast empty room that contained nothing but a single bed. He threw himself onto the mattress, staring blankly at the ceiling. He questioned himself in the silence. What am I supposed to do now? Can I really get out of this tower? He also tried to make sense of why the tower had summoned him here of all places.
However, his daydreaming was suddenly cut short. A fresh message materialized right before his eyes. The prompt informed him that 5 main voice commands were now available for his use: information, store, community, inventory, and challenge. Simply speaking any of these commands would instantly activate the corresponding feature. He slapped his own cheeks to force his focus back and told himself that for now he had to prioritize survival. Seong-yun then activated the challenge command. The system displayed that the time remaining until the second floor trial was 23 hours and 21 minutes. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he realized a long line of grueling trials still awaited him. Next, he tried opening the community tab. A notification popped up, informing him that he had successfully entered the high-difficulty community channel. A chat log opened up, and the people inside were already frantically typing out their utter confusion. Some demanded explanations for what was happening. Others were screaming for their stats to be restored, and one person even wrote that they had never even been a hunter before.
Suddenly, an administrator entered and locked the chat column.
The admin typed out that they possessed crucial information to share with those who had successfully cleared the tutorial trial. Sitting on the edge of his bed, Seong-yun secretly hoped that the admin might reveal a way to return home. Instead, the administrator posted that they would teach everyone how to utilize the points accumulated during the tutorial. The admin explained that points served as the primary currency within the trial tower, which could be used to purchase items from the store. Points could also be transferred to or received from other community members. Seong-yun read the messages with a look of horror, especially when it was explicitly stated that not even a single drop of water could be obtained without points. The only way to earn points was through the trials. Picturing himself dying of thirst and starvation, he realized he had to thoroughly understand and adapt to the tower's ruthless rules. The grim fact that even basic water required points made it crystal clear. Survival meant conquering every single challenge ahead. After delivering the information, the admin logged out of the chat room. Seong-yun touched his face, muttering to himself that he had initially thought he could easily become a hunter if he made it back. He turned his head to look at the sword hanging on the wall. Noting that a sword alone wouldn't give him much of an edge, he activated the store feature.
Shortly after, he equipped himself with a shield. He swung his sword, mind racing with the realization that all the other hunters had also lost their stats upon entering the tower. He leaped off the floor, training aggressively, acknowledging that even with reset stats, experienced hunters would likely relearn their old skills much faster than him. Seong-yun dodged to the side, drilling into his mind that he was not starting from the same baseline as them. If he didn't train twice as hard, he would never catch up. After some time, he collapsed onto the floor from sheer exhaustion. A gentle light enveloped his body. He stood up and stretched, profoundly grateful for the waiting room's passive healing effects, which allowed him to train relentlessly without injury and prepare for the upcoming trial. Suddenly, he froze as his stomach let out a loud rumble. Seong-yun opened his inventory, wondering how to deal with his hunger. He rifled through his bag and bit into a piece of jerky. He panicked internally, realizing he only had 40 points left after purchasing his gear. If it hadn't been for the bonus points, he couldn't have even dreamed of buying a shield. The system then displayed that the time remaining until the second trial was 17 minutes and 17 seconds. Staring at the blue screen, Seong-yun realized how quickly time was slipping away. Even the once boisterous chat community had gone dead silent as the second trial loomed closer. He stood frozen. For a brief second, he questioned whether he would be able to survive again, given that this challenge felt exponentially heavier. Seong-yun violently brushed the doubts aside, firmly telling himself that he would absolutely make it out alive this time too. Only 10 seconds remained before the second trial commenced. As the countdown ticked down to 0, the waiting period officially ended. The system prompted Seong-yun, asking if he was ready to face the second floor trial. He firmly answered yes and stepped directly into the forming portal.
A moment later, Seong-yun found himself standing in the middle of a dense forest, and system notifications began to flood his vision. The prompts announced that he had entered the second floor of the high-difficulty trial tower. He gasped, muttering under his breath that this time he was truly in a wilderness. The system then informed him that the primary objective of this trial was assassination. He was ordered to assassinate the orc chief within the designated time limit. The screen displayed a projection of the chief, a massive figure wielding a staff, actively commanding his forces. Seong-yun stood at the edge of a steep cliff, looking down to see a small encampment nestled in the valley below. With his mouth half open, he wondered if that was where the orc tribe actually lived. Peering closer, he spotted dozens of large, green-skinned monsters roaming the camp. Anxiety washing over his face, he muttered to himself, were they seriously ordering him to dive straight into a den full of orcs just to kill their leader? Sunlight pierced through the canopy, illuminating the encampment. 2 heavy guards stood watch at the main entrance. Crouched behind the thick bushes, Seong-yun kept a vigilant watch. He calculated that in typical dungeons, if an orc tribe deployed sentries, it was almost guaranteed that they had hunting scouts patrolling the perimeter as well.
Seong-yun felt deeply unsure whether he could defeat even a single orc hunter, let alone such an overwhelming number of them. To take down an entire orc tribe, it usually required a well-coordinated team of at least E-rank hunters. In other words, his current chances of winning were practically 0. With a grim expression, he fell into deep thought. What was he supposed to do now?
Seong-yun sat back against the dirt, realizing that his immediate first step had to be a strategic retreat to draw up a plan. But moments later, a sharp smile crossed his face as he remembered a clever loophole that might just help him bypass this impossible trial. In his hand, he held a burning torch. Sitting on the ground, he had managed to gather a substantial pile of firewood. He stared at the dancing flame of the torch, then pulled up the blue system interface. He pushed the torch directly into the screen, and it was instantly logged into his inventory. Smiling with satisfaction, he breathed a sigh of relief. The trick actually worked. Birds fluttered above the lush green canopy of the forest. As he kept a vigilant watch over the encampment, Seong-yun noted to himself that although orcs looked like lazy pigs, they were actually a highly disciplined race. Sheltered behind a thick tree trunk, he calculated that the orc hunters typically set out in the morning and wouldn't return until dusk. That meant he still had enough time. Picturing the massive swarm of orc warriors, Seong-yun knew that the only way to tear through such overwhelming numbers, which was the core obstacle of this trial, was to use fire. He continued to surveil the camp gates from the shadows of the trees. He recalled data from the Hunter Association stating that orc guards don't maintain a strict 24-hour watch. They usually head back into the village during mealtimes or rest periods. Seizing the window of opportunity, he darted forward and hurled the torch. Sprinting through the brush, he began setting the surrounding trees ablaze. Before long, aggressive flames began devouring the forest and tearing into the encampment.
The orcs scrambled in a panic, carrying wooden buckets of water in a desperate bid to put out the wildfire. Watching the thick blankets of smoke rise from the camp, Seong-yun calculated that once the fire completely scorched the village, he wouldn't have to worry about running into the orc hunters returning from their patrol. Even so, he needed to assassinate at least 2 orc workers before the fire consumed the entire settlement. One of the workers appeared to have split from the group, heading down to fetch water from the river. Hearing a sudden rustle, the orc spun around, and at that exact moment, Seong-yun drove his sword deep into its back. Shards of red and black energy began manifesting into a shadowy silhouette around the corpse. The system popped up, asking if he wished to absorb the orc's soul. Seong-yun answered yes, a deeply satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "This is exactly what I've been waiting for," he muttered. The raw energy from the orc began coursing into his chest. A system notification flashed. Seong-yun has successfully absorbed the orc spirit, increasing his power mastery to 9%. Suddenly, another towering orc materialized right behind him. Seong-yun gritted his teeth and spun around on his heel. He immediately recognized the monster as one of the elite guards. In a flash, he managed to parry its heavy strike with his sword. Furrowing his dark brows, he immediately triggered his absorption skill. A vibrant blue light flared up, and the system prompt informed him that he could boost his statistics by consuming his stored spirits. Instantly, his physical strength shot up by 4 points, and his agility increased by 2 points.
With newfound power, Seong-yun swung his sword with absolute fury. Meanwhile, the wildfire continued to spread rapidly across the perimeter. After a brief skirmish, Seong-yun managed to harvest another orc spirit and immediately activated his passive rapid recovery. He further optimized his stats using the stockpiled spirits. He clenched his fists as he watched the new logs flash: stamina +4, strength +2, and agility +3. He felt a profound sense of relief, knowing that engaging an orcdar no longer carried an immediate risk of death. Shortly after, our protagonist emerged from the blazing inferno. A few remaining orcs stared at him, their eyes wide with raw terror. In his mind, he quickly took head count. 3 orc workers and 1 elite guard stood before him, along with the grand leader himself. There were 5 targets in total. Locking his eyes onto the chief, he calculated that if he could tactically maneuver around the elite guard, he could reach the chief with ease. He lunged forward with explosive speed, cutting down 3 orcs in a rapid, seamless sequence. Thanks to the stats he harvested from the previous guard, handling these low-level grunts was significantly easier. Fueled by confidence, he charged forward. Spotting another orc closing in from his blind spot, he swiftly raised his shield, absorbing the heavy impact of the enemy's weapon. Gritting his teeth, he held his ground forcefully, determined to plow right past the guard and close the distance to the chief. From the guard's frantic movements, it became clear that the monster had abandoned its defensive post as a personal bodyguard to engage him directly. This meant the elite guard was the absolute final barrier. Fueled by pure adrenaline, the protagonist swung his blade with everything he had. The razor-sharp steel tore cleanly through the guard's torso. At that exact moment, volatile embers began condensing violently over the chief's staff. Having just dealt with the elite guard, Seong-yun was caught completely off guard as the chief unleashed a massive roaring pillar of fire directly at him. Paralyzed by shock, Seong-yun froze in his tracks, completely unsure of how to react.
However, at the absolute last second, he managed to raise his shield, barely bracing himself against the lethal blast. The elderly chief laughed boisterously. Yet from the thick, billowing plumes of smoke, the silhouette of a human gradually materialized. Raw shock flared in the orc's eyes. Seong-yun stood there, his jaw clenched tight as he held his battered shield with a vice-like grip. Floating above his head, a notification indicated that he had achieved a new milestone, the one who endured the flames, along with the acquisition of the fire resistance skill. Locking his sharp gaze onto the monster with a fierce, angry smile, the young man muttered that it was all over. Seong-yun stared dead into the orc chief's eyes. Screaming at the top of its lungs, the chief swung its staff once more, channeling another burst of flame magic. A split second later, the protagonist's blade flashed through the air, completely severing the chief's hand. The orc shrieked in agonizing pain. It froze for a moment, staring at Seong-yun in horror, before turning and fleeing into the main tent. Seong-yun calmly observed the retreat before slowly following it inside. With a single slash, he ripped through the fabric of the tent entrance. But suddenly he froze, completely stunned. Inside, the Grand Orc was sitting on the ground, desperately wrapping its remaining arm around two small orc toddlers who were trembling in absolute terror. Moments later, another baby orc crawled towards Seong-yun's feet, crying as it began tugging weakly at his pants. For a fleeting second, Seong-yun thought to himself that even monsters like them had families they cherished. For some reason, a sudden heaviness gripped his heart, making him hesitate to slaughter them. He flashed back to his own parents, who had shielded him with their lives on the day of the disaster so that he might survive.
But while Seong-yun was lost in his thoughts, the baby orc suddenly tried to seize his weapon and attack. Before it could strike, Seong-yun slammed the hilt of his sword hard against its head, shouting that these orcs were absolutely nothing like him. Glaring down at the young monster, he resolved that even if he had to become a demon himself, he would still eradicate every last one of them. The chief lunged at him alongside the remaining guard, but Seong-yun swung his blade in a wide, fluid arc, instantly cutting them both down. Shortly after, the system congratulated him on successfully conquering the second floor of the trial tower. Looking down at his shattered shield, he realized it was completely ruined and unusable. Still, it was thanks to that very shield that he had managed to stay alive. Opening the blue system interface, he muttered to himself that he had nearly failed this time as well. He noted aloud that the number of trial participants had already been cut nearly in half. Seong-yun's eyes narrowed as he focused on a specific message in the community chat. Someone claimed they had discovered a way to return to Earth by submitting a question ticket. Seong-yun briefly envisioned a peaceful crowd of people strolling under the bright sun in a park. He recalled that information was one of the 5 essential commands within the tower. He opened the inquiry tab and read that he could submit a question, which an administrator would answer once the process was finalized. Every time a participant entered a new floor, 1 question ticket would be credited. Seong-yun realized he could utilize his right to ask questions here. It was also noted that the chat system would naturally evolve into a hub for information exchange based on the answers provided by the administrators. He summarized the core points, filtering out the minor details.
Furthermore, the log stated that after successfully clearing the 5th floor, temporary fire stones would be put up for sale, mystical magic stones that would allow participants to return to Earth for a few days. After the 8th floor, this feature would become widely accessible. As announced, a massive expansion of the system was underway. Various items would be introduced to the store, finally allowing players to return to Earth permanently. Seong-yun pressed his lips into a tight line, calculating his odds. If he returned to Earth with just his current skill set, once his traits fully matured, he could easily become an A-rank hunter. A blue screen materialized, displaying his F-rank necromancer unique trait with a mastery level of 65%. Running his hand through his hair, he muttered that this ability would give him a massive advantage back on Earth. Yet, a shadow of sorrow crossed his face. He admitted to himself that he had barely scraped through the 2nd floor, and the 8th floor still felt worlds away. Even so, he shook it off, telling himself he had to stay Tuesday. The stats that had stubbornly remained at 0 for 7 years were now rapidly approaching the baseline average of 20 points. His status window popped up, displaying all of his newly heightened attributes. Seong-yun dropped his primary weapon onto the floor, and in that instant, a dark, blood-like aura ignited violently from his chest.
Berikut adalah terjemahan kelanjutan narasi ke dalam bahasa Inggris Amerika dengan gaya yang intens, penuh aksi, dan sinematik. Deep down, he realized that he had to immediately absorb the 5 spirits he had obtained by putting his life on the line. Once he fully absorbed all 5 spirits, his statistics skyrocketed drastically. Seong-yun's eyes widened in utter shock. He could feel the raw power violently surging through his veins. Without a second thought, he bolted forward, gaining so much momentum that he was able to run horizontally along the ceiling of the room. Seong-yun was completely spellbound, realizing that he had finally surpassed human limits, something he used to only read about in textbooks. He leapt from the ceiling, but a split second later, his expression twisted into panic. A loud, echoing thud resonated through the room. His body slammed hard against the wall before sliding down onto the floor. Wiping a streak of blood from his nose, he muttered that his body had not yet adjusted to the sheer sensation of his newfound strength. To counter the side effects of his rapid physical growth, he quickly activated the store command. Seong-yun purchased a shield crafted from a dead giant tree for 2100 points, then opened his inventory. He calculated that this was the perfect moment to equip the rewards from his previous trial. He gazed at the Black Iron Sword, an IPL rank weapon that granted a passive bonus of +5 to reaction speed and +10 to attack speed. He also possessed a D-rank Assassin's Cloak, which reduced detection sensitivity by 10% and boosted movement speed by 15% for 1 minute if the user's agility fell below 50. Seong-yun equipped all of his new gear, letting out a deep breath as he resolved that he needed to familiarize himself with this equipment before diving into the next trial. Wasting no more time, Seong-yun stepped forward and firmly gripped the hilt of his sword. As he swung the blade through the air, he swore an oath in his heart that one day he would become so powerful that absolutely no one would ever be able to catch up to him. Water dripped slowly from the stalactites of a dark cavern just as a human figure materialized from a forming portal. The system announced that he had successfully entered the 3rd floor of the high-difficulty trial tower. The theme of this particular trial was a duel. Seong-yun's mouth dropped open in surprise as he wondered if he was truly standing inside a subterranean cave. He looked up, scanning the jagged crevice above his head.
Moments later, a notification flashed, warning him that the Guardian of Darkness will manifest in 10 seconds. He immediately dropped into a low combat stance, well aware that, just like the Sand Golem before, the enemy could ambush him from any conceivable direction. He had to stay completely vigilant. 5 seconds remaining. 3 seconds. 1 second. The system officially announced the arrival of the Guardian. Suddenly, a humanoid shadow coalesced right behind him. Seong-yun flinched as the Shadow Guardian lunged, unleashing a vicious weapon strike. Following the initial clash, the shadowy figure let out a smug grin. The system displayed the mission objective: defeat the Guardian of Darkness, the Shadow. Turning around in pure fury, Seong-yun retaliated with a sharp, heavy kick. The two now stood deadlocked, staring each other down. The doppelganger bared its sharp fangs, flashing a sadistic smirk, while Seong-yun stood panting heavily. Instantly, Seong-yun's rapid recovery skill kicked in. He thought to himself that if he hadn't reacted in the nick of time, his spine would have been completely shattered. He pressed his lips together, intently analyzing the doppelganger's fighting technique. Observing that the entity's combat stance was a mirror image of his own, suspicion began to creep in. Was this creature perfectly mimicking his every move? Deciding to test his hypothesis, he bolted forward and abruptly feinted, sliding right past the monster's flank. The doppelganger looked momentarily bewildered. Suddenly, a spray of dark blood painted the air. Seong-yun came to a halt a safe distance from the doppelganger. Watching the fresh wound on the monster's body slowly knit back together, Seong-yun smirked, realizing that the enemy also possessed a passive self-healing skill. Now, it was the enemy's turn to go on the offensive. The doppelganger executed the exact same sequence of movements Seong-yun had used moments prior.
Seong-yun swiftly extended his leg, noting internally that he had fully anticipated this creature would mirror his actions. He struck the counterblow before the monster could even complete its assault. He already knew exactly how to counter his own techniques. Now, the momentum of the battle was entirely in Seong-yun's hands. He continuously pressed the doppelganger, driving it back and cornering it against the cavern wall to deliver the decisive finishing blow. However, right as he was about to execute his opponent, the glint of a blade suddenly flashed directly in front of his eyes. A sharp metallic clang echoed through the cave, forcing both fighters to break away and leap in opposite directions.
Seong-yun's mouth hung open in utter shock, frantically wondering what had just happened. His sword was sent spinning into the air, while the doppelganger immediately capitalized on the opening, launching a brutal, relentless assault. Gritting his teeth, Seong-yun questioned himself in a panic. Is this all just an illusion? How could this creature suddenly become this strong? In a fraction of a second, both Seong-yun and the doppelganger leaped backward simultaneously to reset. The doppelganger looked momentarily confused, shaking its body. Suddenly, an eerie black and blue energy began to ignite violently from our protagonist's body. The system had automatically triggered the effects of his assassin's cloak, boosting his movement speed by 15%. Seong-yun calculated that if this battle drags on any longer, his life would be in severe jeopardy. Thus, he resolved to end the duel within the next 60 seconds while the skills buff remained active. Sensing the shift in pressure, the doppelganger bared its fangs and let out a menacing growl.
Meanwhile, Seong-yun launched forward at breaking speed, launching a direct assault on his opponent. He successfully ducked under a counter-strike, and with a swift, agile twist of his body, the protagonist managed to slash the doppelganger's neck. Seong-yun flashed a satisfied smile, assuming he had secured the victory. But just then, the doppelganger shrieked in agonizing pain and stumbled backward. With a blindingly fast reflex, the monster swung its blade and cleanly severed Seong-yun's sword-wielding arm. Seong-yun stared at the spray of blood in utter shock. A moment later, he let out a harrowing scream, his eyes narrowing to a slit as he bore the excruciating pain. Internally, he forced himself to stay calm, because this fight was far from over. Gazing at the doppelganger, a sharp question surfaced in his mind. Why wasn't the creature moving? He calculated that even with its incredible regeneration skill, the monster still required a moment to recover. Seong-yun wanted to finish off the doppelganger immediately. Meanwhile, his severed left hand lay drenched in blood on the ground beside him, its fingers still tightly locked around the hilt of his sword. He had no idea how he was going to pull this off. At that moment, the countdown on his active cloak skill had ticked down to a mere 11 seconds. Seong-yun raised his heavy shield in front of him, thinking to himself that perhaps he was truly losing his mind now. He dropped into a stance, placing one foot behind him and anchoring it firmly against the stone floor. In his mind, he thought, it's better to try this crazy stunt than to just stand here and die a meaningless death. He charged forward like a bullet. His disoriented opponent began shaking its body once more to reset, but the protagonist closed the distance in a flash. The doppelganger moved to retaliate, instantly swinging its sword. At that exact microsecond, Seong-yun slammed into it with his shield. Against all odds, the protagonist's bash connected perfectly with the target. The doppelganger was sent flying violently through the air, crashing down as thick plumes of dust erupted all around. Its mangled body lay contorted on the dirt, blood streaming heavily from its face. Seong-yun stood over the creature, gripping his shield and swinging his weapon with a burning, unbridled fury, desperate to see his opponent dead. A split second later, he brought the heavy shield crashing straight onto the doppelganger's head, causing it to snap violently to the side.
The system then congratulated him on successfully clearing the third floor. Seong-yun was instantly worked back to the fourth floor waiting room, where the tower's passive healing immediately restocked his body. He stared at his left arm, the one that had just been severed, touched the wall with his palm and inspected it closely. Then he delivered a heavy punch straight into the wall. The stone wall instantly fractured into deep, massive cracks from the sheer impact. Seong-yun smirked widely, realizing that the recovery process had been absolute perfection. A system notification popped up, indicating that his current spirit count was now 1 out of 5. He recalled how he had harvested the doppelganger's soul, noting internally that its spirit density was exponentially higher than any monster he had encountered up to this point. Another notification flashed across his vision, announcing that his mastery over the necromancy unique trait had reached 100% and its rank had successfully evolved to E rank. A third additional effect was also unlocked. When absorbing the spirit of an exceptionally skilled target, there is a distinct probability that one of the core skills embedded within that soul can be inherited. Reading through the description, Seong-yun's mouth dropped open in sheer amazement. Did this mean he could literally steal other people's skills? He flashed back to his grueling days at the training center, remembering how he had unlocked his rapid recovery skill after dancing with death multiple times. A broad smile spread across his face as she admitted to himself that in his entire life, he had never imagined he would acquire a unique trait this profoundly powerful and bizarre.
However, he also acknowledged a crucial detail that he couldn't afford to overlook. The description explicitly stated that the acquisition of an inherited skill was merely a probability, not a guarantee. A barrage of blue system screens began to materialize in front of him, signaling that he had officially entered the high-difficulty 4th floor community. Seong-yun muttered to himself that because this was his 3rd time returning to a waiting room, the environment felt deeply familiar to him now, almost as if he were resting in his own home. Confused, he noticed that the chat log was absolutely exploding with frantic messages. As it turned out, the upcoming trial on the 4th floor wasn't an individual test, but a group trial. Staring intensely at the screen, he wondered if this meant that the tower would aggregate the players and form them into cohesive teams. One participant posted that they might be overthinking things, but another quickly shot back, pointing out that the official team for the next trial was listed as a competition. This prompted another user to ask the chilling question: does a competition mean we're forced to kill each other? Seong-yun froze in absolute terror.
Flashing back to the pools of blood he had witnessed before, anxiety began to gnaw at him. He couldn't help but worry that in the upcoming trial, he might be forced to take a human life. The system then announced that the participant selection process was finalized and the 4th floor trial was about to commence. This trial would last for a full 24 hours. The objective to clear this team trial was to defeat the Goblin King within the designated time limit. Before the players, a massive fortress wall materialized, marking the trial zone. The system also noted that failure would occur if all team members were wiped out or if time ran out. The penalty for failure was death. Seong-yun was instantly warped to the floor, and the other players began materializing right in front of him. They stood upon ground that had a large pentagram symbol drawn across its surface. Seong-yun felt a bit awkward. Up until now, he had only faced monsters, not humans. He shifted his gaze when one of the players suggested they introduce themselves, given that they were now a team. A brown-haired woman holding a magic staff introduced herself as Hayeon. She smiled and explained that she played the role of team support and was an E-rank hunter in the outside world. She turned her head when another player remarked that in that case their team might not consist entirely of losers. That player was named Magnum. Resting a massive double-edged greatsword against his shoulder, he introduced himself as a close combat specialist and a D-rank hunter on the outside. Seong-yun found Magnum's arrogant attitude baffling. Hunters of that rank were usually polite in the real world. After observing them, Seong-yun stated his name and mentioned that he also specialized in close combat, but wasn't a licensed hunter on the outside. He was merely a trainee. Hearing this, Magnum clenched his jaw and asked in a demeaning tone, "Does that mean you're just a newbie?" Seong-yun's face tightened as the man ordered him not to be a nuisance on the battlefield. Even so, Seong-yun firmly stated that he was a capable fighter and could pull his own weight.
Visibly dissatisfied, Magnum cut him off, warning bahwa if he felt Seong-yun was becoming a liability, he would teach him immediately. For a moment, dark memories of past mockery flashed through Seong-yun's mind. He realized he had grown so used to being looked down upon that he had briefly forgotten his past struggles. Magnum then called out to Seong-yun, ordering him to stay in the back and only clean up the low-level small fry. Internally, Seong-yun noted that not only was this man incredibly annoying, but he was also confident his own current power was more than enough to throw those condescending words right back in his face. Staring at the massive fortress gate ahead, he concluded that this trial tower relied on only one thing: raw skill. The system began flashing alerts, explaining the absolute importance of teamwork and clearing the trial faster than the opposing team. Before long, the main gate of the fortress began to grind open. Instantly, a swarm of goblins charged out from within. Magnum blocked an onslaught from 3 goblins at once with his greatsword, yelling out in shock at how these monsters could attack in such a tight formation. He then barked orders at Seong-yun to join the fray. Seong-yun merely looked back at him with a cold, detached gaze from behind the corpses of the goblins he had already slaughtered. From the rear, Hayeon called out that the magic she was preparing was almost ready. Still busy deflecting monster strikes, Magnum screamed at Hayeon to stop chatting and hurry up with the buffs. However, Hayeon replied that she had already deployed all of her support magic. Seong-yun then approached Hayeon, mentioning that she looked like she needed some assistance before temporarily leaving her side. With an anxious expression, Hayeon yelled for Seong-yun to stop, but a split second later, Seong-yun bolted forward like a blur. The female hunter worried frantically, wondering who would protect her rear if Seong-yun just ran off like that. But as her eye scanned the area, she saw a trail of goblin corpses already scattered across the ground. Hayeon froze in her tracks, completely unable to believe what she was seeing. The remaining goblins swarmed Magnum, who tried to parry their attacks while cursing loudly. One of the monsters swung a heavy mace attached to a chain and hurled it directly at the man. The impact sent his weapon flying out of his hands, throwing his body hard onto the ground. Defenseless, Magnum became a sitting duck. One of the goblins leaped into the air toward him. The man stared back with eyes full of sheer terror, bitterly complaining about his rotten luck for being stuck on a team with a useless newbie. At that exact microsecond, Seong-yun ambushed the monster. Magnum watched in dead silence, utterly stunned by what had just unfolded before his eyes. The monster was instantly shocked out of its mind upon seeing the corpse of its comrade. Seong-yun stood right in front of Magnum without turning his head even a fraction of an inch, coldly telling Magnum to get out of the way. The hunter looked bewildered, his mouth opening as if he wanted to protest. However, with a sharp warning glare, Seong-yun warned him not to cross his path. With lightning-fast movements, he began slaughtering the goblins. Their bodies were sent flying in every direction. Before long, a notification popped up announcing that he had acquired the Goblin Hunter title. On the other side, Magnum stood frozen in utter disbelief at what he was witnessing. Once everything was cleared, Seong-yun successfully absorbed a number of goblin spirits and discovered something new. As it turned out, the black mist generated by his unique trait could not be seen by anyone else. Following that, he optimized his statistics: strength +3, agility +4, stamina +2, and endurance +7. But the most shocking development was that he had actually absorbed one of the core skills from a Goblin Guardian. The skill granted him an expanded field of vision, allowing him to identify enemies from a much greater distance. Seong-yun decided to test the skill immediately. He concentrated deeply, and after a brief moment, he succeeded. It felt exactly like zooming in a smartphone camera to see something far away with crystal clarity. Seong-yun flashed a satisfied smile. This was an absolute jackpot. Meanwhile, Magnum tried to salvage his bruised ego, commenting that Seong-yun had just gotten lucky and claiming that those specific goblins were weak anyway. However, both Seong-yun and Ha-yeon merely looked back at him with expressions of sheer bewilderment. Seong-yun then declared that from now on he would be leading the operation and advancing on the front lines. He pointedly asked if Magnum had any objections. Magnum didn't say a word. He only cast a strange glance and shook his head. Seong-yun then added that Magnum's sole duty now was to protect Ha-yeon, while himself would handle all enemies at the vanguard.
Turning to Ha-yeon, Seong-yun told her that she only needed to navigate and provide support from the rear. Ha-yeon nodded, stating that she understood. She then resumed scanning for targets and began channeling her magic once more. A few minutes later, they engaged in battle with yet another legion of goblins. Seong-yun continuously cut through the goblin swarms, absorbing their souls and pushing his trait mastery level up to 12%. Remaining time, 14 hours and 37 minutes. Night finally fell. The trio navigated through the desolate ruins. Ha-yeon claimed that even though the goblins attack in erratic, unpredictable patterns, the current atmosphere felt strangely eerie because it was far too quiet. Suddenly, Seong-yun halted, staring straight ahead before bolting forward without giving a single word of explanation. His two teammates were caught off guard and immediately scrambled to catch up, frantically wondering what was happening. Looking ahead, a grand plaza stretched out before them, its central fountain completely surrounded by a mountain of goblin corpses. Seong-yun deduced that other contestants had already reached this area ahead of them. He touched the monster blood, noting it was still warm, a clear sign that they could still catch up if they move immediately. If the opposing team managed to defeat the goblin boss first, everyone else who failed the trial would die. Seong-yun urged them to hurry. On the other side of the ruins, a horde of goblins was actively launching an assault. A man repeatedly slammed his sword against his shield to draw the monster's attention. One of the creatures turned around, suddenly sensing that something was tapping directly on its shoulder. As it turned out, an armed warrior was perched right on its back. Wrinkling his face, he grumbled that he was utterly sick and tired of hunting goblins. The hunter secretly hoped that this would be the final skirmish before facing the main boss. The monster swarmed him. The man leaped, deftly dodging their incoming strikes. His eyes ignited with power as he immediately retaliated against the goblins.
A few moments later, he stood tall among a massive pile of goblin corpses. A knight and a maid who witnessed the display praised Seong for his resounding success. However, Seong merely grimaced, complaining that he always had to do absolutely everything by himself. He turned his gaze toward a knight named Jinhu and asked if he was pleased that he didn't have to break a sweat since everything was taken care of. Looking visibly nervous, Jinhu replied, "No." Annoyed, Seong immediately ordered him to open the boss room. They all wanted to wrap things up as quickly as possible and get some rest. Despite his irritation at being ordered around, Jinhu complied and pushed the door open. The moment the gateway parted, a system window instantly materialized, announcing that all members of the challenger team had successfully entered the Goblin King's stronghold tower. However, the battle against the Goblin King would not commence until only a single team remained standing. Furthermore, the system delivered a chilling update. From this moment on, escaping the current location was entirely impossible. As if to confirm the system's absolute rule, a massive red barrier immediately manifested, sealing off the entire sector.
Seong stared at the barrier in frustration, wondering what was going on. But just then, one of his teammates spotted 3 figures standing directly across from them. It was Seong-yun's team. Seong locked his eyes onto the opponents who were destined to be their adversaries. Contorting his face into a scowl, he muttered that he had hoped to wrap this trial up much faster. Standing his ground, Seong-yun declared that he would fight this battle completely alone. He then turned to Hayeon, requesting her to grant him an agility-boosting buff.
The rest of the buffs can be given to Magnum. Hayeon replied that she had already seen with her own eyes just how powerful Seong-yun was, but added that other hunters could be far more terrifying than monsters. Seong-yun nodded, letting her know that he understood. He promised to give a signal if he ever felt he was in danger. Until then, he would be relying on their support. After saying that, Seong-yun launched himself into the battlefield. His agility surged by 2 points thanks to Hayeon's magic, an effect that would last for 10 minutes. Seong-yun was completely confident that he had now surpassed the baseline level of an average hunter, especially after having just slaughtered over 30 goblins. Locking his eyes onto the opposing team as they braced themselves, he fomented a direct explosive charge at all 3 men simultaneously. The sudden move caught them off guard, sparking a wave of panic. Seong couldn't comprehend where the man's absolute confidence was coming from, but he could clearly see that his opponent was dead certain of his skills. He immediately barked orders at Jinhoo to deploy his shield at full power and to do it as fast as possible. The curly-haired man quickly followed the command, activating his defensive perimeter. As it turned out, he was utilizing a magic shield, which Seong-yun realized the moment he saw the 3 young men enclosed within a shimmering mystical dome. Leaping off the ground, Seong-yun slammed into the dome with every ounce of his strength. The impact caused the magical surface to fracture violently in multiple places, before the barrier shattered and vanished entirely a split second later. Jinhoo, who was channeling the shield, collapsed heavily onto the ground. Wasting no time, Seong-yun ambushed their group before they could even attempt to react. Hayeon and Magnum witnessed the entire display in pure awe. The protagonist then locked eyes with the enemy assassin, whose expression was twisted in absolute rage.
The real battle officially commenced. They traded blows in a flurry of offense and defense. In his mind, the protagonist felt that the enemy's raw capabilities were far beneath his own. Yet strangely, all of his attacks were being deflected with relative ease. His eyes flashed sharply, realizing he needed to fight more aggressively. Seong-yun maneuvered behind his opponent, executing a heavy sweep with his sword. He was certain this strike would finish it. However, Seong-yun managed to parry the blade with his own weapon. Seong-yun was taken aback by his opponent's reflexes. Seong-yun gritted his teeth, his eyes burning with intense malice. Seong-yun began to realize that his adversary could actually read the trajectory of his sword swings. Seong-yun retreated, but suddenly, a heavy shield materialized right in front of his face. He panicked, realizing his field of vision was now severely restricted. At that exact microsecond, Seong-yun ambushed him from beneath the shield, cutting deep into his chest. Seong coughed violently, glaring back in sheer frustration, feeling that this was an utterly rotten stroke of bad luck. Seong-yun's system window flashed, indicating that he had received additional rewards upon successfully clearing the challenge. Hayeon noticed that Seong-yun was visibly trembling. She realized that the young man was actually deeply shaken by the fact that he had just taken a human life. Walking up to him, she gently asked if he was all right. Seong-yun replied that he was fine, telling her not to worry too much. Hayeon concluded that Seong-yun was simply in shock over the killing he had just committed. Shortly after, Seong-yun turned to them and asked if they were ready to engage the boss directly to wrap up this trial. Hayeon and Magnum agreed without a second thought. A few moments later, they successfully brought down the Goblin King. As always, the finishing blow was delivered by Seong-yun, who drove his sword deep into the monster's back, piercing its exact weak point. The beast collapsed, dead. The system window materialized once more, announcing that the trial target had been defeated. As the reward, all of their attributes were permanently boosted by 4 points. On top of that, Seong-yun acquired a brand new skill, Instantaneous Acceleration Level 3. With the trial cleared, they walked safely toward the exit portal.
Magnum immediately stepped through first, clearly harboring a bit of fear towards Seong-yun. However, Hayeon lingered, standing right in front of the rift. She suddenly turned around, telling Seong-yun not to dwell too much on what had transpired today. She admitted that her words might sound harsh, but reminded him that he had only done what absolutely had to be done. After all, one of the teams was destined to defeat the other. The comforting words caught Seong-yun off guard. He thanked her, stating that her reassurance made him feel significantly better about himself. The girl then tapped something on her system window, and Seong-yun noticed an incoming notification. Hayeon had sent him a friend request. Seong-yun was surprised, having had no idea that such a feature even existed inside the tower. Hayeon explained that they had only managed to pass today's trial thanks to his overwhelming carry, so she felt deeply indebted to him.
She then added that if he ever made it back to Earth one day, he should come look for her at the White Silver Guild.
Seong-yun merely looked at her without saying a word, but he fully understood the hidden meaning behind Hyun's words. As the girl stepped into the portal, Seong-yun realized he had to make a pivotal decision, whether or not he would consume a human spirit. He stared down at Seon, lost in deep thought. When he first realized he was actually capable of doing something like this, he had chosen to delay the process. He felt as though doing so would mean crossing a line from which there was no turning back. Now, however, his mind was made up. He had no intention of murdering people just to gain power, but the situation had forced his hand. With that grim resolve, Seong-yun initiated the absorption of Seon's spirit. He felt that beneath his initial desire to become a hunter, a new ambition had begun to take root within his soul. After all, the Tower of Trials had granted him this chance, and he intended to exploit it to its absolute limits to forge his way to the apex. Once the absorption process was complete, he finally stepped through the portal and materialized in the 5th floor waiting room. To his surprise, the system immediately broadcasted a new update. A trial participant ranking system was now active. Seong-yun didn't fully comprehend the implications of this leaderboard, but he was prompted to choose a permanent nickname. After a brief moment of deliberation, his chosen moniker appeared, Hunter Han Seong-yun. The system then aggregated the results of the 4th floor trial, displaying the full list of participants. Seong-yun began scrolling through the names, hoping he had managed to make the cut. To his absolute shock, he found himself ranked 16th, exponentially higher than he had ever anticipated. The system then added a crucial addendum. Anyone who placed within the top 50 would receive pioneer status. Those holding this status would be granted an early head start on the 8th floor. Furthermore, if they successfully maintained the status until reaching the 8th floor, they would unlock a supreme privilege known as a halo. Seong-yun caught his breath, wondering what kind of extraordinary skill they would bestow upon him. He decided to look into it deeper later on, for now he needed to prioritize boosting his combat power. He was now capable of harvesting and storing up to 15 spirits simultaneously. As he integrated his new power, he felt as though he had shattered the conventional limits of human capability. The 5th floor now unlocked access to purchase a Return to Earth stone, though it was strictly valid for only 3 days. Seong-yun decided to seize this window of opportunity, spending his hard-earned points to buy the item from the store. He was also curious to see if he could return to Earth while retaining his high-tier gear.
The system interface confirmed that his next destination was Earth. His body began to plummet, getting pulled into a violent dimensional vortex. Transfer sequence initiated. Final destination, Earth. The protagonist let out a sharp cry as his physical form was vacuumed into the swirling vortex of cosmic energy. A final notification flashed across his vision. You have successfully and safely returned to your original residence. In 3 days, you will be forcibly transferred back to the Tower of Trials. Curtains fluttered gently in the breeze as the protagonist cracked his eyes open, finding himself lying on a mattress. Pushing himself up, he scanned the surroundings and realized with a wave of relief that he was finally back in his own home. Seong-yun leaned back against his pillow, resolving to get a good night's sleep. Compared to the concrete floors of the tower's waiting rooms, his own bed felt like absolute paradise. However, his face immediately contorted into a grimace as a foul odor hit his nose. Sitting up straight, he realized he desperately needed a shower first. Looking down at the floor, his eyes caught the shield and sword lying by the bedside. The protagonist picked them up, letting out a heavy sigh of relief. It turned out he could actually smuggle items from the Tower of Trials into the real world. That means the other challengers would likely be doing the exact same thing. He muttered to himself that he needed to move fast. In the near future, the influx of people returning to reality would skyrocket. Consequently, the market price for hunter equipment would plummet due to the sudden flood of surplus goods. Seong-yun stared intensely at his gear, deciding he needed to liquidate his equipment as soon as possible. The core issue was that only licensed hunters were legally permitted to sell items on the open market. Originally, he had only planned to register for the hunter exam and take it during his next scheduled return. He glanced down at his smartphone, muttering under his breath that there were far more complications he had to iron out than he had initially anticipated.
Down on the training grounds, the cadets were undergoing their drills. An overseer observed their progress from a high vantage point. When his smartphone began to ring, the man turned around, answered the call, and introduced himself as Manhwa, an instructor at the White Lotus Training Center. The protagonist stated his name and asked if the instructor still remembered him. The coach replied with a note of irritation, confirming that he did. He then added that Seong-yun could have easily submitted a refund request online. Manhwa was taken aback when he heard that the young man had absolutely no intention of reclaiming his prepaid tuition fees. Staring out the window, the overseer questioned whether he would regret this decision later on. Seong-yun answered with absolute certainty that he wouldn't regret it. He even added that in fact he would be raking in significantly more mission requests moving forward. The instructor let out a weary sigh and stated that if the purpose of this call was to request permission to resume training at the center, the application would be denied immediately. Instead, Seong-yun requested his assistance to secure an entry slot for the hunter exam. The instructor bluntly reminded him of his previous midterm evaluation scores. He had barely been scraped by with an F rank, and even that had been incredibly generous. The instructor began to lecture him on the catastrophic outcomes that awaited anyone reckless enough to challenge the hunter exam without possessing any real skills or a unique trait. However, Seong-yun cut him off, asking if the overseer couldn't pull a few strings for him anyway, considering he was forfeiting his tuition refund. Hearing this, the coach relented and agreed to the protagonist's request. A sly smile spread across the protagonist's face. Staring straight ahead with unyielding determination, he offered a deal. All the instructor needed to do was arrange for him to take the hunter qualification exam this very day. After showering, Seong-yun dried his hair with a towel. He stared at his reflection in the mirror. His muscles were now visibly far more defined and toned. Observing the dramatic shifts in his physique, he realized that alongside the rapid progression he had achieved, his body was evolving at a breakneck pace. As he got dressed, he muttered to himself that this was no time to be admiring his own body.
He had to leave for the exam immediately. Stepping out into the hallway, he ran into his next-door neighbor. Seong-yun locked eyes with the girl and flashed a small smile. He had truly missed a normal, mundane life like this. He bowed slightly and offered a warm greeting. The girl returned the greeting, thinking to herself that this was the neighbor who kept trying to become a hunter but always failed miserably. Seong-yun brushed past her with a smile, wishing her a great day ahead. The girl blushed slightly and muttered to herself, questioning whether that man had always been that tall. Down on the street, the protagonist waved his hand to hail a taxi, but not a single one pulled over. He stared into the distance, his face shifting into a contemplative expression. A few minutes later, he was already sprinting at a blistering pace, leaping seamlessly across the rooftops of the city buildings. Flashing a smirk, Seong-yun muttered that running directly to his destination wasn't such a bad alternative after all. He vaulted forward once more, noting that he was nearly there. Ultimately, he arrived at the towering headquarters of the Hunter Association. He stood before two men, greeting them with a confident smile. "It's been a while, instructor," he said. Manhwa replied that it actually hadn't been very long since their last encounter. Seong-yun looked back at him with supreme confidence, remarking that over the past few days, he had experienced so many things that it felt as though a century had passed. Manhwa stared at him in bewilderment, asking for clarification. The young man nodded, confirming that his recent days had been anything but easy. A man clad in a sharp suit approached and introduced himself as Examiner Kim, the official presiding over today's test. He looked at Seong-yun and noted that he was surely aware this arrangement was made strictly at the instructor's request, meaning he would be exempt from both the written exam and the interview phase.
The examiner then asked if the examinee had any questions regarding the practical exam. However, the protagonist merely shook his head. The examiner then gestured for Seong-yun to follow him. Before long, Seong-yun stood inside a massive pavilion, firmly gripping a sword in his hand. Meanwhile, up in the booth, Manhwa glared at the examiner, reminding him of his prior request to fail the kid immediately and disqualify him from the exam. The examiner answered calmly, telling him not to worry because he had deliberately prepared a monster with the absolute worst compatibility match for the examinee. The examiner then looked down at Seong-yun, declaring in a booming voice that he could choose the exam's difficulty from level 1 to 10 whenever he was ready. Seong-yun recalled how in the past he had always chosen level 1 and still suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of basic goblins every single time, all because he used to be pathetic and weak. The overseer smirked, murmuring that the kid would undoubtedly choose the lowest difficulty level again. But his words were abruptly cut short by Seong-yun's firm, resonant voice. "Level 10! The man gasped, asking again in utter disbelief. The protagonist, on the other hand, merely smiled. The instructor contorted his face into a scowl, commenting that the brat had officially lost his mind. A system notification blared. "The exam has commenced. Hunt the phoenix." A monster entirely cloaked in raging flames materialized right in front of Seong-yun, letting out a deafening roar. Another notification immediately flashed. "Your movements have been slowed by 25% due to the status effect
effect of the skill Predator's Roar.
Pegang swordnya terpatrak. Instruktur senyum dengan kepuasan. Once more, absolutely certain bahwa anak ini nggak bakalan lulus karena demi dia telah mensabotase persenjataan sebelumnya. Manhwa peered down dari boot, anticipation eating at him as he gleefully waiting for Seong-yun to fail. The firebird soared into the air, spewing a wave of scorching heat directly at the boy. Seong-yun's eyes flashed as he locked his gaze onto the oncoming enemy. Instructor suddenly flashed back to the time he had undergone a similar exam to finally become a hunter. Back then, he had believed he was the absolute best. Over time, however, the gap in skill between him and his peers had widened drastically, until a point came where he completely gave up trying to catch up. World of Hunters was dictated entirely by innate talent. He had swallowed that bitter reality and stopped putting in the effort. In his mind, everyone was bound to give up when forced to face a wall that was genuinely impossible to scale. That was precisely why he was that certain Seong-yun would break as well. Down in the arena, Seong-yun raised his blade to parry an incoming strike. Suddenly, the metal cracked. Caught off guard, he immediately leaped backward to reset. Internally, he noted that as far as he knew, no weapon, no matter how poor its quality, should break this effortlessly. Seong-yun shifted his gaze up toward Manhwa. Suspicion began to take root that the coach was behind this. Manhwa wore a wicked grin, dying to see what Seong-yun would do next with a shattered sword. The phoenix soared back into the air with a deafening roar before unleashing a barrage of fireballs straight at Seong-yun. But instead of feeling frustrated by the sabotage, Seong-yun actually found himself thrilled by the predicament. This was the flawless opportunity to test the new skill he had harvested on the 4th floor of the trial tower. Activating his acceleration skill, he shot upward like a bullet, breaking away from the ground and landing cleanly on the ceiling directly above the phoenix. He flashed a subtle smirk, noting that this skill was exponentially better than the passive buff from his assassin's cloak. The phoenix roared, bracing itself to launch another assault. Seong-yun vaulted from the ceiling and drove the jagged edge of his broken sword straight into the creature's eye. The monster shrieked in agonizing pain. Landing back on the floor, Seong-yun muttered to himself that just as he had suspected, the blade was simply too short now. Thinking fast, he ripped a massive stone slab height out of the floor, swung it at the phoenix, and cleanly sheared its head in two.
The heavy slab went flying, smashing hard into the observation wall, right where the two men were standing. Shocked out of his mind, the coach bailed out. What the hell does this bastard think he's doing? The exam was officially over. The monster collapsed, lifeless. Seong-yun waved his hand up at them, asking casually, "Are the spectators all right?" He added smoothly that he hadn't anticipated the slab would go flying quite that far in their direction. A woman approached him with a broad smile, handing over his official hunter license while offering her congratulations on passing the exam. Seong-yun accepted it with deep gratitude. The woman explained that since Seong-yun was now registered with the Hunter Association, he was legally authorized to conduct hunter activities. He looked at her and clarified, "You mean entering dungeons and liquidating items?" The woman nodded in confirmation. Upstairs, Manhwa slammed his hands onto the desk, interrogating the man in front of him in a fit of pure rage. How on earth could this have happened? He had explicitly demanded that Seong-yun be failed within 10 seconds. Yet the reality was that the kid had cleared the entire exam in 10 seconds. The examiner merely adjusted his tie, claiming he had done his absolute best. According to the data he possessed, it should have been statistically impossible for Seong-yun to pass. Even so, the coach refused to accept it. He demanded that the man in the suit downgrade Seong-yun's rank. The examiner was baffled by the statement, arguing that it was impossible because Seong-yun had successfully cleared the exam by defeating a D-level monster. If he were to give Seong-yun a lower rank now, it would inevitably trigger a formal complaint.
Right in the middle of their heated argument, Seong-yun suddenly walked into the room. He casually informed them that he had received his hunter certificate. The examiner quickly offered his congratulations. Seong-yun stepped closer, locking his eyes onto the coach and subtly mocking him by noting how incredibly pale the man looked. Forcing a deeply awkward smile, the coach still offered his congratulations on Seong-yun's new status as an official hunter. Seong-yun stared dead into his eyes and remarked that if his memory served him right, the coach had only ever managed to reach C rank before being forced into retirement. The coach snapped back, demanding to know what he meant by that. Seong-yun tilted his head slightly, a cold smirk playing on his lips as he reminded the man that he used to call him a failure. In a deeply condescending tone, Seong-yun delivered the final blow, noting that now it appeared the coach was the real failure. Instructor Huang's face instantly twisted with pure, unbridled hatred. Enraged, he swung a heavy fist at Seong-yun, screaming at the top of his lungs that the brat had gone way too far. The examiner frantically moved to restrain Huang, while Seong-yun merely smiled, thinking to himself that this volatile reaction proved just how incredibly easy the man was to provoke.
He deftly evaded the punch and instantly retaliated, burying a heavy counterstrike deep into his opponent's stomach. Standing over him, he calmly remarked that his action was strictly a form of self-defense. Seong-yun then delivered a sharp slap across Huang's face, stating that this was payback for the beatings he had received in the past. The man collapsed, completely helpless, utterly shocked by a terrifying pressure that did not match the young man's official rank. Seong-yun then turned to face the examiner, asking with dead seriousness if it was true that he was being scouted as a direct employee of the Hunter Association. The examiner nodded in confirmation, adding that the starting salary reached 1 billion won, and that figure was still highly negotiable. He urged that the offer would be immensely beneficial to Seong-yun's career. Seong-yun stared at the business card in his hand, muttering that the amount was indeed quite tempting for someone just starting out. The examiner smiled, claiming he simply saw massive potential within him. Despite the lucrative offer, Seong-yun flatly rejected it. He was fully aware of the examiner's underhanded attempt to manipulate the difficulty level of his exam. Those words caused the examiner to break into a cold sweat, his body trembling slightly. Seong-yun turned his back on him, stating that while he wouldn't make a formal issue out of it, he had strict principles. He refused to strike deals with people he couldn't trust. He then casually tossed the examiner's business card aside and walked out without looking back. 2 days later on television, a news anchor reported that hunters had recently begun spreading rumors regarding the emergence of a mysterious phenomenon known as the Trial Tower. Seong-yun closed his laptop, muttering that everyone was finally finding out about the tower. He picked up a chest while holding his smartphone in his other hand. He had successfully liquidated all of his extra gear at an excellent price, making perfect use of his last 3 days on Earth. Suddenly, a notification materialized. Your time on Earth is coming to an end. In a few seconds, you will be forcibly transferred back to the trial tower.
In a flash, he was whirled back. Seong-yun sat up, muttering that just as he had deduced, items could be freely transported between the real world and the tower. The chest and a mystical stone were still lying on the floor. He quickly deposited both items into his inventory. Jumping down from the bed, he began stretching his limbs, gearing up for a thorough warm-up. Wasting no more time, he immediately challenged the 5th floor. A notification popped up, informing him that he had achieved the first return milestone, which rewarded him with a brand new skill, Eye of Truth. Seong-yun's eyes began to glow with an eerie deep purple aura. By channeling his magic through this skill, he could instantly extract detailed data regarding his target and detect whether their words were truth or lies. Staring at the system interface, Seong-yun concluded that besides gaining comprehensive intel on a target, he could literally read their honesty. A wide smile spread across his face as he exclaimed that this was an absolute jackpot. He then purchased a Thunder Sword for 550 points and a Hunter Scout Shield for 380 points. Even though the sword forced him to burn through a significant amount of points, he was highly satisfied with its attributes. It carried a 10% chance to inflict a devastating lightning effect on enemies with every single strike. He was confident it would be incredibly useful. A confirmation prompt materialized in front of him, asking if he was certain he wanted to enter the 5th floor. Without a shred of hesitation, Seong-yun accepted and leaped directly into the portal, his resolve unyielding to conquer the next challenge after his brief respite. A notification flared, announcing that the protagonist had entered the hard difficulty 5th floor trial. The theme of this trial was a hunt with a time limit of 24 hours. The condition to clear the challenge was to eliminate the werewolf boss located deep within Wolf Ravine. The trial would result in failure if the challenger died or if the clock ran out. The reward for successfully conquering the floor was a C-rank werewolf headband, while the penalty for failure was death.
Seong-yun now stood before a towering mountain, bathed in the brilliant glow of a full moon. He smiled, locking his grip tightly around his new blade. Suddenly, a pack of werewolves emerged, surrounding him. Vicious, animalistic snarls echoed through the ravine as they lunged all at once. With a series of fast, mathematically precise movements, Seong-yun slashed through them one by one, continuously advancing through the fray. Seong-yun delivered a heavy kick to one of his attackers, sending the werewolf crashing violently to the side. He felt a wave of confusion, wondering why they were so incredibly weak. The displaced werewolf rolled across the dirt, colliding into something massive. As Seong-yun shifted his gaze forward, 3 giant white wolves materialized, towering over him. One of the massive alpha wolves let out a deafening roar before brutally biting the smaller werewolf to pieces. The giant wolves began to encircle the hunter, but instead of feeling fear, Seong-yun felt a surge of raw adrenaline at their arrival. The beasts launched a coordinated assault. Seong-yun leaped into the air, swinging his blade through a wide arc as he shouted that he was actually starting to enjoy this challenge. He unleashed a devastating cleave, muttering to himself that he might truly be losing his mind as the single strike slashed through all the wolves simultaneously.
A notification popped up, informing him that his mastery over the Hunter's Dagger skill had reached 100%, causing it to rank up to E rank. His rapid recovery skill also advanced to D rank. Seong-yun stuck the landing on the ground, feeling his raw power surge once more. He noted internally that the Hunter's Dagger skill he had harvested on the 3rd floor was rapidly approaching its threshold. Seong-yun concluded that he desperately needed to track down a new sword skill. Suddenly, 2 wolves leaped at him from his blind spot. Seong-yun turned around with a subtle smirk. Let them come. A few moments passed, leaving nothing but wolf corpses leaking a dense dark energy. He raised his palm and began to harvest the power, noting to himself that this was already his 3rd time hunting them. Yet, much to his chagrin, the 10% lightning effect from his sword had failed to trigger. Another notification flashed, stating that Seong-yun had successfully absorbed several Crash Wolf spirits, boosting his trait mastery by 16%. Checking his system interface, Seong-yun realized his necromancy skill was steadily growing. If he managed to clear this specific trial, there was a very high probability that his unique trait would rank up again. He pushed further into the canyon until he was nearly at the heart of Wolf Ravine. Seong-yun came to a sudden halt. Scattered all around him were the mangled carcasses of dead wolves. He deduced that some sort of internal warfare must have broken out within the pack. Crouching down to inspect one of the bodies, his eyes narrowed as he noticed the lacerations were exceptionally clean. They were undeniably caused by a blade. He turned his head toward a nearby boulder and spotted a deep gouge that solidified his suspicion. Someone had executed a sword technique here. Seong-yun immediately activated his Eye of Truth, his eye shifting into a sharp purple hue. Looking at the rock wall, the system informed him that it was the residual trace of a D-rank aura.
The aura had cleaved through the soul stone with immaculate razor-sharp precision. Standing amidst the monster corpses, he wondered if an aura was also classified as a type of skill. Anxiety began to gnaw at Seong-yun. His mind was flooded with questions and concepts he couldn't yet fully grasp. Suddenly, a piercing howl echoed through the ravine. Seong-yun immediately bolted forward. He knew the source of the sound was just a short distance away. He sprinted along the cliffside until a cavern entrance finally came into view. From deep within the cave, a violent roar resonated, and a large werewolf was sent flying outward, its body bouncing brutally across the dirt. Seong-yun stared in utter shock, completely unable to comprehend what was happening. A system alert flashed. The werewolf boss required to clear the trial has been slain. The system rapidly analyzed the anomaly, revealing that an intruder from another dimension had breached Seong-yun's trial. The system immediately recalculated the objective, ordering Seong-yun to eliminate the extra-dimensional interloper. At that moment, a heavily armored burly warrior stepped out from the shadows of the cave. Seong-yun stared intensely at him, processing the data he had just received. He finally began to realize that the candidates in this trial tower could originate from entirely different dimensions, not just Earth. Seong-yun narrowed his eyes, trying to figure out how this adversary had bypassed the parameters to get here. The knight locked eyes with him, sneering that he hadn't expected a challenger from such a primitive world to still be drawing breath. He demanded to know if Seong-yun was the official owner of this trial instance. He then pointed the tip of his greatsword directly at Seong-yun, concluding that the boy was simply standing frozen because he was paralyzed by the fear of his impending demise. Seong-yun merely offered a tense, awkward smile, fully aware that his opponent was no ordinary fighter. The two stood deadlocked, staring each other down under the moonlight. Staring straight ahead, Seong-yun thought to himself that he never could have anticipated another challenger invading his trial zone. Fortunately, the system had not triggered a trial failure. Meanwhile, his adversary shifted into a refined combat stance, his blade beginning to radiate a brilliant light. The knight asked snidely if the protagonist was truly so terrified that he couldn't even utter a single word. If that was the case, the knight resolved to put an end to Seong-yun's misery right then and there. Seong-yun intently watched the enemy's movements as the man surged forward, closing the distance at a blistering speed. Reacting instantly, Seong-yun kicked the heavy corpse of a dead werewolf directly into the intruder's path. The massive body went airborne, hurtling straight toward the knight, but the warrior deftly sheared the carcass in half with a single fluid strike. As the knight's vision was briefly obstructed by the cloven carcass, Seong-yun zipped around his flank and unleashed a vicious slash, shouting, "Take this!" He drove his blade directly into the opponent's armor. However, his eyes widened in utter horror when he realized his sword couldn't even leave a single scratch on the enemy's plate armor. Capitalizing on the opening, the adversary countered with superior speed, swinging his blade while declaring that it was now his turn. The aura-infused slash slammed into Seong-yun, who barely managed to bring his shield up in a desperate guard. The impact instantly shattered his shield into a million splinters, sending his body flying backward until he crashed violently against a solid rock wall. Seong-yun coughed up a spray of blood from the sheer agony. Clutching his fractured arm, he grimaced as he tried to bear the excruciating pain. The enemy stepped closer, looking genuinely surprised that Seong-yun had somehow survived a direct hit from an aura-coated attack.
If you had just let yourself be cut in two, at least your death would have been quick and painless. Seong-yun barked back, yelling that he had never heard of an intruder before. Stepping closer, the knight replied that a barbarian like him obviously wouldn't know anything about a floor invasion. Seong-yun broke into a cold sweat, horror gripping him as he muttered under his breath. Why was something like this happening in his trial? The enemy stared down at him with an overwhelming pressure, radiating an intimidating aura as he told Seong-yun not to hold a grudge. After all, this tower was a completely unpredictable place. Rather than wasting time on a long conversation, it was better to finish everything right here and now. Seong-yun reached his hand out, pleading for his adversary to halt the attack. He asked the knight to explain what a floor invasion actually entailed. The knight stared at him for a long, silent moment. Ultimately, he decided to explain anyway, reasoning that, regardless of what happened, Seong-yun would be dead shortly. Seong-yun watched his opponent intently, absorbing every word. The man stated that within the system, starting from the 8th floor, an option called Floor Invasion became accessible. If someone purchased a special ticket from the store, they could actively interfere in another player's trial. Seong-yun sat opposite his enemy, asking if the man truly hailed from an entirely different dimension. The knight shot back, "Where else did you think I came from?" Seong-yun pushed himself up, murmuring softly as he activated his Eye of Truth. His eyes ignited with a sharp glare. The man flinched slightly upon locking eyes with the hunter. A notification materialized. "Your opponent's words are true. He is not lying." The knight brandished his greatsword, shouting that Seong-yun's current behavior was incredibly unpleasant.
How dare a mere novice evaluate his words and actions? Seong-yun merely offered a relaxed smile, asking, "And what is a knight like you going to do about it?" His adversary swung the blade, asking in pure fury, "How can a barbarian like you dare to act so insolent?" Seong-yun straightened his posture, replying that since he had already gathered the information he wanted, there was no harm in sharing an interesting fact. The opponent halted his advance, glaring with curiosity. Still holding his mangled arm, Seong-yun stated that thanks to his ink-tolerant skill, he wasn't clutching his arm out of agony. He then removed his hand from the wound, and in that instant, his accelerated regeneration skill kicked in. The injury began to knit back together at a visible rate. He had merely calculated that his opponent would freely share information if he played pity and looked miserable. The knight's eyes widened in sheer shock. He swung his sword again, questioning whether Seong-yun was a dual user who possessed both healing skills and swordsmanship. The man added that if Seong-yun's power was strictly limited to what he had displayed earlier, it would be mathematically impossible for him to survive the next assault. However, Seong-yun merely smiled as he retrieved his fallen sword from the dirt. Gripping it firmly, he declared that his strength was continuously evolving at a breakneck pace. A notification flashed. "You have consumed your stored spirits to boost your attributes. Strength +2, agility +3, stamina +3, mana +5, and endurance +7. A brilliant blue energy began to ignite violently from Seong-yun's body. His enemy stood shaken, utterly stunned to realize that Seong-yun possessed a unique trait completely separate from his healing skill. At that moment, the exclusive effect of the assassin's cloak triggered. Movement speed +15%, remaining time 59 seconds. Seong-yun bent his knees, launching himself forward at an explosive speed powered by instantaneous acceleration.
The man stared at this fifth-floor resident in absolute shock. How on earth could the lower-floor challenger possess this many high-tier skills? A fierce high-speed clasp erupted as they traded devastating blows. The knight was forced back a few paces, muttering to himself in frustration. Because he was currently on the fifth floor, the tower's parameters had strictly kept all of his statistics. Gripping his greatsword, he channeled his raw aura into the blade, cursing Seong-yun as a damn primitive. Seong-yun's brow furrowed the moment he detected the incoming trajectory of the strike. Deftly maneuvering his body, he managed to evade the attack. The enemy's blade drove deep into the rock wall behind him. Reacting instantly, the opponent spun around, swinging his sword back towards Seong-yun, shattering the solid stone upon impact. Seong-yun caught his breath, leaping backward to open up the distance. An aura was a highly advanced technique. A single direct hit from an attack like that would inflict catastrophic structural damage. However, Seong-yun clearly held the upper hand in terms of raw statistics compared to his limited adversary, allowing him to dodge the critical strikes with relative ease. Seong-yun calculated that the true problem lay in the enemy's plate armor. The gear was high tier and entirely impervious to Seong-yun's standard scales. Even so, Seong-yun leaped back into the fray, launching a relentless barrage of strikes from multiple angles. If he maintained a continuous, unceasing assault, an opening was bound to present itself. With one heavy swing, the blade of his sword suddenly discharged a violent arc of electricity that snapped directly onto his foe. The opponent groaned in agonizing pain, frantically trying to comprehend what had just struck him. A notification flashed. The Thunder Sword has a probability to trigger a lightning elemental effect upon successful impact.
Seong-yun smirked, muttering under his breath that this was precisely what he needed. The knight collapsed backward, completely helpless. Seong-yun approached his enemy and observed him intently. He thought to himself that if that plate armor had possessed a lightning insulating function, the situation would have been far more troublesome. Fortunately, it didn't. The man's heavy body trembled violently. He glared up at Seong-yun, wheezing that he should have been the one to win from the very beginning. The intruder muttered in disbelief that Seong-yun was merely a fifth-floor challenger. He couldn't comprehend how the boy had acquired so many high-tier skills. Seong-yun tightened his vice-like grip on the hilt of his sword, coldly pointing out that the man was a fool for over-relying on a single advanced skill and his high-level gear. He swung his blade through the air, declaring that this was the end of the line. The interloper reached his hand out in a desperate plea, crying out that he could provide the answers to all of Seong-yun's burning questions. However, Seong-yun simply knit his brows and stated that it wouldn't be necessary. Without a moment's hesitation, Seong-yun drove his sword straight into the enemy's body. Blood spluttered violently. The knight's hand shook for a fraction of a second before going completely limp. Seong-yun stood tall, thinking to himself that while taking a life felt like it was becoming progressively easier, it would pose a serious psychological problem if he ever grew completely numb to killing. A system notification flared. Congratulations, you have successfully cleared the fifth floor of the trial tower. At that moment, a purple aura began to seep out from the intruder's corpse. Reflexively, Seong-yun extended his palm and immediately activated his spirit absorption skill. A notification popped up. You have absorbed the spirit of Challenger Kata Drasterix. Trait mastery has increased to 15%. He stared anxiously at the energy swirling in his palm, realizing he had nearly missed the window of opportunity to harvest the soul. As it turned out, when a challenger died in a dimension separate from their own, their physical form vanished completely like an illusion. Seong-yun stood alone in the ravine, momentarily bewildered as to why the standard clear rewards had yet to materialize.
Then, the system notification finally arrived. The difficulty level and the designated rewards do not align. The reward content has been entirely revised. Seong-yun turned his head in surprise. As a reward for successfully clearing the trial, you have received the A-rank skill 3 grades. As an added bonus, he was credited 75,000 points, along with an extra bonus of 3,500 points. Seong-yun smiled in delight. Instead of the C-rank reward originally promised, he had walked away with a premier high-rank skill. Apparently, the intruder had been powerful enough for the system to evaluate the actual difficulty of his trial as exponentially higher than what was predetermined. Smirking, Seong-yun muttered that he still found it hard to believe he could stumble into this much good fortune. He then transitioned into the 6th floor waiting room. Instantly, all status ailments, negative effects, and physical injuries were perfectly healed. The data regarding Challenger Seong-yun's clear was formally updated on the global summary board. Stepping away from the portal, he unequipped his gear and deposited everything back into his inventory.
After all, he had just survived an invasion from an entirely different dimension. Sitting cross-legged on the floor, he reflected on how the trial tower could throw a curveball at any given moment. He resolved to hoard his question tickets as much as possible to inquire about the 8th floor later. Glancing at his system interface, which displayed a current balance of 5 tickets, he began typing. He decided to ask about the mechanics of a floor invasion and whether it was possible to detect one beforehand. Question submitted. Seong-yun was caught off guard when he received an instantaneous reply. He quickly read the email that had arrived with blinding speed. Floor invasion is a mechanic that allows a candidate to breach another challenger's trial instance, provided the floor discrepancy between the two parties does not exceed 10 floors. However, only individual trials are subject to invasion. Special or integrated co-op trials are strictly immune. This feature officially unlocks starting from the 8th floor and is currently unavailable to you. Seong-yun deduced that the system was essentially designed to break someone's legs while they were midway up the ladder. But just as he was about to scroll down further, a red alert abruptly flashed across his screen. Warning! This data is restricted at your current floor level. Your previous inquiry has been only partially fulfilled. The question ticket will not be consumed. Seong-yun stared at the interface in utter shock, finally realizing that the question tickets carried strict restrictions. He swiped the screen away, thinking to himself that it was a massive relief he hadn't wasted the ticket.
Seong-yun then smiled, muttering bahwa itu finally time untuk menggunakan item utility yang telah dia selamatkan dari Earth. Meranjak dalam inventorinya, dia mengeluarkan sebuah kontainer, shieldnya yang butter, dan sebuah batu mistis. Ada notifikasi yang berkedip. Utilizing the magic Rokoken restoration box to repair the hunter's shield. All structural charges of the box have been depleted. Shield itu langsung bermutasi kembali menjadi bentuk asli yang pristine. Senada, notifikasi lain muncul saat dia mengaktifkan sebuah cleaning stone. Item itu memancarkan sebuah glow sejuk di tangan Seong-yun. Dia kasar mengukut lehernya, membermumurkan bahwa saat membeli cleaning stone mungkin terlihat sebagai total pembuasan poin di atas kertas, tapi kesegaran dan energi rejuvenating yang diperoleh dari proper watch easily worth beberapa ribu won. Sistem lalu mengudarakan countdown. The 6th floor trial will commence in 1 hour and 12 minutes. Seong-yun membuka sistem menunya, deciding untuk mereview latest global leaderboards dan browse the community forums jika time permitted. Leaderboard mengudara di depan matanya. First place, Kim Sung-hoon. Second place, Max Level Sword. Third place, Hunter. Seong-yun stared intently at the ranking index, a wave of shock washing over him saat dia merealisasikan bahwa dia had secured the 3rd place spot worldwide, a monumental leap from his previous 16th position.
Resting his chin on his hand, he wondered if this massive jump was bringing closer to unlocking the full benefits of a pioneer player. However, he quickly realized that to actually test and prove this theory, he would first have to scale his way up to the 8th floor. Entering the community forums, he found the atmosphere choking with tension. The players were actively trading skills that were specifically optimized for murdering and plundering one another. One user snapped in sheer frustration, shouting that they had all devolved into wild animals rather than humans, since their minds were entirely consumed by thoughts of slaughtering their peers. A volatile debate erupted, throwing the chat room into absolute chaos. Seong-yun stared intensely at the screen, analyzing the true gravity of the situation. The mental resistance skill, which was currently selling like hotcakes on the market, did indeed carry the effect of mitigating psychological trauma. Yet, that specific skill was a double-edged sword. While it could temporarily help a user bury their inner agony, it did absolutely nothing to fix the root cause of the madness. As he scrolled through the messages, one post caught his eye. Do you guys know that the scumbag who abruptly leaked the 4th floor exam intel has now changed their username to Princess Sudi? As it turned out, this was the exact same challenger who had previously poisoned the community space back on the 4th floor. Seong-yun recalled how that individual seemed to intentionally instigate violent conflicts among the players. With a stern expression, he wondered if a similar catastrophe was bound to repeat itself. Seong-yun swiped across the screen, murmuring to himself that he needed to etch that specific username into his memory. The system then prompted him, asking if he was prepared to commence the 6th floor trial. With his confirmation, a dimensional rift door opened. The 6th floor trial has commenced. Difficulty high. Team. Territory conquest. Time remaining 50 minutes. Clear condition. Claim dominion over at least one fortress in any direction before the countdown expires. Failure condition. Death of the challenger or expiration of the time limit. Clear reward. Random loot box. Penalty for failure. Death. Seong-yun stepped through the portal, only to find himself standing before a vast open sea dotted with small floating platforms drifting across the water.
The system blared once more, announcing that the team placement sequence was complete and instructing him to cooperate with his teammates to clear the exam.
The protagonist fixed his gaze back on the portal, wondering why his designated allies had yet to materialize. Suddenly, a spear shot out from the depths of the portal. Reacting instantly, he snatched the chef out of midair and yanked it forward. A man emerged from the reef, his hands trembling violently around his weapon before he collapsed onto the platform in sheer terror. Seong-yun approached him, his voice cold as he stated that ambushing an ally was completely unacceptable. The man spat back, telling him that if Seong-yun had actually checked the forums, he would know exactly how things work down here. Killing was simply the most effortless method to stack achievements. Seong-yun stared down at him in bewilderment. Tightening his grip on his weapon, he questioned, "Is your sole objective really just to hoard as many achievements as possible, completely indifferent to who gets sacrificed in the process?" His assailant sneered, declaring that the protagonist's hypocrisy was downright sickening. He urged Seong-yun to open his eyes and scan their surroundings before masquerading as a righteous moralist. Blood-curdling screams began to echo from every direction. Players were brutally butchering their own team members, screaming that the tower was the one to blame, not them. Some didn't even bother to conceal their raw, unbridled avarice in their pursuit of quick power. Seong-yun stood rooted to the spot, listening to the agonizing cries for help. The man from before offered a sarcastic smirk, asking, "Do you finally comprehend the reality of what's transpiring here?" While countless individuals were locked in desperate bloody struggles, a select few were actually shaking hands, choosing to form strategic alliances in the midst of the absolute chaos. A woman and a stout, heavy-set man stood nearby, scanning the ongoing carnage around them. The man smiled, letting out a sigh of relief that he had crossed paths with someone who shared his exact perspective. The woman noted softly that an overwhelming number of people had begun resorting to repulsive acts of betrayal. Her companion nodded in agreement, stating that they needed to remain hyper-vigilant. Flashing a sweet smile, the woman suddenly drove her blade deep into the man's chest, murmuring that he was absolutely right. They really did need to be careful. A sinister, bone-chilling grin spread across her face as she mocked the man for shaking an enemy's hand without a single shred of suspicion. The heavy-set man collapsed instantly at her feet. On the other side of the platform, Seong-yun's teammate urged the protagonist to drop the saint act.
Seong-yun diam terus, shifting gaze away. Misinterpretasi silence sebagai lapse in focus, the man gripped his sword tightly, launched a surprise assault aimed directly at Seong-yun's eyes, and hurled a barrage of curses. However, Seong-yun didn't even flinch. Moving with blinding supernatural speed, he vanished from the man's line of sight, materialized directly behind the attacker, and impaled him with the very same spear. His enemy coughed violently, his mind reeling in utter confusion as he wondered how such lightning-fast movement was even physically possible. A system notification flared. "You have unlocked the achievement, Betrayer. Strength has increased by 1 point. Seong-yun looked down at the dying man, thinking to himself that the opponent was incredibly weak, and that terms like special or co-op trials were completely overhyped. He turned around, concluding that this entire trial was nothing more than an optimized event instance, a perfect arena where he could rapidly farm and elevate his unique trait mastery. And if luck was on his side, he might even harvest a few premier skills to bolster his personal arsenal. Even so, Seong-yun had no intention of intentionally hunting down other participants. He merely wanted to fulfill the trial parameters and eliminate anyone foolish enough to strike him first. A short distance away, a mage raised his hands and invoked the spell Iron Dome, manifesting a massive shimmering defensive barrier. As the protective shield expanded, the man smiled with immense satisfaction, boasting that this specific trial was tailor-made for someone like him who had thoroughly mastered water elemental magic. Suddenly, the rhythmic thud of heavy footsteps approached from behind. He spun around only to see Seong-yun sprinting directly toward him. Seong-yun vaulted into the air, locking his eyes onto his target. The mage stared up in bewilderment, completely unaware of who was invading his space. In a fraction of a second, Seong-yun delivered a devastating high-impact kick straight into the barrier. The mage began to laugh, confidently claiming that his defenses were utterly impenetrable, but his arrogance was instantly shattered. The defensive dome fractured and burst into pieces under the sheer weight of Seong-yun's overwhelming physical strength. Seong-yun's foot slammed hard into the mage's face, sending him hurtling sideways before he crashed flat onto his back. Seong-yun stuck a clean landing right in front of him. He noted internally that while his actions might appear somewhat ruthless, it was a necessary display of force. The neighboring participants who witnessed the brutal takedown stared at Seong-yun in pure horror. Assuming he was a monstrous ranker whose power defied logic, they immediately turned tail and fled in the opposite direction. Seong-yun casually sat down on the claimed platform, realizing that through his explosive display, he could effectively seed a profound sense of terror into the hearts of any potential challengers. The other participants actively began giving him a wide berth. Truthfully, while he was eager to secure achievements, he harbored no desire to engage in meaningless slaughter. A notification materialized. Territory captured. Conquest progress will be disrupted if an enemy team member steps inside your designated tile. Do not allow opponents to seize your territory. Remaining time, 9 minutes and 59 seconds. Seong-yun crossed his legs, concluding that he simply needed to hold his ground for 10 minutes. Resting his hands on his knees, he reasoned that the high-tier challengers who had immediately rushed into the next trial without utilizing the teleportation stones from the 5th floor should already be well ahead of this level. The vast majority of the people surrounding him right now were lower-tier candidates. Consequently, clearing this particular trial was bound to be exponentially easier than he had initially anticipated. This 6th floor exam forced Seong-yun to reflect deeply on the reality of their situation, particularly the absolute decay of trust among human beings. This was the raw, unvarnished existence of lower-class challengers, a pervasive darkness and despair nurtured directly by the architecture of the trial tower. He felt that offering hollow sympathy in a place like this was the truest form of hypocrisy. Even if he managed to divert an enemy's focus to another tile, someone was destined to die anyway.
A sharp system alert suddenly disrupted his thoughts. Warning, an enemy has entered your territory. Tile conquest progression has been halted. Seong-yun turned his head. His expression shifted into a frown. A coordinated group of players was marching directly toward him. A blonde man stepped forward with a smug grin, mocking that the protagonist must be completely shocked.
He taunted that while a standard team in this trial was supposed to consist of only 2 individuals, he had successfully bypassed the convention by bringing 4 fighters along with him. Seong-yun merely held their gaze, calmly replying that he had already anticipated something like this. A cold smile played on Seong-yun's lips as he deduced that these 4 notorious scumbags had deliberately formed a makeshift execution squad to hoard more raw power. The blonde man smirked again, amused that the protagonist had picked up on their intent so quickly, and smoothly declared that Seong-yun was about to be turned into a corpse. 2 enemy Vanguard Knights immediately launched a synchronized assault. Seong-yun reached down, gripping the hilt of his sword as he shifted into a fluid combat stance. Simultaneously, the enemy mage crossed his arms, activating a unique ability called Heart Fusion. Instantly, a violent, unnatural shudder ran through Seong-yun's entire body. To his shock, the unique properties of Heart Fusion forced him to directly share the physical sensations of the caster. Smiling wickedly, the mage drove a sharp dagger straight into his own arm. Seong-yun gritted his teeth as a sharp, agonizing wave of pain tore through his own arm, forcing his grip to fail as his weapon clattered onto the floor. He glared down at the phantom wound in intense irritation as his pain-tolerant skill instantly activated to suppress the shock.
All types of sustained pain have been reduced by 15%. A bald man hoisting a heavy shield aggressively closed the distance, scooping up seawater and splashing it directly onto his body. Seong-yun frantically moved to shield himself. A system notification flared, warning him that upon contact with the water, the majority of his endurance attributes would be penalized by 10 points for a duration of 3 minutes. Seong-yun was caught off guard, only now realizing that touching the water carried such a severe debuff. The adversary seized the opening and rushed him. The 2 enemy Vanguard Knights swung their weapons in a synchronized arc aimed straight at Seong-yun's head. Instead of panicking, a sharp smile played on the protagonist's lips. He calculated that this would indeed be a fatal predicament if he were just an ordinary player. The enemy swung his blade with lethal intent, but Seong-yun deftly slipped past the trajectory. Raising his free hand, he remarked coldly that their strategy to disarm him was actually quite clever. "But you made one catastrophic mistake," he added. One of the attackers saw Seong-yun's hand closing in and was paralyzed with fear. Seong-yun clamped his hand onto the challenger's skull and violently slammed him into the solid floor, roaring that they had picked the absolute wrong opponent. The remaining 3 enemies froze in utter shock. A notification blared. "You have unlocked an achievement, 1-hit kill. The skill Contempt for the Weak has been successfully generated." Seong-yun stood tall. Skill, Contempt for the Weak, Mastery 0%. Effect, activates exclusively when the enemy's attributes fail to surpass the user's. Raw power increases in direct proportion to the statistical disparity. The bald challenger launched a desperate surprise attack from behind. A system prompt flared. All of the enemy statistics are inferior to the user's. Contempt for the Weak has triggered. Strength +1. The bald man swung with everything he had, only to gasp in horror as Seong-yun completely vanished from his line of sight. In a fraction of a second, Seong-yun materialized and delivered a devastating kick straight to his face. Without breaking momentum, Seong-yun swung fluidly through the air and executed a brutal follow-up strike to the enemy's skull. A notification popped up. "You have unlocked the achievement, Merciless Killer. Agility +1. Seong-yun smiled coldly as the bald challenger collapsed onto the platform, completely unresponsive. At the exact same moment, the blonde leader gritted his teeth, his expression twisting with intense irritation. Seong-yun took a measured step forward. The remaining mage looked at his blonde leader in absolute terror, frantically asking, "What do we do? Do we attack him together?" Without warning, the blonde man swung his sword downward, brutally slashing through his own teammate's leg. The mage's face distorted into a mask of pure agony before he collapsed onto the floor, screaming at the top of his lungs. Simultaneously, Seong-yun winced as a sharp, sympathetic jolt of agony flared in his own leg. He was forced down onto one knee, panting heavily as he realized that while they shared the sensory perception of the pain through the link, thank goodness no actual physical damage had been transferred to his body. The only real issue was that the phantom agony severely restricted his mobility. The mangled Phage clutched his bleeding leg, screaming at the blonde man, questioning how he could still consider himself human after committing such a sickening act of betrayal. Unfazed, the blonde man continued to sadistically strike his crippled teammate, warning Seong-yun not to take another step. He aggressively asserted that if the protagonist advanced even an inch further, he would instantly execute the idiot. Seong-yun slowly forced himself back up onto his feet. Thanks to his pain-tolerant skill, he could still maintain operational movement.
Even so, executing a direct assault was going to be difficult. He paused, calculating his options. He ultimately realized he only had one viable choice left. He had to eliminate the mage immediately to break the link. As the mage wailed in excruciating pain from his mounting injuries, Seong-yun hurled his heavy shield with pinpoint accuracy, striking the mage cleanly across the throat. Instantly, Seong-yun gasped, feeling a terrifying, suffocating sensation of phantom pain lock around his own neck. He dropped to his knees, desperately clawing for air. Recognizing this as his absolute best window of opportunity, the blown man leaped forward, bringing his sword down in a lethal execution strike. However, Seong-yun reacted with superhuman reflexes, catching the descending blade barehanded with both palms. The protagonist stared dead into his eyes, asking in a low, sinister tone if the man was curious to know what it felt like to have his own throat severed, letting the agony bleed into every nerve of his body. The blown man let out a tense, terrified smirk, stammering for Seong-yun to just die. With a sharp twist, Seong-yun snapped the enemy's blade in half, gripped the broken shard in his hand, and cleanly decapitated him.
Seong-yun's expression remained terrifyingly indifferent as a spray of crimson blood erupted into the air around him. A notification materialized. You have unlocked the achievement Cold-Blooded Slasher. Points rewarded 1,500. Time has expired. Territory conquest phase complete. All across the surrounding platforms, the surviving players erupted into chaotic cheers of relief. Those who had managed to maintain genuine solidarity throughout the bloodbath embraced one another, overwhelmed with emotion. Observing the scene, the protagonist began to ponder whether this entire chaotic setup was orchestrated by someone else's hidden agenda. Countless players had charged into the trial fueled by raw greed, desperate to stack achievements by butchering one another. Yet in the end, the true victors were the ones who had maintained their integrity as a cohesive unit. Seong-yun glanced over his shoulder, noting silently that there were always grim exceptions to the rule. He fixed his gaze on a lone survivor, standing motionless and drenched in blood, who was muttering crazily to himself that he hadn't done anything wrong, that the blame laid entirely on the weak bastards who had failed to dodge his attacks. Seong-yun stared down at his own hands, wondering if he too now resembled a monster in the eyes of others. A system alert flashed. Congratulations! You have successfully cleared the 6th floor of the challenge tower. As a reward, Mystery Box B rank has been delivered to your inventory. Points rewarded 8,000. A departure portal door opened. Simultaneously, tendrils of dark energy began to drift out from the corpses of the fallen challengers. You have successfully absorbed the spirits of players Lee, Onjun, Jinhu, Hans, and Seong-yun. The young man extended his palm, drinking in their residual power. Unique trait, Necromancy Mastery has reached 100%. Trait rank has advanced by 1 level. Necromancy is now D rank. With that, he transitioned into the 7th floor waiting room. Upon stepping out of the portal, Seong-yun noticed that the achievement directory feature was now formally unlocked. He pulled up the log. S-Class, First Return. A-Class, None. B-Class, None. C-Class, One Hit Kill. D-Class, Cold-Blooded Slasher. A-Class, D, The Endor the Flames, Ruthless Killer, Goblin Hunter, Betrayer. F-Class, None. Seong-yun analyzed the system interface thoroughly, noting to himself that his deduction was correct. First Return was an extraordinarily high-tier achievement. He tapped the screen to review the specific breakdowns.
The G-Rank one-hit kill achievement was unlocked by instantly neutralizing an adversary in a single strike, which rewarded him with the Contempt for the Weak skill. The E-Rank Merciless Killer title was granted to those who slaughtered challengers without a shred of hesitation. The D-Rank Cold-Blooded Slasher achievement was exclusively awarded to candidates who managed to eliminate 5 or more challengers within a single trial instance. Seong-yun mused that he had inadvertently hoarded a massive amount of achievements simply through the act of killing. It was clear that each unlock milestone bestowed a diverse array of rewards ranging from raw skill points to permanent attribute stat boosts. Seong-yun opened his inventory and pulled out the random loot box, which was neatly bound with a bright yellow ribbon. The system indicated he could pull one randomized item from the container, spanning anywhere from F rank to B rank. Seong-yun stared at the box in his hands, muttering that the rewards from the 6th floor were somewhat underwhelming. If the parameters were kept at B rank, he couldn't afford to get his hopes up. Pulling the ribbon loose, he cracked the box open and began to channel his energy. A brilliant, blinding light erupted from the container. Seong-yun flinched in surprise as a small figure suddenly vaulted out from the depths of the box. A miniature green goblin executed a perfect mid-air flip and landed cleanly on the floor. Seong-yun stared at the creature in utter bewilderment. Then, a small smirk spread across his face as he whispered, "What kind of creature is this? A goblin?" He wondered if the system considered this an entity that could be captured. Instantly dashed forward, reaching his hands out to grab it. However, the tiny creature displayed incredible agility, cleanly slipping past his fingers at the very last second. Seong-yun gave chase, pursuing the creature across the room until he finally managed to pin the small entity down. Seong-yun let out a triumphant laugh, shouting in excitement. But the moment it was caught, the goblin opened its jaws wide and let out a piercing shriek.
With a surge of hidden strength, the creature beat down violently on Seong-yun's hand, inflicting a sharp wave of pain. The tiny beast then leaped backward, knitting its brow in fury as it bared its sharp fangs. A flash of irritation sparked within Seong-yun. In his mind, he had considered the little creature somewhat cute, which was why he had tried to handle it gently.
But as he coiled his muscles to leap, he declared coldly that the creature would receive no further leniency. Seong-yun charged forward at a blistering speed, but the goblin executed a massive vertical leap to evade the trajectory. Anticipating the evasion, Seong-yun calculated the trajectory, launched himself into a fluid mid-air summer flip, and reoriented his body directly above his target. Taking precise aim, Seong-yun plummeted toward the tiny creature at breakneck speed. His fist slammed into the goblin's head with catastrophic force, landing a critical hit. The impact zone instantly flushed crimson, and the creature shattered into pieces, leaving nothing behind but a beautiful necklace. The system immediately offered its congratulations, announcing that he had successfully pulled the absolute highest tier item available from the randomized loot box. Seong-yun stared down at his prize, noting that if the system classified it as the highest tier, the item had to be at least a solid B rank. The necklace radiated a serene blue luminescence. The item description materialized, explaining that it was a pendant forged from the soul of a master blacksmith, capable of permanently boosting the efficiency of all metal-based and swordsmanship skills by 7%. Seong-yun picked up the pendant, inspecting it closely while analyzing its parameters. He then channeled his raw mana into the accessory to test its active capabilities. Within seconds, a dense energy enveloped his entire body. The system reported that the pendant had successfully triggered its exclusive effect. The user's skin is now fortified to absorb 10% of all incoming physical damage.
He let out a soft exclamation of awe, completely mesmerized by the shimmering light dancing across the surface of the pendant. Internally, he conceded that this item possessed parameters that were exponentially superior to the vast majority of standard A-rank gear, seamlessly combining both offensive and defensive utilities. It was, for all intents and purposes, a total cheat item. He fastened the pendant securely around his neck, noting with deep satisfaction that despite his initial lack of expectations, he had walked away with an incredible asset. But suddenly, his expression froze. He went stiff as a stark system warning flashed across his vision. Warning, your mana reserves have been entirely depleted. The exclusive effect has been automatically deactivated. Utterly bewildered, he rapidly deduced that the exclusive defensive buff drained a catastrophic amount of mana in a matter of seconds. Seong-yun tucked the pendant safely beneath his shirt, realizing he would need to conserve his energy and deploy this item strictly during critical make-or-break moments. He turned his focus back to the system interface, intending to evaluate the updated status window of his newly ranked-up unique trait. However, his attention was abruptly shattered by a jarring system prompt asking if he was prepared to immediately commence the 7th floor challenge. Seong-yun stared at the screen in complete confusion, entirely unable to comprehend the prompt, as there was always a mandatory grace period enforced before the next floor's trial could begin.
Standing in the center of the room, he noted that if it was possible to initiate a challenge early, he saw absolutely no reason to delay. He began to wonder if the waiting period had been eliminated for other participants as well. The system reported that he was entering the high-difficulty community forum. A user named Tower Fairy asked, "Is everyone noticing that the trial waiting period is completely gone?" Scanning the comments, Seong-yun concluded that just as he had suspected, everyone could now immediately initiate challenges without waiting. He pointed at the system interface, thinking to himself that no one actually cared about the missing countdown, nor were they truly interested in unlocking Pioneer benefits. All they wanted was to go home. Lowering his head, he wondered if this was because the vast majority of them were low-ranked hunters. He analyzed the comments meticulously and realized that compared to the 6th floor, the way people communicated had drastically shifted. Visualizing the sinister faces of the participants, he concluded that those maniacs had now grown noticeably quieter. The next challenge was a solo trial. Consequently, communicating with others would yield absolutely no tactical advantage. With a composed expression, Seong-yun realized he also needed to remain vigilant against ruthless killers who treated their allies' lives as mere stepping stones for personal gain. Clenching his fist and slamming it into his palm, Seong-yun declared that the absolute priority was to develop skills that were completely invincible against anything.
He pulled up the system menu and read the detailed breakdown of his unique trait. His eyebrows shot up in surprise as he noticed that the description of the base effect now featured far more profound details. He schematically visualized how the harvested souls could be repurposed into magic that simultaneously fortified his strength and acted as a protective shield. Seong-yun mused that previously, the primary focus of this unique trait was strictly attribute amplification, but now the souls could be actively utilized as a source of magic and a defensive barrier. Waving his hand to open another window, Seong-yun hoped for something like an increased drop rate for new skills, because anything could happen in this place, and what he desperately needed most was a skill to protect his physical body.
He retrieved his sword dari inventory dan melemparkannya ke atas, bertekad untuk menguji seberapa efektif barir spiritual barunya truly was. Dropping his hands to his sides, Seong-yun declared that he had to take this gamble. Even if his hand were severed, the waiting room was equipped with an automatic healing effect. Sword berputar dengan cepat, plummeting toward him at breakneck speed and almost clipping his wrist before a brilliant bright red light instantly illuminating the surrounding area. The system notified him that a soul had successfully absorbed the incoming damage directed at him. The sword floated back up into the air, enveloped by a swirling vortex of energy. The system then added that the spirit of Song Jin-hook had been consumed, leaving him with 3 out of 30 available soul slots occupied. Seong-yun inspected the targeted area of his body in utter shock before a smile spread across his face. The defensive efficacy of this protection had exponentially surpassed his expectations. Glancing at his current soul count, he noted that it would be wiser not to absorb every single soul, but rather to leave several as a strategic reserve for self-defense. He then opened the information panel to check the global leaderboard updates following his recent trial. The system displayed the player rankings, showing Seong-yun's name in the 4th position. With a slightly disappointed expression, he remarked that while dropping to 4th place was somewhat regrettable, it wasn't a major issue. To secure the pioneer title, he simply needed to maintain a position within the top 50. Loosening up his body to warm up, he muttered that he was quite exhausted after checking all these various parameters. However, he had no time to idle around. A portal tore open in the space before him. He decided that it was finally time to face the next challenge. System windows began to pop up, announcing that the high difficulty 7th floor trial was about to commence.
The theme of this specific trial was The Proof, with a designated time limit of 40 minutes. The condition to clear the floor was to successfully overcome 3 distinct trials within the allotted time. Failure, on the other hand, was dictated by the challenger's demise or the expiration of the clock. If successful, the promised reward was the Wind Grace skill, while the penalty for failure was death. Seong-yun now found himself standing in the dead center of a pitch-black corridor. He knit his brows in confusion, unable to comprehend where he had been transported. The overall atmosphere of this place felt completely distinct from any of his previous trials. Walking straight ahead, he thought to himself that he couldn't sense a single presence around him, a realization that made him feel deeply unsettled. A sudden gust of wind blew past, causing his hair to flicker. Without warning, a brilliant light erupted at the far end of the corridor. The wave of light rapidly enveloped his entire body, teleporting him directly into the first trial zone. He now stood in the middle of a vast desert. The system informed him that he must overcome all of his fears. Scanning his surroundings, he instantly recognized the environment. Seong-yun noted that everything was unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. In an instant, a colossal wall of sand loomed directly in front of him. He stared upward, realizing that it was a massive sand golem. Seong-yun recalled that to successfully clear this floor, he had to conquer 3 challenges within the remaining time limit. He deduced that this zone was a direct replica of the training exam he had previously undergone. This meant the 3 trials he had already cleared would be manifested once more. For his current self, Seong-yun felt he could obliterate the sand golem even with his eyes closed. He wondered to himself, is the tower effectively telling me to skip straight to the 8th floor? Seong-yun watched as massive sheets of sand cascaded from the golem's shoulders. Golem continued to expand in height, rendering Seong-yun musculous beneath its towering shadow. Staring up once more, he remarked that he didn't remember the golem being threat this massive before. The monster's eyes ignited with a blinding glow. Seong-yun unleashed a subtle smirk, realizing the scale of this golem was easily 3 times larger than the original one. The golem raised its arm and began to swing its massive right fist directly towards Seong-yun. Seong-yun instantly manifested his sword and shield from his inventory, resolving to go on the offensive. He charged straight towards the trajectory of the incoming punch, deftly veered off the attack path at the last second and leaped onto the monster's arm. Maintaining a dead serious expression, he rapidly scaled the golem's body, sprinting towards its head. Finally, he vaulted off the golem's head. Suspending mid-air in an inverted position, he thought to himself that this entire setup felt incredibly bizarre. Looking down at the Sand Titan, he realized that its primary weak point, the golem's core, was completely invisible. Seong-yun began to assume that the larger the golem's physical form grew, the deeper the core was embedded within its body. Suddenly, the golem spun around with shocking speed and locked its gaze onto him. Seong-yun's expression tightened just before the monster's hand shot toward him like a rocket. The golem snared him out of midair, sand continuously slipping through its massive fingers. Suddenly, a brilliant blue light erupted from the palm of the golem's hand. An explosion of compressed sand detonated, breaking Seong-yun free as he soared upward. He declared that if he couldn't neutralize the adversary in a single hit, he would simply hack it to pieces. He plummeted back into the combat zone, unleashing a rapid barrage of slashes across the golem's body. Sticking the landing, his boots skidded heavily across the loose sand. Seong-yun analyzed the superficial lacerations inflicted on the golem. A faint smile played on his lips as he reasoned that just as he had calculated, continuously hacking away at the monster would achieve nothing unless he located and pulverized its core.
The golem raised both of its massive arms and unleashed a deafening roar. Seong-yun detected the monster's mounting rage. The titan coiled its legs, bracing itself before launching a massive vertical leap. Realizing its intent, Seong-yun immediately bolted in the opposite direction, casting an anxious glance over his shoulder. He noted that dodging the direct impact wasn't the issue. Rather, the resulting tidal wave of sand could prove catastrophically dangerous. The monster's feet slammed violently into the desert floor, generating a massive shockwave of sand. Seong-yun ran at absolute full throttle, attempting to outrun the crushing kinetic wave. However, he lost his footing as the powerful shockwave overtook him. A massive detonation of sand rocked the desert, sending a thick curtain of dust and debris soaring into the sky. As the dust slowly began to settle, the silhouette of the golem materialized from behind the sandy veil. Seong-yun appeared half buried in the loose earth. He let out a dry laugh, feeling a surge of irritation. Forcing himself up, he glared intensely at the golem. He raised his blade defensively in front of his chest. The golem marched closer, both arms extended forward. At that moment, Seong-yun began to channel a dense aura from his body, executing the 3 grades technique as the system displayed the skill description. Moving at supernatural speed, Seong-yun flew right past the golem, cleanly severing its arm. The golem spun its head back, looking genuinely shocked to see its limb detached. Upon landing, Seong-yun unleashed a succession of follow-up strikes. With a single fluid cleave, he successfully hacked through the monster's defenses. In that exact moment, his mind flashed back to that dark night when he had faced the grim reality of a floor invasion.
At that moment, he had felt nothing but irritation. Now, however, he felt he actually owed a debt of gratitude to the challenger who had intruded upon that exam. The golem's severed arm rapidly began to regenerate. Seong-yun reasoned that even though the golem could continuously knit itself back together using the surrounding sand, he simply needed to keep hacking away at it until he uncovered its core. The massive construct bent down, looming closer to Seong-yun. With swift, mathematically precise movements, Seong-yun repeatedly sliced through the golem's sandy form. Eventually, feeling fatigue and annoyance creeping in, he cursed under his breath, wondering just where the hell the monster's core was hidden. Suddenly, his eyebrows shot up in surprise as he stood directly in front of the titan. He asked in a remarkably calm tone, "When did you become so cute?" The golem appeared utterly taken aback and froze in its tracks. Its face even flushed crimson, marking the first time it had ever been called cute. Seong-yun noticed that the golem's massive frame had drastically shrunk, concluding that the sand, the primary source material for its body, could no longer be infinitely pulled from the immediate environment. That was likely why its scale was diminishing. He lowered his gaze, an idea sparking in his mind. A mad grin spread across his face. Gripping his sword firmly, he asked the golem, "Do you want to go on a diet again?" The golem opened its jaws and unleashed a violent roar. The two instantly surged forward, launching a coordinated assault. Seong-yun swung fluidly through the air, slipping past the golem's incoming fist, and executed a powerful spinning heel kick that completely pulverized the monster's right arm. With his jaw tightly clenched and iron resolve, Seong-yun flashed past the golem at breakneck speed, cleaving it into multiple segments. The dismembered parts of the golem's body rained scattered across the sand. Yet the monster stubbornly drew the earth back together to reconstruct itself. Though it had shrunk significantly further, the miniature golem growled, locking its glaring eyes onto Seong-yun.
On the bright side, Seong-yun had finally located the core, a brilliant crystal hidden deep within the monster's back. He realized that the layer of sand originally encasing its form had been so exceptionally dense that piercing through to the core had been nearly impossible. He also calculated that roughly 10 minutes had already slipped away, leaving him with only 30 minutes to completely clear the 7th floor trial. It was definitely time to accelerate the pace. Suddenly, a blindingly fast attack rushed toward him. At the absolute last second, he managed to weave past it. He continuously drifted around the golem strikes, noting that now that its body had shrunk, its operational movements were exponentially more agile. Seong-yun rapidly sprinted behind the monster's flank, muttering, "As much as I'd love to play around with you a bit longer, I simply don't have the luxury of time." An instant later, Seong-yun drove his weapon directly into the monster's core. The golem opened its jaws and unleashed a heart-wrenching, agonizing shriek as its crystal nucleus shattered into a million pieces. A notification flashed, "You have successfully overcome your fear. The first phase of the trial is complete." The golem's body collapsed into a harmless mound of dust, and a brilliant, blinding light abruptly ignited in the air. Seong-yun scanned his surroundings, a look of surprise crossing his face as the dimensional space around him began to dissolve. Realizing this was a critical window, he hurriedly reached his palm out, desperate to harvest the golem's residual spirit before it vanished. The swirling current of the soul was drawn toward his palm, as Seong-yun strained every muscle not to let it slip away. Ultimately, however, a system warning materialized, announcing that the spirit absorption process had failed. Seong-yun clicked his tongue in pure irritation, muttering that a valuable trait mastery boost had just evaporated into air thin. The system then broadcasted the next stage. "You have entered the second trial zone. Prove that you have grown wiser." Seong-yun found himself standing in the dead center of a catastrophic inferno. Scanning the area, he instantly recognized the terrain.
An orc village was burning to the ground just beyond the clearing, with the mangled corpses of orc fighters strewn everywhere. Seong-yun realized that this trial was an exact reconstruction of his past choices. Lifting a burning curtain, he stepped outside, only to freeze at the sight before him. A lone orc was kneeling beside the lifeless body of its comrade, intensely taking in the carnage. Seong-yun deduced that these were the orc sentry forces, remembering how he had completely obliterated this village back on the 2nd floor. Now the grim aftermath of his actions was being played back to him. The monster touched the pulse on its companion's cold neck. Locking its fierce eyes forward, the orc's body began to vibrate violently with unbridled rage, before it unleashed a deafening guttural roar. Seong-yun realized that the orc had entered a full-blown berserk state, a condition of pure mindless fury common among high-tier monsters. He lowered his hand, noting that an orc in this state was no longer a pathetic level 1 mob. This meant his luck had officially run out. The enraged orcs instantly launched a blistering assault. With a dead serious expression, Seong-yun muttered that monsters had no right to display grief over losing their kin. The system immediately reported the simultaneous activation of instantaneous acceleration and his advanced physical skills. Seong-yun vaulted forward with explosive kinetic force, stating coldly that they shouldn't dare display such human emotions, at least not in front of him. A few moments of high-speed combat flashed by, leaving the chief orc commander drop to its knees. The monster let out a low ragged groan, panting heavily as its head hung low. All of its comrades lay completely lifeless in the dirt around it. Seong-yun looked down at the beast with cold indifference, asking, "Are you sick to your stomach watching yourself stand frozen, completely powerless as your family is slaughtered?" The monster erupted into a final desperate frenzy. Forcing itself up, it swung its massive right arm, but Seong-yun smoothly slipped beneath the trajectory. A sharp glint of energy ignited in Seong-yun's eyes. With one fluid lightning-fast motion, he cleanly decapitated his opponent. The system blared, "You have proven your wisdom. The second phase of the trial is complete."
Casting a swift glance over his shoulder, Seong-yun knew he had to move fast this time. He extended his hand, aggressively gathering the drifting souls into his palm, just as his body began to be vacuumed into the next dimensional portal. The system confirmed. All arc spirits have been successfully absorbed. Trait mastery has increased by 6%. Total stored souls, 19 units. A satisfied smile played on his lips as Seong-yun clenched his fist. The system then chimed with additional notifications.
Mastery over the Hunter Swordsmanship skill has reached 100%. The skill has successfully ranked up. Mastery over the Instantaneous Acceleration skill has reached 100%. The environment rapidly shifted around him. You have entered the third trial zone, proof that you have completely overcome your hesitation. Seong-yun stared straight ahead, noting to himself that this time his mental fortitude was truly going to be pushed to its absolute limits. He found himself standing on a narrow, seemingly endless highway, cleaving directly through a vast ocean. To his utter shock, he realized this was an exact replica of the battle arena from the 6th floor. Looking back, he mused that since the first two zones were reconstructions of the first and second floors, he had fully expected a duplication of the third floor here. Reflecting on the unpredictable nature of the tower, he noted that he wouldn't have been surprised if that previous absurd trial had been classified as a test of wisdom. He would only end up disappointed if he kept expecting even a shred of conventional logic inside this place. Opening his inventory, he pulled out a premium potion of life. With a fluid movement, he popped the cap and downed the contents. The rejuvenating effects of the potion immediately surged through his veins. As his fatigue mended, he glanced at the empty glass vial in his hand and casually tossed it into the sea, musing with a smirk that he was slightly polluting the trial's environment. Seconds later, a massive tidal wave erupted directly behind him. A terrifyingly powerful column of pressurized water slammed upward, forcibly ripping massive concrete slabs clean off the highway. Seong-yun stared back in genuine shock, muttering that he had only thrown a tiny glass bottle. The system immediately reported, the assassin's cloak effect has triggered. Movement speed has been amplified by 15 points. Utilizing the massive speed burst, he bolted away from the oncoming destruction. Seong-yun calculated that so far the trial parameters were strictly adhering to the established rules of the 6th floor.
This meant that to successfully clear this final phase, he had to locate and step onto the designated Red Fortress tile. The violent plumes of water continued to shoot skyward, twisting into bizarre, unnatural patterns. Seong-yun deduced that until he successfully identified that specific red tile, he absolutely could not make contact with the water under any circumstances. Maintaining a blistering sprint, he felt a brief wave of relief as he realized his speed was high enough to keep the pursuing waves at bay. That meant he could maintain a straight trajectory without getting overtaken. In a sudden twist of kinetic chaos, a violent eruption of water forcefully hurled a displaced concrete slab directly beneath his footing. He lost his balance, tripping and accidentally making contact with the surging water. Instantly, the system penalized him. Warning: contact with water established. Strength, agility, and stamina attributes have been debuffed by 10 points each. Duration, 2 minutes and 59 seconds. The relentless tide continued to hammer the highway, launching massive concrete blocks into the air like missiles. Seong-yun realized that the structural configuration of the tiles wasn't remaining static. The conventional laws of physics simply didn't apply to this tower. Gritting his teeth through the attribute drain, he aggressively activated instantaneous acceleration. Bracing himself against a tilted slab, he violently launched his body forward, executing a rapid succession of precise bounds across the next two floating platforms. With his jaw clenched tight, he told himself that there was absolutely no way he was going to die in a place like this. He maintained his breakneck pace, fluidly leaping from block to block. The moment his eyes locked onto a brilliant red tile in the distance, he reoriented his entire trajectory toward it. Internally, Seong-yun was certain that it was the fortress tile he needed. He thought to himself with a surge of adrenaline that this agonizingly tedious trial was finally about to hit its conclusion. Suddenly, the water surface began to violently churn, warping into a massive, terrifying whirlpool. Multiple high-pressure streams of fluids shot into the sky simultaneously, completely walling off his path of advancement. The water tightly spiraled like a massive drill bit, plummeting straight down toward him from above. Seong-yun snarled that the trial hour had officially gone completely insane. Executing two lightning-fast maneuvers, he vaulted over the closing hazards, soaring directly toward the red tile. A faint smile touched his lips as he realized he was only inches away from safety. However, the churning torrents pursued him with terrifying velocity. A catastrophic impact violently slammed into his back, and his vision instantly blurred as the crushing weight of the water began to swallow him whole. Behind him, a blazing red energy ignited as a dark aura spread aggressively through the air. The system reported that an orc spirit had fully absorbed the damage intended for the user. Consequently, one third or soul dissolved into nothingness. The chaotic energy continued to coalesce, successfully halting the crushing torrent of water, which caused a second orc soul to vanish. Seong-yun glanced back, directly feeling the concussive force of the massive shockwave. Yet, right before the impact could tear into him, the spiritual barrier shielded his body. He executed a clean mid-air somber flip, drifting sharply to the side. The moment his boots touched the surface, he bolted. The relentless columns of water pursued him at a blistering pace, with a mere 10 seconds remaining on the clock. Right at that critical juncture, the exclusive buff of the assassin's cloak deactivated. Seong-yun panicked, realizing his mana reserves were completely dried up. If his instantaneous acceleration failed to trigger now, this would be the end of the line.
He concentrated a dense concentration of red energy into the palm of his hand, jammed the orb of energy into his mouth, and swallowed it whole. A vibrant red aura violently erupted from his chest. The system confirmed that his mana had been successfully replenished by consuming the Orc Hunter spirit. He let out a sigh of relief. His operational power had returned. With the drilling torrent of water still closing in on his flank, Seong-yun sprinted with everything he had, locking his eyes onto the distant red tile. He was inches away. Suddenly, a massive wall of water erupted directly in front of him. He flinched, cursing under his breath as the crushing tide behind him threatened to pin him down. Caught in a little pincer movement with no other choice, Seong-yun took a desperate gamble and lunged straight through the watery barricade. The moment he crossed the threshold, his silhouette blurred beneath the crushing downpour. Ultimately, he managed to pierce through to the other side. The system reported that yet another orc spirit had evaporated to preserve his life. He was now suspended mid-air, hovering directly over the raging waves. Falling inverted, he curled his body into a tight defensive ball to absorb the impact and unleash a fierce roar. As the solid ground rushed up to meet his vision, his face tightened with apprehension.
An instant later, his body slammed violently into the concrete highway with catastrophic force. 2 more orc souls vanished in a flash, leaving his strategic reserve at 12 units. As the dense screen of dust slowly dissipated, Seong-yun was left sprawling flat on the ground. He opened his eyes, his expression shifting into utter shock as he saw a massive undulating whirlpool hanging suspended directly above his head. The churning tip of the vortex vibrated violently, leaving him completely bewildered. But a moment later, the system blared, announcing that he had successfully conquered his hesitation, the defining condition required to clear this phase. The suspended whirlpool instantly lost its structural integrity, and an immense deluge of water crashed down on top of him. Saturated and dripping wet, he narrowed his eyes and grumbled internally. This trial had been an absolute nightmare. Even after completing the objectives, he was forced to suffer until the absolute last second. Suddenly, a succession of system notifications flared across his screen. You have successfully conquered the 7th floor of the trial tower. As a reward for this achievement, you have received the skill Grace of the Wind, 18,000 points, and a pair of boots of swiftness which have been directly delivered to your inventory. The system then prompted him for immediate dimensional transfer to the waiting area. Seong-yun stepped forward into the glowing portal. Upon materializing in the waiting room, he unclasped his heavy coat and hung his head low. The grim memories of the chaotic trial flashed vividly across his mind. With a somber expression, fully aware of how close he had come to a catastrophic failure, he bit his lip. A wave of anxiety washed over him regarding the prospect of advancing directly onto the 8th floor.
Internally, he doubted whether blind luck would continue to favor him as it had in the previous zones. Suddenly, he snapped his head up as a subtle rhythmic tremor rippled through the room. A massive system interface expanded before his eyes, broadcasting an announcement. The total number of challengers who have successfully cleared the 7th floor has officially surpassed 1,000. Consequently, the tower's parameters are being expanded. The skill shop is now unlocked. A permanent crossover intersection has been established within the trials to allow back travel, and the floor invasion system is now fully active. Reading through the rapid influx of data, he realized that this was the very update he had been anticipating for so long. However, his brow furrowed once more when a personalized alert materialized. You have been recognized as a pioneer across all preceding floors. As a consequence of this achievement, you are granted the exclusive right to select one Halo or Aura title. A Halo was a premier specialized benefit reserved solely for candidates who had maintained an unbroken streak of pioneer titles on every preceding floor. The system noted that this selection would permanently modify his unique trait and active skills. Consequently, he had to choose with absolute wisdom. Internally, Seong-yun wondered if the tower had ever explicitly offered this type of direct evidence before. If it was stepping in now, the choice of a Halo had to be an asset of paramount importance. The system then presented him with 3 distinct options: Ruler's Halo, Hunter's Halo, and Monk's Halo. Staring intently at the screen, he analyzed the options, noting that he needed to thoroughly evaluate each individual description before locking in his choice. He first opened the logs for the Ruler's Halo, which was classified as a universal type asset whose ultimate performance skill scaled dynamically based on the identity of its user. Rather than being a hyper-focused specialist tool, it was a comprehensive universal buff deeply intertwined with the challenger's unique trait. This Halo exponentially amplified potential across multiple disciplines, including active combat, growth factors, support utilities, and production. Its signature unique capability was the skill synthesis function, and the system explicitly highlighted this choice as the absolute most optimized halo for his current status. His eyebrows shot up in surprise upon realizing that this asset could directly alter his entire skill kit and his unique traits simultaneously. Reading the concluding lines with meticulous focus, he noted that the tower was essentially screaming at him that the ruler's halo was the premier choice. Even so, he resolved to cross-examine the alternate options first. The system then displayed the parameters for the Hunter's Halo, which was described as a highly adaptable asset that could be seamlessly integrated by any archetype. This choice was strictly tied to the raw escalation of unique traits and skills, significantly boosting attribute statistics and skill levels. Its signature capability was Level Breakthrough, and the system evaluated this option as highly compatible with his build. Reading through it, he conceded that it wasn't a bad choice by any means. Finally, he pulled up the data for the Monk's Halo. The system explained that this path was heavily reliant on raw talent and relentless perseverance. The longer an individual dedicated themselves to training, the more formidable they became. However, it demanded immense time investment and innate aptitude. Without those prerequisites, all effort could easily amount to nothing. Its signature capability was designated as the path of cultivation, and the system explicitly warned that this selection was strictly anti-recommended for the protagonist. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he split the system window into 3 panels, declaring that this option was completely out of the question. That left him to decide between the 2 remaining choices. After calculating all the long-term variables, he lowered his hand and tapped definitively on one of the interface screens. A brilliant, blinding luminescence erupted from the display. Behind the glow, system alerts flashed in rapid succession. You have chosen the sigil of the Sovereign Eagle. The exclusive properties of the ruler's halo have initiated a forced evolution of your unique trait.
The system outlined multiple evolutionary branches, mapping out a trajectory focused on necromancy, or the dark art of resurrection, stating that he could now actively execute spirit summonings or harvest high-tier souls to reanimate formidable skeleton vanguards. Next, the system displayed an alternate path, the Magic Swordsman, informing him that his natural aptitude for both blade techniques and magic arts would increase drastically, while his acquisition rate for related skills would be amplified 3-fold. Finally, the system mapped out a progression path as a blacksmith, showcasing that he could walk the path of a master creator. Under this blueprint, his capability to forge high-tier items would skyrocket, and his production skill acquisition speed would be boosted by 300%. Seong-yun stared at the 3 evolutionary blueprints in absolute awe. He touched the screen with his index finger, a smirk playing on his lips as he muttered that this was an absolute no-brainer of a decision. Seong-yun scrutinized the interface as it processed his choice. The Summoner attribute has been successfully integrated into your unique trait Necromancy. As a consequence of this evolution, structural properties have been modified, and newly detailed sub-effects have been unlocked. Furthermore, the unique capability Skill Synthesis has been generated. A vortex of dark dense energy began to violently gyrate, funneling directly into Seong-yun's core. The system opened his updated status profile. The player stepped forward, a wave of profound satisfaction washing over him. He looked down, watching the energy continuously pull within his chest, thinking to himself that he finally possessed a halo. He tapped the screen to unpack the specific description of the skill synthesis capability. The mechanics of the skill allowed the user to select any 2 skills within their log and fuse them together into a singular entity. If the proficiency levels of the selected skills differed, the higher ranking skill would serve as the anchor for the synthesis process. Seong-yun was caught completely off guard, realizing that by fusing seemingly obsolete or low-tier skills together, he could potentially engineer entirely unprecedented abilities.
This was an absolute jackpot! The system then prompted him to review his current skill log and designate the catalyst materials for the synthesis process. Seong-yun meticulously reviewed his directory, calculating the optimum combinations he wanted to fuse. Resting his chin in his hand, he scanned for abilities that were highly situational or rarely deployed in active combat. Ultimately, he selected 2 specific skills, Contempt for the Weak and Continue the Battle. The system issued a final confirmation prompt. Without a shred of hesitation, Seong-yun slammed the confirmation button to execute the fusion sequence. The system interface ignited with a blinding white light. A notification flared. A completely new skill has been successfully engineered. The brilliant luminescence illuminated Seong-yun's face as the logs updated.
The new skill, Force Breakthrough, has been generated. He read through the parameters of the ability with a look of pure fascination. The system explained that this skill granted the player the power to cleanly shatter and pierce through physical barriers or spatial restrictions erected by enemy active skills and innate traits. However, the mandatory prerequisite dictated that the player's raw magic attribute output had to strictly exceed the magic grade of the opposing barrier.
Behind him, the logic of the tower defied expectations once again. Seong-yun could not fathom how this had transpired. He had merely synthesized two low-ranking abilities, fully expecting to receive a standard E-rank skill at best. Yet, against all odds, the synthesis had engineered a formidable D-rank skill. A satisfied smile played on his lips as he realized that Force Breakthrough was a truly phenomenal asset. He pointed back toward the system interface, eager to attempt another combination. The system once again prompted him to designate the catalyst materials for his next synthesis. This time, he selected Ranger Training and Burn Resistance, immediately confirming the fusion sequence. The system interface ignited with a brilliant luminescence once more. Seong-yun smiled in anticipation, eagerly awaiting the structural outcome. A premier high-tier C-rank skill was generated, granting the player the ability to maintain a baseline level of operational vision even under catastrophic environmental conditions. However, Seong-yun froze entirely as he analyzed the resulting parameters. The newly engineered ability was merely a single tier higher than the base materials he had sacrificed. Staring upward, he pondered the catalyst variables behind the synthesis. In his mind, he reconstructed his very first combination and realized those two skills fundamentally complemented one another's core mechanics. Yet, when he analyzed the two skills he had just fused, he instantly felt that the combination had been structurally incompatible from the very beginning. He collapsed backward onto the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. He murmured to himself that he had traversed a brutal, exhausting journey from a raw pioneer to finally securing a premier Halo reward. Yet, for some inexplicable reason, an unsettling sensation lingered in his chest. Lying flat, he wondered if everything he had achieved up to this point was truly the product of his own blood and iron resolve, or simply a streak of blind luck born from possessing a broken unique trait.
Seong-yun fell silent for a long moment. Shortly after, he forced himself up from the mattress, resolving to bury the pointless philosophical doubts. It would be infinitely more productive to thoroughly inspect the premier rewards he had just pocketed. He pulled up the directory to evaluate the description for Grace of the Wind. The active properties of the skill allowed him to amplify all aspects of his operational speed by 10%. The system reported that the effect could be stacked up to a maximum of 7 times. However, upon reaching the threshold cap, a mandatory 24-hour cooldown sequence would be automatically enforced. Reading through the parameters, Seong-yun marveled at its utility. The ability to stack the buff 7 times meant he could potentially accelerate any form of kinetic movement by a staggering 70%. He visualized a brilliant aura of wind enveloping his frame, noting with immense satisfaction that the ability consumed absolutely 0 mana. Grace of the Wind was, for all intents and purposes, a flawless skill without a single tactical drawback. Opening his inventory, he pulled out a pair of pristine boots. Slipping them on, he inspected the footwear with a proud smile. The system updated its logs, reporting that these speed boots permanently boosted his attack speed by 3% and his base movement velocity by 5%. Seong-yun noted that every single clear reward from the 7th floor seemed entirely optimized for speed amplification, and he was immensely pleased with the build progression. Suddenly, the system opened the newly unlocked skill shop, displaying an expansive manifest of active abilities available for purchase. Seong-yun scanned the list, but contrary to his high expectations, the overall quality of the selection was profoundly underwhelming.
Furthermore, he calculated that the point pricing for each skill was astronomically inflated. Seong-yun shook his head in deep disappointment upon realizing he would have to fork over 8,000 points just for a baseline instant stat booster. Even so, he pressed the purchase button regardless, recognizing that his arsenal desperately lacked magic-oriented abilities. A notification flashed, confirming his purchase of the Magic Circuit skill, which instantly deducted 15,000 points from his account balance. Next, he acquired Magic Resistance for a heavy fee of 12,000 points. The system detailed that Magic Resistance manifested a total shroud of physical protection across the user's body, significantly mitigating incoming hostile spells. However, the system warned that without an active Magic Circuit, the defensive efficacy of the skill would be drastically compromised. Recalling his previous bloodbaths, he calculated that with this newly acquired resistance kit, he would no longer be caught off guard when facing complex, unique traits like heart fusion, a broken mechanic that had severely pushed him to his limits in the past. Seong-yun immediately triggered the Magic Circuit integration. His physical form began to violently radiate raw mana as the glowing sigils of a magical chain etched themselves permanently onto his skin.
He gritted his teeth as a searing volcanic wave of heat raced through his entire nervous system. His body ignited with an increasingly brilliant luminescence, unleashing a crushing, turbulent torrent of pure kinetic energy. The heavy sheets on his bed billowed violently from the pressure before the energy finally dissipated, letting the fabric settle. The protagonist dropped his boots to the floor and stood up from the bed, marveling at how weightless his body now felt.
Taking a few measured steps forward, Seong-yun stopped in the center of the room and lowered his gaze. He concentrated a dense mass of mana into his foot and aggressively stomped the ground. Instantly, a devastating concussive shockwave detonated outward. Seong-yun stared at the structural destruction in absolute shock. The floor beneath his foot was completely shattered into a crater of debris. He deduced that the spontaneous flow of mana had successfully mapped into a circuit chain, exponentially amplifying his raw physical skill output. Smiling with profound satisfaction, he clenched his fist, incredibly pleased that he had made the right tactical investment. Seong-yun then reviewed an updated system prompt, informing him that he could now weaponize the spirits of the fallen to reanimate deceased entities in his immediate vicinity. Upon activation, the raw combat level of the resurrected creatures would scale dynamically in direct proportion to the quality and quantity of the souls he had harvested. Seong-yun felt a surge of curiosity regarding his newest active skill, Raise Dead. However, he swiped the notification away, muttering that it would be far better to put the mechanics into practice inside an active trial. Resting both hands on his hips, he let out a heavy sigh. The protagonist pressed his lips together, carefully calculating the next phase of his operations. With a dead serious expression, he weighed the long-term variables of whether he should immediately breach the 8th floor or temporarily return to Earth. Meanwhile, on Earth, a young hunter named Won was staring anxiously at his phone, nervously tapping his foot in frustration because not a single candidate had applied for his raid party. Suddenly, he sensed multiple shadows closing in on his position. A heavily built, stout man wearing a traditional patchy cap polished, flanked by a fully geared vanguard squad. The leader asked condescendingly if Won had successfully finalized the team yet. He then added with a smirk that Won had better hand over his dungeon portal entry permit to them.
Flashing a sly predatory grin, the stout man explained that if a challenger failed to breach the designated dungeon instance within the strict time limit, their corporate ownership rights over the portal would be automatically revoked by the system. The heavyset hunter offered a measly sum of cash as forced compensation. Won felt an intense wave of discomfort wash over him. This was far from the first time these thugs had cornered him. Stealing his resolve, he snapped his head up and stated with absolute finality that he had zero intention of surrendering his permit to anyone. The stout man immediately scoffed, unleashing a barrage of insults. Clutching his head with a mocking smile, the thug wondered aloud why out of the hundreds of challengers loitering in the plaza, not a single soul was willing to risk joining Won's squad. With a venomous smirk, he sneered that Won was merely a pathetic, no-tier E-rank hunter, so who in their right mind would ever sign up to die with him? The stout leader and his execution squad locked their eyes onto Won, exerting a heavy, suffocating pressure. The surrounding crowd of onlookers began to whisper among themselves. Some murmured that the stout group was being overly malicious, though they quietly considered that the thug was merely pointing out the brutal reality of the hunter hierarchy. Suddenly, the tense atmosphere was shattered when a calm voice cut through the crowd, inquiring if the raid party was still actively recruiting. Seong-yun stepped forward, seamlessly parting the sea of onlookers. He extended his official identity card, composedly introducing himself as a C-rank hunter. Seong-yun asked if his rank was sufficient to fulfill the mandatory criteria to join the party. Won, who had been sitting utterly dejected on the park bench, snapped to his feet and eagerly declared that Seong-yun more than met every single prerequisite. However, the stout man in the patchy cap aggressively slammed his heavy hand onto Seong-yun's shoulder, snapping, "Hey, can't you see there's a line here? Are you completely blind to the situation, kid?" Seong-yun simply let out a quiet sigh before a sharp smile touched his lips.
The thug's temper instantly flared when he heard Seong-yun calmly reply that if the man was so unsatisfied with the arrangement, why didn't he just sign his own squad up to join their party as well? The retort left the stout leader feeling profoundly insulted. But in a fraction of a second, Seong-yun's demeanor shifted into stone-cold gravity. In a low, terrifyingly predatory tone, he warned the thug to remove his hand from his shoulder immediately before he broke it in half. A crushing, monstrous aura violently erupted from Seong-yun's frame, paralyzing every single person in the vicinity with primitive terror.
The stout man's face instantly went deathly pale, and he frantically yanked his hand back as if he had been burned. With his brow violently furrowed in sheer bewilderment, the thug wondered internally what kind of ungodly kinetic energy he had just brushed against, questioning if Seong-yun was truly just a baseline C-rank hunter like himself. His lackeys, completely misinterpreting the source of the pressure, assumed the terrifying aura had emanated from their own captain and began praising his immense strength. Meanwhile, the stout leader forced an incredibly awkward, sweating smile, hastily clarifying to his men that he wasn't the one who had released the pressure. Cupping a hand over his mouth, he clumsily blurted out that since official representatives from the Hunter Association were patrolling the perimeter, he would graciously overlook this encounter as a mere joke. As he scrambled to walk away with his squad, he cast a bitter glance back, muttering that Seong-yun was just incredibly lucky. Left behind on the bench, Won clutched his head in sheer frustration, wondering why his entire day had been an unmitigated disaster from the very start. He looked up at Seong-yun with a profoundly bewildered expression when the protagonist calmly called out his name. The two now stood face to face. Seong-yun noted that based on the toxic politics of the plaza, it was mathematically impossible for them to find any other freelancers willing to sign up.
Therefore, rather than wasting another second of daylight, it was far more efficient to bypass the conventions and breach the portal immediately. Won pointed a trembling finger at himself and then at Seong-yun, his eyes widening in sheer shock as he gasped, "Wait, you want to raid a dungeon with just the two of us?" Despite his panic, they proceeded directly into the gate. Once inside the instance, Won gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, casting a frantic glance over his shoulder, his nerves utterly shot by the realization that they had actually crossed the threshold. Seong-yun glanced back at his anxious partner and told him there was absolutely no reason to lose his cool. He could effortlessly neutralize the vast majority of standard D-rank monsters on his own. Hearing the casual declaration, Won looked completely astonished. He raised a hand to halt their advance, reminding Seong-yun that the protagonist had explicitly stated out in the plaza that this was his literal first time ever stepping foot inside a real-world dungeon. Internally, Seong-yun merely offered a quiet smirk, reasoning to himself that fundamentally speaking, the architecture of a trial tower and a real-world dungeon were practically identical.
Won then stated that while his words might sound a bit blunt, this was a matter of their literal survival, so Seong-yun needed to listen closely. Seong-yun stared at him silently. Won then asked, "In your opinion, who has a higher mortality rate inside a dungeon, a rank E hunter or a rank C hunter?" With a dead serious expression, Won explained that at first glance, people would naturally assume a rank E hunter is more prone to dying. In reality, however, it was actually the rank C hunters who suffered a far higher casualty rate. Illustrating his point, he noted that rank E hunters are typically much more cautious because they are acutely aware of their own limitations and weaknesses. In contrast, rank C hunters tend to become overly confident, which is precisely why their mortality rate skyrockets. Won then compared the phenomenon to traffic accidents, explaining that the exact same thing happens when driving. The more confident a driver is, the higher their risk of crashing. Lowering his gaze, he warned that dungeons are far more treacherous than Seong-yun could ever imagine. Raising a hand, he added that because Seong-yun had recklessly entered the instance without bringing along either a dedicated tank or a healer, he was deeply worried that this overconfidence would lead to a fatal mistake. Seong-yun gave a slow nod, conceding that Won's logic was perfectly sound. Won looked into Seong-yun's eyes and added that even though he was merely a rank E hunter, he possessed extensive experience navigating dungeons. Therefore, he offered to take the lead as the team captain. Seong-yun hesitated for a brief moment, as he had also intended to lead the raid.
Yet, after weighing Won's explanation, he nodded in agreement. Won bowed, expressing his gratitude for Seong-yun's understanding, and noted that he was doing all of this solely for their mutual safety, hoping his decision had not ruined anyone's mood. After they had trekked through the tunnels for a short while, a lizard man materialized directly ahead of them. Won gritted his teeth in sheer tension, muttering that these creatures are notoriously proficient with various types of weaponry, stating they were incredibly unlucky to have crossed paths with one. Bracing himself with both hands, Won prepared for combat and instructed Seong-yun that he would draw the creature's aggro first, signaling for Seong-yun to strike the moment he managed to leave the lizard's back exposed. Seong-yun observed with meticulous focus, fully intending to see exactly how an experienced hunter handled a real-world dungeon threat. Suddenly, both Won and the lizard man squared off, looking as though they were about to launch a fierce clash. However, Seong-yun was left profoundly disappointed to find that Won was merely engaging in a static staring contest with the monster. Seong-yun grumbled internally, reflecting that his temporary return to Earth was strictly limited to 3 short days, and now his precious time was being squandered on account of an insignificant lizard. Suddenly, Won snapped his head back toward him. Stepping past his partner, Seong-yun apologized for forcing his way into the fight. Won frantically tried to hold him back, warning that rushing in blindly was incredibly dangerous. However, Seong-yun aggressively activated instantaneous acceleration and in a fraction of a second completely minced the creature into multiple segments. Won stood frozen in absolute shock, staring blankly at the carnage.
Seong-yun looked down at the dismembered pieces of the monster and explained that he had only intervened because he was in an immense rush. Won stared at the carcass of the beast and quietly replied that he understood Seong-yun's reasoning. Seong-yun then stated that he wanted to propose a suggestion, asking if he might voice his opinion. Won immediately nodded, urging him to speak his mind without a shred of hesitation. Seong-yun pointed at himself and flatly requested permission to take over the leadership role. Right at that moment, a massive horde of lizardmen swarmed out of the shadows, unleashing fierce war cries. Seong-yun lunged forward with explosive force, cleaving through several monsters simultaneously with a single sweep. The surviving creatures pivoted, immediately launching a coordinated counterattack. However, Seong-yun vaulted high into the air, seamlessly evading the incoming strikes. Slicing downward in the same fluid motion, he drove his blade straight into one of their backs. Watching from a safe distance, Won observed with absolute awe as he noted the cold, unwavering concentration etched onto Seong-yun's face. He thought to himself that this was no longer a raid, it was an unmitigated one-sided slaughter. One of the frantic lizardmen lunged in a desperate frenzy but completely missed its target, accidentally decapitating its own comrade instead. With a swift flick of his wrist, Seong-yun cleanly cut down another foe. Won was utterly spellbound, his mouth hanging wide open as he realized he was witnessing the rise of an unprecedented, monstrous rookie, a figure who would undoubtedly shake the entire hunter industry to its absolute core in the near future. Seong-yun thrust his sword into the chest of a fallen lizard, extracted a glowing green mana crystal from within its flesh, and tossed it into his tactical bag.
Won turned to him, expressing his deep apologies for his lack of contribution, noting that aside from serving as a glorified porter to carry the loot, he had been completely useless. Just as they began to discuss the logistics of the profit split, a lone lizardman launched a stealth attack from their blind spot. Moving with terrifying velocity, Seong-yun merely tilted his head a fraction of an inch to dodge the incoming blade, spun on his heel, and violently swung his left arm. With a single concussive blow, he hurled the monster skyward, shattering its skull directly against the cavern ceiling. As fragments of broken rock rained down around them, Won clutched his head in pure psychological shock, staring at a cave that was now entirely painted in crimson. Seong-yun calmly stated that it would be far wiser to finalize their discussion outside, warning that if they let their guard down for even a second, the situation could turn critical. Seong-yun then began to harvest the drifting souls of the slaughtered lizardmen. He reasoned that he needed to disguise the process, letting out a fake yawn as a cover to absorb all the ambient spirits simultaneously. Upon absorption, his trait mastery increased by a meager 0.07%. He realized that if he limited himself to hunting standard D-class monsters, optimizing his unique trait would take an exceptionally long time. Suddenly, a blood-red boss portal manifests at the far end of the cavern. Turning their attention to the gate, Won thought to himself that despite having only a two-man squad, they had successfully pushed all the way to the boss chamber. A wide smile broke across his face. He had never genuinely believed they would survive a full clear, noting that merely bridging the halfway point of the dungeon would have been a monumental victory for his record.
Now, staring intently at Seong-yun's back, he realized that this rookie might actually be capable of clearing the entire instance. Seong-yun turned his head and asked, "Are you all right with breaching the boss room directly?" Won nodded in agreement, though he gently recommended that Seong-yun take a moment to recuperate. Seong-yun reassured him, stating that a rest period was completely unnecessary, as his physical condition was perfectly fine. A subtle echo resonated from near the portal, seemingly validating their choice to press forward immediately. Crossing the threshold, they found themselves standing before a colossal lizard king seated upon a massive throne. The apex monster rested both of its clawed hands heavily on the armrests of its seat.
Seong-yun noted that just as he calculated, the Lizard King was waiting for them. Won looked at him anxiously and asked what their protocol was. Seong-yun requested a brief moment to map out his strategy. Panicking, Won pressed if that meant he didn't actually have a clear plan of attack. Right at that instant, the boss violently vaulted off its throne. Seong-yun smirked, noting that the timing was absolutely perfect. The Lizard King began its deadly approach. The monster surged toward them with unbelievable kinetic velocity. Seong-yun frowned in surprise, quickly executing several backward bounds to dodge a devastating thrust from the boss's spear. As he fluidly evaded a rapid succession of follow-up strikes, he noted that the monster was astonishingly agile despite its massive physical frame. He locked a dead-serious gaze onto his opponent. In a fraction of a second, Seong-yun materialized directly behind the Lizard King's flank, unleashing a heavy swing of his sword. He claimed that just because the boss was fast didn't mean he couldn't seamlessly adapt to its operational rhythm. The monster counterattacked, violently whipping its massive tail into Seong-yun's frame and sending him crashing clear across the cavern into the stone wall. One clutched his head, screaming Seong-yun's name in pure panic.
Seong-yun kicked away the displaced boulder, spinning him down as a dense shroud of dark energy began to violently gyrate around his body. The system reported that his spiritual barrier had successfully absorbed the vast majority of the incoming kinetic damage. Seong-yun smiled, noting that this was an excellent live combat opportunity to evaluate his newest skill. With tears welling in his eyes, Won stammered that he had honestly thought Seong-yun was a dead man. The Lizard King glared at its opponent, its eyes burning with unbridled fury. Seong-yun leaped up onto a massive rock, mockingly asking the monster if it was entirely unbothered by the fact that its precious throne had been obliterated in the chaos. The boss violently slammed its spear into the dirt, unleashing a crushing pressure as it threw its head back and discharged a concentrated beam of raw energy directly from its jaws. Instantly, glowing magical chains bound Seong-yun's limbs, inflicting a slow wave debuff that slashed his operational speed by 25%. Suddenly, a vibrant orb of green energy cleanly severed the restricting chains. Seong-yun had triggered Force Breakthrough, causing a brilliant aura of energy to envelop his entire frame. The system immediately broadcasted that the restrictive movement penalty had been successfully purged. The Lizard King opened its jaws in utter shock at the display. Seong-yun let out a sigh of relief, thinking to himself that this engineered synthesis skill was a phenomenal asset. Despite his initial skepticism, its tactical efficacy was exceptionally high. Suddenly, the boss aggressively shifted its gaze away from Seong-yun. A low, agonizing groan echoed through the cavern. On the other side of the chamber, Won had been completely bound by the magical chains, collapsing flat onto the ground as he gasped that his body was totally paralyzed. Staring at Seong-yun in pure terror, he desperately cried out for help. The Lizard King locked its predatory eyes onto the helpless hunter and let out a guttural growl. Seong-yun flinched, instantly realizing the creature's intent. The boss spun on its heel and sprinted at breakneck speed toward the defenseless Won. Gritting his teeth, Seong-yun bolted after it. He roared at the beast, shouting that he was its true opponent. He accelerated to his absolute kinetic limit, desperate to intercept the attack. Looking from behind, however, he realized the closing distance was mathematically too wide. His eyebrows shot up as his eyes ignited into a deep blood-red hue, and he aggressively unleashed Raise Dead. In a flash of dark magic, two formidable skeletons materialized directly in front of the charging Lizard King.
They opened their jaws and attacked, but were effortlessly pulverized by the apex monster. Seong-yun watched the bones shatter into dust, noting that they were simply far too weak to stall a beast of that caliber. However, they had successfully bought him exactly 1 critical second. Ramping up the output of Grace of the Wind to 60%, he blitzed forward and cleanly cleaved the Lizard King into multiple fragments. He reflected that that single second had completely saved Won's life. The Lizard King's expression froze, its jaws agape, as the system announced its death. A concentrated stream of dark energy coalesced into a single point. The system reported that Seong-yun had executed spirit absorption on the Lizard King's soul, permanently amplifying his core attributes. As a result, his strength, agility, stamina, mana, and defense surged by varying increments. He inspected his chest in amazement. The system further informed him that he had successfully harvested one of the Lizard King's active skills, Spiritual Eye. Meanwhile, at the park perimeter, a man let out a wide yawn, stared ahead, and noted that aside from the simultaneous manifestation of 3 portals due to a sudden power surge, nothing unusual had transpired. He turned to his subordinate and asked if they had detected anything out of the ordinary.
The staff member replied that everything seemed completely stable. The leader stared at the gates, reasoning that operations were proceeding as standard. Under normal protocols, after a vanguard hunter team from the first squad executed a partial suppression inside an active portal and withdrew, the Hunter Association's primary raid team would breach the dungeon to eliminate the boss.
Leaning back against the bench, he muttered that even though they were all part of the same Hunter Association, he still couldn't comprehend why their specific squad never received high-profile commissions. The man began to badmouth the primary assault team. He admitted he was incredibly envious, and suddenly his eyes lit up with anticipation regarding the potential payout. He noted that if the elite team managed to completely clear the portals in the first sector, their unit would also receive a cut of the profits. However, his face quickly darkened, and he let out a bitter smile, muttering that such a feat was only mathematically possible for an A-rank hunter. He wondered aloud if there was an elite hunter crazy enough to pull off something like that. Suddenly, Won and Seong-yun emerged from the portal. The leader snapped his head around upon hearing a shout that the secondary team from the third portal had already completed their run. He was profoundly shocked by their operational speed. One of his subordinates attempted to track their files, and the leader grew even more stunned upon realizing that the pair had raided the dungeon with a two-man squad. That meant the duo shouldn't have even made it halfway through the instance. However, his expression violently shifted the moment his eyes locked onto the gateway. The portal behind them began to destabilize and dissolve. His mouth fell wide open in absolute disbelief. A portal losing its structural coloration could only indicate one thing. A massive grin broke across his face as the realization hit him. The boss room had been completely cleared. With frantic strides, he dashed over to intercept Seong-yun. Panting heavily, the official asked if they had genuinely cleared the entire dungeon. Seong-yun countered by calmly asking who he was to be demanding that kind of information. The man quickly straightened his suit jacket and with a polite smile introduced himself as Wu Jinshin, the portal control team leader from the Hunter Association, tasked with monitoring the sudden portal manifestations in the plaza. Won interrupted the conversation, asking if he had approached them to purchase the dungeon's management and harvesting rights. The man nodded, confirming that he intended to make them an official corporate offer. The team leader's face warped in sheer shock when Won informed him that Seong-yun had conquered the entire dungeon completely single-handedly.
Ever since her return and help from the tower, she felt as though she had been working relentlessly like a rented mule. Suddenly, something caught her attention. She reached for her phone, wondering who could possibly be contacting her at such a late hour. When she glanced at the screen, her expression shifted into utter shock. Hyan turned her head back, staring intently at the nameplate mounted on the wall. The manager's name was clearly inscribed upon it. A vivid flashback flashed through her mind of her standing before three high-ranking executives who confidently asserted that this incident would ultimately bring about a positive shift. She realized just how profound the anxiety and concern from the upper management truly was. Clutching her head, Hyan lamented that even though the candidates were actively concealing their true identities, she had never anticipated that recruitment would prove to be this exceptionally difficult. With her head hung low and a somber expression etched across her face, Hyan grumbled that even recruiting a mere 10 individuals felt like a monumental hurdle, and to make matters worse, every single one of them was an easy-level candidate. This was nowhere near enough to satisfy the demands of the higher-ups. Hyan stared blankly out the window, lost in thought as she wondered what Seong-yun could possibly be up to at this exact moment. Her mind drifted back to the way Seong-yun had effortlessly cut down the goblins one by one. She readily admitted to herself that his raw strength was truly extraordinary. In fact, it was no exaggeration to say that he had single-handedly cleared the entire fourth floor. Hyan touched the glass pane of the window with a look of profound melancholy. She deeply regretted that she hadn't immediately presented him with an official corporate offer right then and there. However, her train of thought was abruptly shattered when her phone buzzed once more. Hyan picked it up, wondering yet again who would be calling her in the dead of night. Her eyebrows shot up in surprise when she locked her eyes onto the screen. Seong-yun had sent a text message inquiring if they could meet up now that he had returned to Earth.
Meanwhile, Seong-yun's bank account balance displayed a staggering, mind-boggling figure, 291.600.000 won. Staring cautiously at the phone screen, Seong-yun still found it completely difficult to believe his own eyes. At that moment, he was sitting inside a quiet cafe. Right then, a golden bell chimed softly at the entrance.
A visibly exhausted woman rushed frantically through the door. She immediately spotted Seong-yun, who was calmly waving his hand to catch her attention. Clutching her head, the woman walked briskly over to his table. Seong-yun thought to himself that she must have literally sprinted all the way here, noting aloud that she really didn't need to push herself into such a frantic rush. The moment she took a seat across from him, Hayan complained that Seong-yun had completely ghosted her text messages. She added that she had been left waiting for an incredibly long time. Hearing her grievance, Seong-yun's face instantly flashed bright red. Looking visibly nervous and breaking into a slight sweat, he offered a hasty apology, explaining that an unexpected emergency had prevented him from reading her messages in time. The woman cracked a soft smile, pointed a playful finger at him and declared that in that case, he absolutely had to treat her to a cup of coffee and a slice of cheesecake. Seong-yun readily replied that she was more than welcome to order whatever her heart desired. A few moments later, a fresh cup of coffee sat upon the table as they sat face to face. The woman broke the silence, asking if Seong-yun had permanently retired from the trial tower. Seong-yun clarified that wasn't the case at all, explaining that he had reached out to her because he required a very specific corporate favor. Locking a dead serious gaze into her eyes, he explained that he needed to affiliate himself with a guild so he could actively raid real-world dungeons while simultaneously clearing the trial tower.
However, he emphasized that he had a few mandatory non-negotiable prerequisites. First, he demanded the absolute right to reject any official guild summons at his own discretion. Next, he laid out his second condition. The guild was strictly forbidden from interfering in his personal affairs regarding the tower. And finally, for his third condition, he had to be granted unrestricted access to utilize the guild's private dungeons whenever he pleased. Seong-yun then looked at her and asked, "Is there actually a guild out there willing to accommodate all three of these terms?" Internally, Seong-yun began to wonder why the atmosphere had suddenly turned incredibly awkward, questioning if his demands were perhaps too outrageous. Suddenly, he flinched as she snapped him out of his thoughts by calling his name. The woman tilted her head slightly, stating flatly that the conditions he had just proposed were, fundamentally speaking, practically impossible to fulfill. She noted that from a guild's corporate perspective, they would be gaining absolutely zero profit or operational leverage from such an arrangement. Just as Seong-yun was about to counter, conceding that he might have indeed asked for too much, the woman gently placed her hand over his, effectively silencing him. She then stood up, locking her eyes deep into his gaze. Interlocking her bare, ungloved fingers together, she confidently stated that he could simply join her guild. Seong-yun's eyebrows shot up in pure astonishment upon hearing that she was fully prepared to personally manifest conditions that seemed completely impossible on paper. A short while later, Seong-yun was lying flat on the roof of a moving bus, reflecting deeply on the conversation they had shared. His hair billowed wildly in the rushing wind. He muttered to himself that from successfully securing dungeon harvesting rights to finalizing his guild affiliation, his entire day yesterday had been an absolute whirlwind of chaotic business. Staring up at the vast expanse of the sky, he reasoned that in order to be genuinely accepted and integrated as a formal member of the guild, there was still one final critical mission left for him to execute.
His thoughts drifted back to their past conversation, where the woman had explicitly stated that he needed to conquer a C-rank dungeon entirely single-handedly as concrete proof that he possessed elite tier capabilities. Executing that feat would make it infinitely easier for her to convince the guild's upper management, given that unrestricted free-reign access to guild dungeons was a highly exclusive privilege. Seong-yun had locked his eyes onto hers, instantly reading between the lines. He realized her words meant that not just any ordinary freelancer could freely exploit the premium high-yield dungeons owned by a prestigious organization like the White Guild. Only those officially designated as a rising star or individuals harboring astronomical potential could ever hope to secure such a lucrative entitlement. Seong-yun requested that she finalize all the necessary operational arrangements as soon as possible. They firmly shook hands, and the woman added with supreme confidence that she would personally ensure he would never look back or regret his decision. Standing up, Seong-yun noted that for a baseline warm-up, he figured it would be an excellent idea to start sprinting straight to the side from where they stood. Resting his hand on the roof of the bus, he stood completely upright, gave a brief polite nod of his head, and then aggressively vaulted forward at breakneck speed. Below him, everyday citizens on the streets looked up in absolute bewilderment, catching only the blurred trail of something ripping through the air above them with terrifying velocity. Meanwhile, Hayan arrived at the active outpost gate, flashing a bright smile as she informed the registry clerk that she was there to reserve a portal instance for a raid scheduled to commence in exactly 1 hour. The sentry on duty cross-referenced his digital tablet with her official identification card before
confirming that her arrival logs had been verified. He gestured toward the designated staging area and casually suggested that she wait under the temporarily tense setup, noting that she still had plenty of time left on the clock. The woman politely offered her thanks. A short while later, she glanced over her shoulder, only to spot Seong-yun sprinting directly towards her position. Seong-yun looked visibly surprised to find that she had somehow beaten him to the side. He glanced around just as the residual high-velocity slipstream he had generated finally caught up to him, a violent concussive gust of wind detonating outward, instantly scattering the surrounding foliage and sending the outdoor plastic furniture tumbling across the pavement.
Looking incredibly awkward, Seong-yun quickly righted a fallen chair, offering a sheepish apology while explaining that he had been running a bit too fast, which inadvertently triggered a localized shockwave. The woman let out a stiff, bewildered chuckle, wondering silently to herself if Seong-yun genuinely meant that the mini typhoon was caused strictly by his own raw kinetic running speed. She then noted aloud that he had arrived impressively early. Gesturing toward the glowing vortex, she informed him that she had already cleared all the mandatory security and administrative checkpoints. Therefore, they could breach the perimeter the exact moment he felt ready. Seong-yun replied that they could initiate the raid right then and there, as he had no objections. They stepped through the threshold of the portal only to find themselves standing squarely in the middle of a vast, sprawling wheat field. They scanned the immediate horizon in deep confusion. Seong-yun felt a wave of surprise washing over him, noting that the dungeon interior was literally just an ordinary open agricultural field. Turning back to Haiyan, he instructed, if anything even remotely hazardous manifests, you need to notify me instantly. Haiyan reassured him that she was perfectly fine. Touching her collarbone, she pulled out a glowing necklace she was wearing and explained that it was a high-grade artifact provided directly by the guild. The accessory possessed an active defensive barrier matrix alongside a passive injury reduction enchantment. Seong-yun inspected the device and noted that if she accidentally drew any monster aggro, the artifact would at least offer her a decent layer of utility. Because of this, she promised she would maintain her distance from the active combat zone as much as humanly possible. Seong-yun began to march forward into the crops, noting to himself that he could now cut loose and fight without having to worry about collateral damage.
In an instant, his physical form was enveloped in a dense shroud of dark energy as he triggered his newly acquired spiritual eye. Seong-yun recalled that this was the very tracking skill he had harvested from the fallen Lizard King. Immediately, he sensed the distinct kinetic signatures of 3 hostile objects rapidly closing in. He reasoned that even though the enemies were completely invisible to the naked eye, his perception had mapped them flawlessly, which was precisely the core utility of his ocular ability. The hidden entities were blitzing through the wheat field at high velocities. He observed their trajectory with calculated focus as they entered his strike zone. Moving with explosive agility, Seong-yun vaulted high into the air, seamlessly evading a coordinated pounce from 3 lizard-like monsters. One of the beasts snapped its jaws wide open, lunging aggressively at his throat. He furrowed his brow, deeply startled to realize that the creatures were actually poisonous fissures, an exceptionally hazardous venom-spitting classification of monster. Haiyan took an urgent step forward, screaming a frantic warning for Seong-yun to keep his guard up because this particular dungeon had gone completely irregular. Seong-yun executed a succession of lightning-fast maneuvers, effortlessly obliterating all 3 of his invisible stalkers one after the other. The heavy carcasses of the beasts collapsed into the dirt near his boots. Haiyan's mouth hung wide open in sheer unadulterated disbelief at what she had just witnessed. The sheer speed of the execution was completely unnatural.
A brilliant, ecstatic smile broke across her face as she cheered internally, completely validated in her belief that she had made the absolute right choice in backing him. Seong-yun pushed deeper into the instance, systematically suppressing the waves of monsters flooding out from the rift. He clearly cleaved through one beast and instantly accelerated toward a second target. Suddenly, a brilliant golden light erupted outward, temporarily catching him off guard, as an unexpected lightning elemental effect violently discharged from the edge of his blade.
Elemental effect was trigger sangat rarenya, bahkan he had nearly forgotten its existence entirely. Suddenly, a monster closed in from his blind spot. Executing a deft evasion at the absolute last microsecond, he watched the beast jaw snap shut with a hollow click. Seizing the lizard's tail mid-motion, he swung it forcefully, slamming the creature's massive frame brutally against the earth. Standing tall, he looked down at the motionless carcass. Seong-yun waved his hand toward Haiyan, calling out that the immediate perimeter was entirely clear and that she could safely approach. Haiyan stood frozen, her mouth still agape in pure disbelief that Seong-yun had managed to breach the boss room's entry portal in under an hour, and completely single-handedly at that. What baffled her even more was that this dungeon flatly defies several standard operational laws. Recalling the physical characteristics of the creatures they had just fought, she noted that a poisonous fissure was absolutely not an opponent to be taken lightly. Surveying the scattered carcasses, she added that such high-hazard monsters typically required a fully coordinated party of rank C hunters to suppress. She genuinely could not comprehend how Seong-yun had neutralized them with such trivial ease, treating them as if they were nothing more than helpless infants. Staring intently at Seong-yun's back, Haiyan realized that this wasn't even the absolute ceiling of his true potential. Meanwhile, Seong-yun began harvesting the souls of the defeated monsters to continuously optimize his core statistics. He reasoned that with his current power tier, even the dungeon boss would fail to pose a significant threat. Locking his gaze onto the gate, he noted that it was finally time to breach the boss chamber. The moment they crossed the threshold, they were instantly greeted by a dark, fog-surrounded abyss, with faint shafts of light filtering through the narrow crevices of massive boulders. Haiyan found the atmosphere remarkably uncanny, noting that she couldn't detect even a single monster signature.
Right on cue! A high-velocity magical projectile whistled down from the ceiling. Sensing the imminent danger, Seong-yun furrowed his brow, visibly tense as the incoming strike detonated. Acting on instinct, he pulled Haiyan flush against his chest, scooping her up as he sprinted out of the blast radius. Blushing furiously, Haiyan stared up at Seong-yun's focused expression. The hidden boss opened its massive jaws and began consolidating a dense mass of mana, discharging a devastating torrent of raw energy. Haiyan shrieked a warning about the incoming trajectory, but a deafening explosion already echoed through the cavern. Out of the billowing plume of smoke, Seong-yun vaulted clear of the wreckage with Haiyan securely in his arms. Setting his boots firmly onto the stone floor, Seong-yun offered a quick apology for moving her without her explicit consent, noting that the entity they were tracking appeared to be exceptionally lethal. Stepping down from his embrace, Haiyan quickly replied that on the contrary, she felt immensely indebted to his reflexes. Together, they looked towards the massive monster, scanning the darkness for their positions. Seong-yun stated that he would handle the beast, casually asking Haiyan if he should deploy his buff skills for the encounter. Deeply anxious, Haiyan pleaded with him to stop treating life and death situations like an experiment, telling him to test his limits some other time. However, Seong-yun simply marched toward the edge of the precipice, assuring her that he would return in a flash. Like a seasoned warrior executing a tactical drop, he plunged directly into the abyss below. Seong-yun hit the ground squarely in front of the boss, cracking the stone floor upon impact. The apex monster bared its jaws, revealing rows of razor-sharp fangs. Instantly dropping into a low stance, Seong-yun activated instantaneous acceleration. The boss dug its massive claws into the earth, bracing to strike. Simultaneously, Seong-yun triggered the exclusive passive effect of his speed boots, both combatants locking into a high-octane standoff.
As the monster began condensing destructive energy within its maw, Seong-yun maxed out his velocity multiplier to a staggering 70%, leaping forward to launch a blitz attack. He tore right past the monster's face without so much as a backward glance. The boss frantically whipped its head around to track his movement, but Seong-yun had already chained 3 of his ultimate offensive abilities back-to-back, unleashing a brutal, relentless assault that tore through the beast's dense hide. Severed chunks of flesh rained onto the stone floor. Meanwhile, Haiyan watched the entire spectacle unfold from behind a massive network of tree roots. The system interface flashed into view, announcing that the dungeon boss had been thoroughly neutralized and that the entire pocket dimension would completely collapse within 3 hours. Haiyan let out a nervous, breathless chuckle, forcing a smile as she looked at Seong-yun and muttered that she was genuinely confused as to who the real monster in this room actually was. They turned and made their way toward the blood red extraction portal. Re-emerging into the open air of Earth, Haiyan admitted she had never anticipated a hunter of his caliber could clear a C-rank dungeon with such terrifying speed. She added that the protagonist had officially passed his evaluation, granting him full access to utilize the White Guild's private dungeons, noting that their corporation was certainly not foolish enough to let an astronomical talent like him slip through their fingers.
Seong-yun replied that he was incredibly pleased to hear that.
Shifting gears, Haya noted that she wanted to touch upon something slightly tangential to their main topic. Pulling up a display showing 3 distinct tiers of difficulty parameters, she explained that when a candidate is summoned into the tower to undergo trials, the initial difficulty setting they choose doesn't actually dictate their permanent trajectory. She elaborated that even if a challenger begins at a lower tier, those who demonstrate significant, rapid progression will inevitably face escalating, brutally adaptive challenges as the trial count increases. She mapped out a schematic showing how fluidly the difficulty could transition from low to high, and vice versa. Hyan added that conversely, if a challenger performs poorly despite being placed in a high difficulty track, the system dynamically downgrades their trials to an easier setting. Looking to the side, she stated that based on this core adaptive principle, the protagonist's anomalous achievements could only indicate one absolute reality. His custom difficulty scaling to reach the summit of the tower was astronomically high. Flashbacks of the 3 grueling trials he had barely survived raced through the young man's mind. Bowing her head slightly, Hyan voiced her earnest hope that Seong-yun would exercise an extra layer of extreme caution moving forward.
She further noted that she genuinely desired to continue witnessing Seong-yun's extraordinary growth with her own eyes. Later that evening, Seong-yun sat perched on the edge of a building's rooftop, taking a crisp bite out of an apple with a wide grin spread across his face. He muttered to himself that over the past 3 days, he had been absolutely run ragged. Nevertheless, thanks to that chaotic grind, both his character status parameters and his personal confidence had surged. Right then, a glowing notification materialized in his field of vision, alerting him that his temporary furlough on Earth had officially expired. Consequently, he was slated to be immediately transitioned back into the trial tower. The moment he materialized within the familiar confines of his private waiting room, he resolved to dive straight into the 8th floor trial. Tapping the system interface with his finger, he confirmed the initiation of the test. The system then generated a prompt window, inquiring which specific trial intersection node he wished to lock in: story, combat, or invasion. An expression of surprise crossed his face as he arched his eyebrows, recalling that he had indeed heard rumors about the option to customize one's progression pathway at this juncture. He promptly selected combat, reasoning that if his primary objective was to rapidly optimize his necromancer specialization, he needed to throw himself directly into live combat operations on the front lines. The system interface then updated to inform him that all of his forthcoming personal trials would be strictly calibrated towards warfare. It further cautioned that once a specific intersection node was locked in, the decision could not be overridden or modified. Standing in the center of the chamber, he noted that he hadn't harbored a single shred of intention to alter his choice anyway. Following his confirmation, the system broadcasted a grand announcement reporting that Seong-yun had officially fulfilled the rigorous criteria to be designated as a pioneer. Seong-yun raised his eyebrows, visibly startled. He stared at the glowing logs in silence as the interface notified him that a private counseling session with a system administrator was being initiated and that a targeted search for a combat-specialized administrator was currently underway.
A moment later, the system search concluded. Seong-yun's entire physical form was suddenly enveloped in a dense shroud of systemic energy, signaling that his live consultation with the managing administrator of the iron-blooded world had officially commenced. In a flash, he was instantly teleported to a vast frozen tundra where countless weapons and blades were driven into the snow. Looking up at the bleak sky, he wondered aloud exactly where he had been transported to. The system interface popped up to confirm that he had successfully entered the iron-blooded dimension. Directly before him, hundreds of swords stood anchored like grave markers in the frost. His gaze sharpened as he activated his Eye of Truth tracking ability. The interface revealed that the iron-blooded world possessed an unmeasurable, unclassified rank, a pocket dimension engineered exclusively for the administrator known as the Iron-Blooded Monarch. It was a sacred, restricted domain, entirely hidden from the view of uninvited guests. Seong-yun let out a soft smile, thinking to himself that it was fascinating that a space like this even existed. As he began marching through the snow, Seong-yun read an incoming system message stating that the iron-blooded monarch was highly displeased with challengers who asked an excessive number of questions. Inspecting the text log, Seong-yun thought to himself, does this imply that an administrator can directly relay their thoughts through real-time system DMs? Suddenly, one of the ancient swords buried in the snow nearby ignited into a roaring pillar of flame.
Concurrently, the system delivered a blunt directive stating that the administrator ordered him to stop squandering precious time and to follow the burning blade. Seong-yun stared at the phenomena in mild surprise. Nevertheless, he complied, tracking the trajectory of the flaming sword until it guided him clear out of the clearing. His breath condensed into thick plumes of white vapor as he inhaled the biting sub-zero air. Eventually, he arrived before a solitary cottage and slowly pushed the wooden door open.
Peering through the narrow opening, he caught sight of a figure waiting inside. The system chimed, informing him that the iron-blooded administrator requested his presence. Inside the heated room, a woman greeted him warmly, noting that he had finally arrived and addressing Seong-yun formally as a pioneer. Flashing a sharp smile, the woman introduced herself as the iron-blooded monarch, the designated administrator tasked with conducting his live consultation session. The woman sat back in a relaxed posture, casually crossing her legs. Seong-yun observed her intently. From a purely aesthetic standpoint, the iron-blooded admin was exceptionally beautiful. However, sensing the blinding, crushing aura radiating from her form, Seong-yun recognized that the entity sitting before him was a core power that actively managed the entire architecture of the trial tower. Suddenly, in a blink and miss motion that completely defied visual tracking, the woman materialized directly in front of his face, casually reaching past him to grab a bottle from a nearby shelf. Smiling playfully, she murmured that she had been incredibly curious to see what kind of monster he truly was. She concluded that to her surprise, Seong-yun's physical appearance seemed remarkably ordinary. Seong-yun flinched internally, profoundly shocked as he wondered exactly when she had moved across the room. He had been keeping a hyper-focused lock on her position the entire time. The woman walked gracefully over toward the hearth. Seong-yun broke the silence, asking, "Are you already familiar with who I am?" The administrator replied with a smirk, "Of course. Your performance back on the 4th floor was exceptionally impressive." As she poured a dark vintage into a glass, Seong-yun inquired if she had been actively monitoring all of the trials he had cleared thus far. The woman clarified that she only evaluated what transpired based on the final automated summary logs, explaining that live spectating was completely restricted for any trials below the 8th floor. Hearing this, Seong-yun was momentarily taken aback, discovering for the first time that even high-tier administrators were systematically blocked from watching low-level trial progressions in real time.
Swirling the drink in her glass, the blonde woman added that based on the look carved onto his face, she was certain Seong-yun had fundamentally misunderstood their nature. She explained that administrators are not omnipotent, godlike deities. They do not wield absolute, unbridled control over the trial tower's core engine. Downing her drink in a single gulp, she casually advised Seong-yun to shed his rigid nervousness in her presence, noting that fundamentally speaking, administrators are simply glorified civil servants working for the tower's infrastructure. Consequently, system laws strictly dictated that she could not inflict physical harm upon a challenger. After casting a quick, calculating glance at him, she decided to put an end to the casual pleasantries. She explained that this private consultation session was a high-value, exclusive perk that Seong-yun had earned. Therefore, if he harbored any burning questions, he was fully permitted to voice them without hesitation. Sensing absolutely zero malice or hostile intent emanating from his conversation partner, Seong-yun decided to speak up. He asked, "Could you explain the true nature and utility of this private consultation session?" The woman replied that as she had previously highlighted, a live consultation was an elite privilege reserved solely for those holding pioneer status, meaning Seong-yun could freely extract high-level information without depleting his standard system allotted inquiry rights. His mind immediately flashed back to the heavily armored adversary he had faced in the past. He noted that back on the 5th floor, he had very nearly lost his life at the hands of a hostile challenger invading from an entirely different dimension. He asked her directly why that individual had gone out of their way to target him. Staring down into her empty glass, the woman smirked before looking back up to lock eyes with him. She explained that there wasn't a specific personal vendetta. Rather, when a challenger crosses into a specific floor of an alternate dimension, the cross-world invader can not only hijack the premium rewards bound to that floor's challenge, but they also unlock exponentially greater systemic incentives. The administrator elaborated that these cross-dimensional invaders hail from advanced worlds, where the trial tower architecture has been integrated for several decades. As a consequence, they are acutely aware that the system bounty for successfully neutralizing a candidate from a foreign dimension is astronomically massive. Seong-yun was visibly shaken as the administrator calmly detailed that one day in the future, the tower manifesting in his homeworld would completely merge and synchronize with the towers of these alternate dimensions.
Seong-yun pressed her further,
urgently asking exactly what she meant by that statement. The woman simply replied that just as she had articulated, starting from the 20th floor onward, the system completely shifts its core operational focus away from isolated individual trials. Instead, it transitions into integrated, cross-world cooperative and competitive trials. At that exact paradigm shift, he would actively begin crossing paths with elite candidates from foreign dimensions. Seong-yun reasoned eternally that the entire setup felt like a calculated systemic mechanism designed to prune potential future competitors right from the starting line, rivals he would inevitably have to clash with down the road. Setting her glass down firmly on the table, she asked if his underlying curiosity had been sufficiently satisfied. Seong-yun opened his mouth and stated that he had one final question. Bowing his head slightly, he inquired directly about the foundational nature of the construct itself. What exactly is the trial tower, and what is its ultimate purpose? The woman fell completely silent for a brief moment. She slowly walked away from the table, though she maintained her response, admitting flatly that she too desperately desired to know the answer to that very question. She noted the irony that despite holding the absolute rank of a system administrator, she was completely blind to the core truth behind that question. Catching her own reflection in the window pane, the woman revealed that originally, all administrators were ordinary human beings just like Seong-yun, ambitious candidates who had scaled the structure. Those who ultimately perished after successfully crossing the 40th floor threshold were systemically granted the executive right to reincarnate as immortal tower administrators. She recalled that in her past life, she had aggressively climbed the tower in a desperate bid to witness its absolute summit. However, she had failed to ever reach the peak. Conjuring a mental image of her past self completely painted in blood and mortal wounds, she noted that it was far more accurate to say that every single active administrator currently managing the system had fallen in battle before reaching the end of the line. That was the exact mechanism through which she had transitioned into her current administrator role. Seong-yun tightly clenched his fists, asking for absolute clarification if she genuinely meant that administrators were nothing more than failed deceased former challengers. Seong-yun then lowered his gaze toward the floorboard, declaring with quiet, unshakable resolve that he fully intended to discover exactly what sat at the absolute summit of the tower. Hearing his bold proclamation, the woman intensely furrowed her brow and locked a sharp, menacing gaze onto him. In a flash of overwhelming physical force, she lunged forward, violently seizing Seong-yun by the collar and hoisting his entire body clean off the floorboards, using only a single hand. She barked that speaking carelessly about reaching the summit of the tower was not something to be uttered in such a casual, flippant, and reckless manner. Seong-yun looked momentarily dazed, his voice trapped in his throat. However, the woman quickly noticed that despite being entirely at her mercy, Seong-yun's expression failed to register a single trace of panic. She let out a sudden amused smile and asked, "Are you truly not feeling a single ounce of fear right now?" Seong-yun merely tilted his head downward, replying calmly that his composure was strictly due to her own prior assertion that this live consultation was his exclusive system perk. Furthermore, he didn't sense a shred of genuine hostility radiating from her action. Simultaneously, however, his fingers violently dug into the adjacent wooden wall, tearing through the structure with explosive strength as he forcefully propelled himself backward, breaking clean out of the cottage and landing squarely on the snow-covered street outside. In a seamless fluid motion, a gleaming sword materialized directly into his palm. He shouted back into the cabin that he had no intention of allowing her to casually inflict harm upon him without putting up a fierce, desperate fight. The administrator's eyes widened in profound astonishment at his instantaneous combat reflex. Meanwhile, silent flakes of snow began to drift gently over the rooftop of the house.
The woman walked outside with a soft smile, noting that in all her years of existence, this was the very first time she had witnessed someone completely demolish an administrator's residence. Yet, that reckless display had effectively convinced her of his worth. Seong-yun merely stared back at her in sheer confusion. Then, locking a sharp, calculating gaze onto him, the woman called his name. To his surprise, she presented him with an official apprenticeship contract offer. Instantly, a system notification flashed into view, informing him that he had been transitioned back into the 8th floor waiting room. Coming to his senses, Seong-yun realized he was sitting upright on his bed. Still visibly startled by the whirlwind encounter, he got up and opened the exclusive contractor shop interface. A holographic display materialized before him, dividing into distinct columns: skill category, power category, item category, and the iron-blooded contract.
He blinked in astonishment, murmuring to himself that he had genuinely formalized a binding covenant with a tower administrator. In his mind, an image of the blonde woman holding an ancient scroll resurfaced, recalling her statement that she simply couldn't afford to pass up a challenger who was both exceptionally talented and phenomenally brave. The system interface generated a confirmation prompt, asking if he wished to finalize the contract of protection. Seong-yun firmly tapped yes. With that single input, the covenant was officially sealed. The system announced that an exclusive contractor shop was now unlocked, granting him access to a specialized currency pool known as Special Points, SP. Furthermore, as an innate perk of the contractor status, all of his baseline character statistics were permanently augmented by one complete tier. The mental image of the woman returned as she let out a delighted laugh, bidding him farewell until their next meeting before authoritatively striking the system's exempt executive.
With that, the high-tier power category within the exclusive shop expanded. The system screen listed a vast array of available authorities. Scanning the text, Seong-yun reasoned. So, there are defined tiers within this classification as well. I wonder what structural difference lies between a standard authority and a unique authority unlocked here on the 8th floor. At the bottom of the interface, a page-turning icon caught his eye, and Seong-yun reached out to investigate the advanced listings. However, a restrictive system prompt immediately blocked his input, stating that his current clearance level was insufficient to view the advanced authority manifest. It noted that the restricted logs would only become accessible once he breached the 10th floor waiting room. Staring intently at the glowing screen, he murmured, "So, only these 3 basic authorities are available to me at this stage." He then opened a sub-window detailing one specific option: Authority, Purity of Mind, Cost 1000 SP, Description, Passive Optimization. The logs indicated that under extreme, sub-zero environmental hazards, the user's temporary parameters would surge and they would be completely insulated from experiencing the psychological and physical trauma of freezing temperatures. Seong-yun knit his brows, finding the overall phrasing a bit ambiguous. Should I perhaps play it safe and save up 100,000 points first? He debated. Ultimately, however, he decided to trust his instincts and press the purchase key. A confirmation chime resonated as the system reported his successful acquisition of Purity of Mind. Exactly 1000 SP was instantly deducted from his total balance. Visualizing his past grueling trials, like scaling sheer cliffs in hostile environments, Seong-yun calculated that an authority capable of preserving absolute mental clarity in any critical situation was an invaluable asset. It was infinitely wiser to actively bolster his survival rate through these modifications than to charge in completely unprepared, especially given the unpredictable threat of cross-world floor invasions.
Suddenly, a swirling portal manifested directly in front of him, inquiring if he was prepared to initiate the 8th floor trial. Immediately following his confirmation, the system broadcasted the official parameters. The 8th floor trial has commenced. Difficulty, high. Objective theme, ruin. Success condition, neutralize the Lich Commander summoning the Skeletal Legions. Failure condition, death of the challenger. Penalty for failure, absolute demise. Clearance bonus, all baseline statistics permanently increased by +2. Seong-yun lowered his gaze, his eyes widening in profound shock as he peered over the edge of a massive precipice. Down in the canyon below, a terrifying sea of thousands of skeletons was tightly swarming the terrain. How can there possibly be this many? He thought, his mind racing. Observing the staggering layout, he deduced that the dungeon's primary strategy was to simply overwhelm challengers through sheer crushing numbers. The skeletal vanguard locked their hollow gazes up at him from the basin, and Seong-yun decided it was time to move. Without a shred of hesitation, he vaulted off the cliff edge. The moment his boots made impact with the ground, he detonated a massive kinetic shockwave across the dirt. Despite the impact, the massive horde immediately swarmed, completely surrounding his position. One skeleton lunged with its rusted blade, followed instantly by a dozen more. Seong-yun remained perfectly composed, noting flatly that, just as he had calculated, their baseline attack potency couldn't even scratch his basic passive defense. He then unleashed a sweeping counterattack. A system log flashed across his vision. Trait mastery increased by 0.08%. Seong-yun furrowed his brow in sheer annoyance, a meager 0.08%. Each sweeping arc of his blade shattered multiple skeletons simultaneously, minusculely ticking his mastery upward. Raising his hand slightly towards his face to evaluate his output, he concluded that trying to manually grind his trait progression against these low-level fodder units in this trial was an exercise in futility.
Suddenly, a booming, distorted voice echoed across the battlefield.
Who goes there?
What pathetic mortal dares to trigger such unholy chaos within my sacred temple? Seong-yun snapped his head around, utilizing his perception to trace the source of the acoustic echo in the far distance. Raising 2 fingers in a calculated gesture, he triggered his active skill, Summon Death. The shattered bones of the fallen enemies instantly began to violently piece themselves back together, rising from the dirt. He systematically absorbed their ambient residual energies to manifest his own custom skeleton vanguard. To his surprise, one of his newly raised trolls instantly snapped up a heavy stone and violently bashed another enemy skeleton over the skull. Seong-yun blinked, thoroughly amused, noting to himself that his skeletal soldiers were proving to be surprisingly resourceful in a brawl. Scratching the back of his head, he decided to leave his custom vanguard behind to tie up the low level for their units. Meanwhile, he would forge a direct path straight toward the head of the enemy snake, the dungeon boss itself. The remaining enemy skeletons watched in absolute terror as the challenger transformed into a blur of motion, blitzing past their lines. A rapid succession of system notifications flooded his interface. Skill, Grace of the Wind, activated. Velocity increased by 60%. Current momentum accumulation 67. Exclusive passive effect, Speed Boost C+, active. Chaining his skills, he instantly triggered instantaneous acceleration, causing his operational speed to skyrocket exponentially. He practically flew over the massive sea of the undead, tearing past the rearguard before touching down and continuing his high-velocity sprint. In the distance, an ancient monolithic structure loomed large against the bleak horizon. Locking his eyes onto the architecture, Seong-yun reasoned that the booming voice he had intercepted originated from deep within those stone walls. Without a moment's pause, he surged forward at maximum velocity. Upon breaching the inner sanctum, he came face to face with a skeletal figure draped in regal robes and crowned in gold.
Slowing his momentum to a halt, Seong-yun let out a satisfied smile, thoroughly pleased to have finally located his target. Brilliant, malevolent magic burned brightly within the hollow eye sockets of the undead king. The lich glared down at him, booming that a lowly, insignificant human had some nerve trespassing into its hallowed domain. Manifesting a colossal ancient spellbook before its frame, the lich declared that the intruder would pay for his insolence with his very life. Instantly, the ground ruptured as several towering colossal monsters materialized around the throne. Seong-yun looked up at the massive configurations of bone and flesh, analyzing them internally. Are these giant summons scaled to the same power tier as a desert golem? The lich sneered at Seong-yun, asking if the mortal finally comprehended the absolute despair of the territory he had blindly invaded. The colossal guardians stood like immovable pillars flanking their master, yet Seong-yun simply tilted his head, casually asking if the lich was capable of summoning anything even remotely stronger. Unsheathing his sword with a fluid flick of his wrist, he noted flatly that if this meager display was the absolute ceiling of the boss's arsenal, he was going to be profoundly disappointed. This casual insult drove the lich into a state of unbridled fury. Pointing a trembling skeletal finger at Seong-yun, the boss roared that these ancient guardians were more than generic tools. They were little executioners that would happily rip his arrogant mouth right off his face. On that command, the giant monsters launched a coordinated charge. Simultaneously, a flashing prompt notified Seong-yun that instantaneous acceleration was fully off cooldown and active. Moving with lightning velocity, Seong-yun closed the distance in a literal blink of an eye. In a singular fluid blur, he cleanly decapitated the giant guardians one after the other, before instantly materialized directly in front of his primary adversary. Pulling his arm back, he delivered a crushing heavy strike straight into the lich's frame. Another system lock pink, unique trait mastery increased by 1.2%. Delighted by the sudden spikes in percentage, Seong-yun placed a hand over his chest, realizing that fighting high-tier undead variants exponentially accelerated his specialized skill development.
The now legless, severed upper torso of the lich slumped pathetically onto the stone floor, completely paralyzed by sheer confusion and absolute terror. From the monster's desperate perspective, Seong-yun loomed over it like an invincible god of death, his eyes burning with an unholy, blood-red glow. Seong-yun took a slow, measured step closer, raising his blade to deliver the final blow, thinking it was time to wrap up the trial. However, right at that microsecond, something on the floor caught his eye. The ancient spellbook lay wide open amidst the rubble. He deduced that the Lich was able to freely manifest those high-tier giant guardians strictly by channeling the magical matrix of that specific book. A dark, brilliant grin broke across his face as a tactical idea formed. If I play my cards right, perhaps I can completely harvest and master the summoning mechanics for myself. He casually kicked the spellbook back towards his trembling adversary and asked, "Are you capable of manifesting those giant guardians again?" The Lich blinked its glowing eyes in utter bewilderment, stammering out a confused question as to why its executioner would ever demand such a thing. Seong-yun closed the distance, his shadow completely enveloping the fallen boss, as he replied flatly that if the Lich couldn't perform the summon again, then its existence would end right here and now. Consumed by absolute survival panic, the Lich frantically nodded, shrieking that it could absolutely initiate the spell again. Seong-yun pressed further, demanding to know the exact cooldown parameters for the summon. The skeleton quickly explained that it could re-manifest the guardians a mere few minutes after the previous unit's life signatures were extinguished. One of the massive decapitated carcasses still lay twitching nearby. Seong-yun verified the timeline. So, technically speaking, you are fully capable of initiating the summon right this second. The Lich stammered back, "Yes, but why? Are they not completely insignificant and meaningless before your strength?" Seong-yun offered zero verbal response. He merely balanced his blade on his palm, stating coldly that the conversation was starting to bore him.
Terrified, the Lich frantically flipped through its spellbook and initiated the summoning ritual once more. Two colossal giants instantly materialized and lunged forward, but in a fraction of a second, Seong-yun cleanly diced them into pieces without breaking a sweat. The Lich sat frozen before him, trembling as it asked if his twisted satisfaction had finally been met. Resting his sword casually over his shoulder, Seong-yun looked down at the boss and replied with a chilling smile, "We're just getting started." He violently kicked the Lich across the floor, delivering a harsh command. Reconstruct every single skeleton remaining in this dungeon and channel the absolute maximum capacity of your mana pool into upgrading those guardians. True to his commands, an endless cycle of newly manifested giant monsters arose, only to instantly lose their heads to Seong-yun's blinding slashes. A single concentrated shockwave from his blade pulverized them into microscopic bone fragments. Completely broken and weeping in pure psychological terror, the Lich cried out into the void, "Just how long do I have to keep doing this?" Seong-yun continued his relentless systematic slaughter of the spawned entities, a terrifying unbothered grin carved over his face as he replied, "Until I explicitly tell you to stop." One of the newly buffed guardians threw a colossal boulder-sized fist directly at the protagonist's skull. Moving with effortless precision, Seong-yun merely raised a single finger, completely halting the massive kinetic trajectory of the punch with trivial ease. He fluidly vaulted up the length of the monster's massive arm. With a few blinding flashes of his sword, the giant's head was cleanly severed from its shoulders. A glorious system notification detonated across his vision. Skill mastery increased by 1.2%. As the massive carcass of the final giant collapsed heavily into the dust, the system interface broadcasted a grand definitive announcement. The mastery level of your unique trait, Necromancy, has officially achieved 100%.
Seong-yun gazed at the blinding radiant light in absolute awe. The mastery tier of his unique trait, Necromancy, had successfully broken through its limits and evolved. A confident smile spread across his face as he realized his necromancy magic had officially reached rank C. Suddenly, a raspy, distorted voice pulled him out of his thoughts, crying out that he was completely insane. The shattered skeletal remains of the Lich lay scattered across the floorboards, bitterly cursing him and calling Seong-yun a monstrous devil capable of making actual demons tremble in sheer psychological terror. The Lich vehemently swore that its grudge would haunt and curse him even from beyond the grave, letting out a final hollow gasp. Seong-yun stepped closer to the fractured skull, calmly observing that the fissures running across the monster's bones multiplied exponentially every single time it forced a high-tier summon. A definitive sign that its structural durability had reached its absolute limits. Raising his blade and pulling his arm back, Seong-yun prepared to deliver the definitive coup de grace. He casually remarked that it was quite a shame, as he honestly intended to exploit the Lich as a high-yield training tool for just a little bit longer. With a clean flash of his sword, the skeleton's head was severed. The Lich's absolute final words muttered that crossing paths with Seong-yun was the most repulsive, sickening event it had ever experienced in its entire existence. Instantly, the system interface flashed a grand announcement. The challenger has unlocked the hidden achievement, One Who Surpasses Demons. His agility parameter was permanently increased by +1 point.
Furthermore, executing spirit absorption on the Lich's fading soul systematically boosted his underlying necromancy mastery by a staggering 17.4%. At that exact moment, the protagonist extended his palm, systematically siphoning the dense crimson energy swirling in the air. A flood of new system locks detonated across his vision, detailing the elite rewards for successfully conquering the 8th floor of the Trial Tower. Seong-yun received a flat +2 permanent stat boost to all core attributes, 30,000 baseline achievement points, 700 SP, and another 300 SP as a specialized contractor bonus.
A glowing blue vortex manifested the center of the room, safely extracting him back to the hub. The system locks quickly refreshed. Now entering the 9th floor waiting room, system expansion initiated. Administrators are now officially permitted to live spectate active trials. All previous structural restrictions on answering challenger inquiries have been completely abolished. Rank C skills are now fully unlocked and available for purchase within the skill shop. His character status interface automatically expanded, displaying the protagonist's optimized attributes. Seong-yun stood quietly before the floating holographic displays, carefully reviewing the dense layout of data. One specific column highlighted the current mechanics of his unique trait: Necromancy, Rank C. Mastery level 0%. Basic effect, the user can systematically siphon the souls of the deceased to permanently augment base parameters or instantly replenish mana reserves. Additional effect, upon executing spirit absorption, there is an innate 20% probability to completely harvest and assimilate one of the active skills embedded within the target soul. Furthermore, harvested souls can be deployed as an active physical armor matrix. However, the ongoing mana expenditure will scale proportionally to the offensive authority of incoming hostile strikes. Skill Siphon fully absorbs the complete mastery profile of a skill from a consumed soul. Seong-yun let out a satisfied smile, noting to himself that an ability capable of directly siphoning clean skills was nothing short of an absolute cheat code. This mechanism completely bypassed the tedious necessity of manually grinding a brand new skill's mastery right from zero. The system interface reiterated that the baseline probability to harvest a skill from a consumed soul set firmly at 20%. Seong-yun noted with satisfaction that this underlying engine was now fully operational for his build.
Swiping through the floating screens, he fell into deep calculation. The 8th floor trial had proceeded exceptionally smoothly. However, there was absolutely zero guarantee that the upcoming 9th floor trial would prove to be an equally trivial walk in the park. Therefore, he recognized the critical necessity of making thorough, airtight preparations. He inspected the edge of his primary blade, noting that the weapon's durability was still perfectly viable for high-intensity combat. However, his glaring bottleneck lay squarely within his offensive sword techniques. A blue sub-window expanded to display the detailed breakdown of his current combat skill, Hunter's Dagger. Description: a practical, high-efficiency close-quarters technique engineered by veterans for optimized monster hunting. Effect: slashing authority is amplified by 1.5 times when utilizing a dagger class weapon. Innate comprehension of specialized dagger technical lines is permanently enhanced. Reviewing the data, Seong-yun reasoned that since this specific skill had reached its absolute maximum cap, it was the perfect time to source a replacement sword technique. The skill shop interface expanded, presenting a vast catalog of available combat matrices. Seong-yun systematically swiped through the screens, scrolling down the text logs one by one. However, a wave of mild disappointment washed over him. Not a single listed skill managed to catch his eye or fit his specific tactical needs. Clicking his tongue in mild irritation, he muttered, "If the shop doesn't harbor a suitable skill, then I'll simply engineer one myself." A shower of digital gold coins cascaded down as he finalized the purchase of basic fencing rank E, instantly deducting 25,000 points from his account balance. The screen immediately flashed the operational parameters of his new baseline acquisition: basic swordsmanship, mastery 0%. Description: a foundational technical matrix compiling core forms from multiple historical sword disciplines. Effect: broadens overall tactical comprehension of blade class weapons. Amplifies slashing authority by exactly 1.5 times when wielding a sword. Note: this specific authority multiplier cannot be stacked with conflicting weapon technique modifiers.
Seong-yun beresonate that this baseline skill would serve as an exceptional canvas for modification. He immediately began manipulating the holographic interfaces.
If his objective was to elevate the baseline tier of Hunter's Dagger via advanced skill synthesis, he needed to meticulously calculate the underlying compatibility coefficients between his targeted techniques. Among his entire current combat inventory, basic swordsmanship emerged as the most mathematically compatible match. The synthesis interface displayed a visual representation of the two skills selected for fusion, Hunter's Dagger and basic swordsmanship. He firmly locked in both choices. A system prompt instantly flashed. Warning! Material tiers are fundamentally asymmetrical. The new technique will be synthesized using the structural blueprint of Hunter's Dagger as the primary catalyst. Probability of successfully synthesizing a higher tier skill? 75%. Without a moment's hesitation, he tapped the confirmation key to execute the synthesis. A brilliant, blinding chime resonated through the chamber, indicating that the synthesis protocol had concluded successfully and a brand new technique had been engineered. A pillar of radiant energy washed over Seong-yun's frame, signaling the official manifestation of the advanced skill, Demon Slayer Swordsmanship. The corresponding icon and dense data logs instantly populated his display. Skill: Demon Slayer Swordsmanship. Mastery: 0%. Description: an elite specialized blade discipline engineered exclusively for the systematic hunting and termination of demonic entities. Primary effect: substantially elevates baseline tactical comprehension across all weapon disciplines while instantly tripling total slashing authority when wielding a sword. Note: this specific authority multiplier cannot be stacked with conflicting weapon technique modifiers. Additional effect: when engaged in direct combat against non-human entities, the user's baseline attack velocity is permanently doubled. Reviewing the specialized parameters, Seong-yun noted that this skill was exceptionally lethal against non-human targets. It was blindingly obvious that this entire technique had been custom-tailored strictly for high-yield monster culling. A look of deep satisfaction broke across his face.
Just as he had previously theorized, the skill synthesis system was an invaluable asset for building an optimized loadout. Realizing he still held several unutilized scroll cards in his inventory, he began calculating the viability of executing further fusions. Tapping away at the screen, Seong-yun noted to himself that he had carefully vetted the underlying compatibility scores alongside the localized success probabilities for the remaining inventory. A succession of sub-windows rapidly materialized on his layout. Accelerated regeneration fused seamlessly with resistance to the loss of nature, yielding a rare technique designated as Iron-Blooded Regeneration. Moving a step further, he selected Iron-Blooded Regeneration and fused it directly with Pain Tolerance, triggering a high-tier synthesis into Ashen Blood. The ambient light in the waiting room grew blindingly brilliant. Seong-yun stared intently at the holographic screen, consumed by profound curiosity. The advanced description for Ashen Blood finally stabilized on his screen. Skill: Ashen Blood. Description: a supreme innate racial trait natively manifested by high-tier mutant vampires from birth. Effect: the user's passive regeneration coefficients scales proportionally to their core physical endurance parameter. Total regeneration velocity is violently tripled the exact moment the user inflicts physical damage onto a target. Furthermore, based on total missing health percentages, up to 40% of all incoming psychological and physical pain vectors can be completely neutralized and blocked. Staring straight ahead, he blinked in absolute amazement. He reasoned internally that a flat threefold amplification to baseline regeneration parameters was already a massive cheat code on its own, but coupling that with an automated pain negation matrix was completely broken. He immediately reached down to unseat his blade, noting aloud that because the waiting room came equipped with an automated high-tier systemic healing aura, he wouldn't be able to accurately stress test the operational limits of his new passive skill here.
However, he calculated that sacrificing a mere 120 points to override the room parameters would be a negligible expense. Seconds later, a new system log pinged. The waiting room's automated recovery field has been manually deactivated. 50 points have been deducted from your account balance. Physical exhaustion will now accumulate normally, and physical trauma will no longer automatically mend. Fired up with intense anticipation, Seong-yun raised his sword high above his head. He was acutely aware that because he had fully consolidated his current soul pool, his external spiritual shields could not be triggered. Swinging the heavy blade downward, he left a brilliant, hyper-accelerated trail of light hanging in the air as he initiated his self-inflicted test. Drops of crimson blood sprayed outward across the floorboards as he systematically slashed his own arms. Yet the moment he raised his hands to inspect the damage, the deep lacerations instantly closed up and vanished as though they had never existed. Watching the emerald, life-giving energies tightly enveloping his physical form, he recognized that this skill was genuinely magnificent. Even when operating outside of a designated safety hub, he would essentially exist under the perpetual influence of an immortal healing factor. Straightening his sleeve, he reasoned that alongside this god-tier regeneration, he still retained his active spiritual shield arrays. Frankly speaking, his current survivability loadout was practically complete. Turning toward the stone wall, however, he noted to himself that shields are meant to be pushed to their breaking limits until they shattered. He casually opened up the Global Community tab, scrolling through the public chat logs, but quickly concluded that the public channels contained absolutely zero high-value data. Suddenly, a roaring portal violently tore open directly in front of his position. His allotted countdown timer within the waiting room had reached absolute zero. There was no longer any logical reason to delay his progression.
A sequence of rapid system prompts flashed into view. Access to the 9th floor of the trial tower is now fully operational. Difficulty, high. Objective theme, combat. Allotted time remaining, 1 day. Success condition, neutralize all hostile monster configurations within the arena perimeter within the designated countdown. Failure condition, death of the challenger or expiration of the countdown. Clearance reward, active skill, animal instinct. Failure penalty, absolute demise. However, right before he could cross the threshold, a massive bloodhack warning override detonated across the holographic layout. The interface broadcasted an emergency alert. Critical event. The 9th floor trial instance allocated to Challenger Seong-yun has been compromised and is currently classified as unsecure. An unauthorized dimension breach has been executed by a challenger hailing from the Murim world. The primary trial objectives have been systematically poached and eliminated by the foreign invader. In a flash of light, Seong-yun materialized inside the arena, instantly locking eyes with the strange figure. He intensely furrowed his brow as he analyzed the foreign entity. The man stood completely unbothered, perched casually atop a massive mountain of slaughtered dungeon monsters. Looking down at the newcomer, the invader let out a calm smile and remarked that Seong-yun had finally decided to show up. Concurrently, the system interface warped violently as the trial objective updated. The white-robed swordsman casually introduced himself as a high-ranking commander representing the righteous alliance of the Murim world, Sun Hackback. Simultaneously, a definitive system mandate flashed across Seong-yun's vision, ordering the protagonist to eliminate Sun Hack immediately.
The gray-haired man stood with his head bowed. Seong-yun merely stared at his opponent in silence. When the man demanded his name, Seong-yun countered, "Why are you suddenly so eager to know my name?" The old man replied that he had already been polite enough to introduce his own name and prestigious position first. With a dead serious look, Seong-yun stated flatly that since the old man clearly hadn't come with good intentions, there was absolutely no point in exchanging pleasantries. Without even opening his eyes, the old man remarked that a distinct etiquette existed among true swordsmen, calling the protagonist narrow-minded. Observing the senior, Seong-yun thought to himself that not a single challenger from these foreign systems could ever be considered normal. The old man then unsheathed his weapon, declaring that if Seong-yun insisted on concealing his identity, he had no choice but to accept this duel. He instantly blitzed forward to launch an attack. His sword left a brilliant trail of magic, and a split second later, dozens of materialized magical blades manifested to encircle his target. The system flashed a notification indicating that Seong-yun had triggered Grace of the Wind, increasing his overall velocity by 30% with his current momentum accumulation hitting tier 37. Seong-yun locked his eyes forward, focusing intensely. Activating the skill, he began systematically parrying his opponent's rapid strikes. After a flurry of heavy clashes, both combatants deflected off one another and retreated a few paces. Lowering his blade, the old man muttered, "To think a player of this caliber actually exists within this primitive dimension." Seong-yun merely stared back as Sun Hack offered a hollow apology for underestimating him. Seong-yun let out a heavy sigh. The old man gasped in surprise when Seong-yun bluntly told him to cut the hypocritical act. As dense smoke enveloped the arena, Seong-yun firmly stated that Sun Hack had crossed dimensions for the sole purpose of murdering him and poaching his rewards, so why was he pretending to be a gentleman? Sun Hack locked a deep gaze on him, noting that perhaps because they hailed from entirely different worlds, mutual understanding was simply impossible. With that, Sun Hack raised his weapon, violently blowing away the surrounding smoke.
His sword ignited, triggering a raging storm of energy. He stated coldly, "Farewell, nameless player." Suddenly, an urgent system prompt overrode the interface. Due to the opponent's active unique trait, sword-like, challenger Seong-yun has been inflicted with absolute blindness for 5 seconds. Seong-yun felt a flash of panic, standing trapped in pitch darkness, completely unable to see anything. Concurrently, another window materialized, alerting him that his magic-resistant skill had successfully deployed. He raised his blade defensively, the exact moment a faint acoustic cue echoed from his blind spot. His spiritual eye triggered instantaneously, mapping the enemy's blade as it drove straight toward the back of his head. Seong-yun managed to execute a desperate evasion, though the strike still left a deep gash.
the system interface reported that he had unlocked the hidden achievement, Avoidance of Blindness, permanently increasing his agility parameter by +2 points. His counter swing left a glowing arc in the air. The darkness instantly receded as his vision restored. The blindness effect from sword luck had officially expired. The old man pulled his blade back into a defensive guard. Breaking into a cold sweat, Seong-yun stared at him, acutely aware that his neck had very nearly been severed. Sun-hak locked a piercing glare onto him, demanding, "How on earth did you accurately read the trajectory of my blade while completely blind?" A new notification flashed. Instantaneous acceleration activated, stacked with Grace of the Wind. Agility multiplier increased by 50%. Seong-yun planted his hand firmly against the dirt, forcefully launching himself forward. Sun-hak braced for impact. Their swords clashed violently, triggering a massive kinetic discharge as the tips of their blades ground against one another. Seong-yun fluidly spanned his body, attempting to drive a heavy kick into his opponent.
However, the old man deftly took a step back to evade. The protagonist immediately followed up with a vicious slashing strike, but Sun-hak managed to intercept and pin his wrist. Both combatants stood locked in a high-intensity stalemate, straining against each other's weapons. The old man sneered, "You employ a truly bizarre strain of dark magic." Seong-yun calculated internally that although his personal capabilities had evolved substantially, their respective unique traits seemed to be completely on par. Suddenly, the earth beneath their boots ruptured as Sun-hak's arms flared with a malevolent light. He boomed, "Now I shall get serious." The sweeping arc of his sword once again left a blinding trail of radiant energy. Due to the overlapping effects of the specialized technique, Seong-yun was plunged right back into absolute blindness for another 5 seconds. He found himself trapped in total darkness yet again. However, the system interface reported that his magic resistance had actively mitigated the duration, successfully reducing the blindness down to 2.5 seconds. His spiritual eye triggered flawlessly within the dark void, mapping a high-velocity trail of light driving straight toward him. Pulling his sword back to block, Seong-yun realized that the enemy's attack velocity had spiked drastically. One of the incoming slashes narrowly bypassed his guard. Fortunately, the system reported that the exclusive effect of his leonine-forged iron pendant, Steel Defense, had actively deployed, generating a barrier matrix that successfully absorbed 10% of all incoming physical damage factors. He managed to parry yet another lethal strike, but the sheer velocity cost him. His left arm was cleanly severed from his torso. His pain-tolerant skill instantly triggered. Staring down at the gaping, bloody wound, Seong-yun fell into deep calculation, wondering if his steel-tier passive defense parameters were truly insufficient to withstand the old man's offensive authority. A new prompt pinged. The blinding effect from the opponent's unique trait, Sword Light, has officially concluded.
The old man stood at the opposite side of the clearing, casually swinging his blade to clear the blood. Debris and stones began to float around Seong-yun's boots. He forcefully pivoted backward, shattering one of the massive boulders with his foot and launching the heavy fragments directly at his adversary as a distraction. The old man read the trajectory instantly. With a single fluid stroke of his sword, he cleanly cleaved the incoming rock in two. Using that exact window of distraction, Seong-yun surged forward, biting down hard on his severed limb. Through that desperate, unorthodox maneuver, he successfully maneuvered himself directly into his opponent's blind spot. As Sun-hak whirled around, his eyes widened to find Seong-yun already standing directly behind him. In that exact microsecond, Seong-yun's high-tier regeneration fully knitted his severed arm back onto his body. Averting his gaze, Sun-hak remarked condescendingly that the advanced techniques his opponent had been deploying, while superficially impressive, were clearly nothing more than cheap skills borrowed from the system architecture. He admitted he had briefly misjudged him, thinking he was facing a true master of martial arts. Gripping his newly restored hand into a tight fist, Seong-yun replied flatly that every single unique trait utilized within these trials was, fundamentally speaking, a skill extracted from the tower anyway. Another notification detonated across his vision. Skill, Blessing of the Wind activated. Total velocity multiplier increased by 70%. Current momentum accumulation, 7 out of 7 tiers. Chaining his movements with the skill, Seong-yun let out a sharp smile and countered. "You criticize others so freely, yet you remain entirely blind to your own hypocrisies." Holding his blade firmly across his chest, he openly mocked the old man's double standards. The senior snarled, "Are you truly going to rely on that vile dark magic again? As a proper swordsman, relying on borrowed system skills is a deeply repulsive disgrace."
At that exact instant, Seong-yun had already initiated a lightning-fast preemptive strike, driving his blade downward. The old man barely managed to raise his weapon to parry the crushing blow. Startled by the sudden jump in kinetic force, Seong-yun smirked.
In that case, how about you die at the hands of this very borrowed skill? Shifting his weight to press his blade down with even greater authority, Sanhak's mind drifted back to the endless ocean of adversaries he had slaughtered in his past. He had successfully cleared this exact same floor challenge dozens of times across alternate instances. In his memory, fresh blood dripped continuously from his blade, the very sort he had used to ruthlessly execute challenges originating from countless foreign worlds. In his experience, the humans hailing from the dimension known as Earth were exceptionally weak and pathetically unoptimized across every single attribute parameter. Within the Murim crossover circles, that specific dimension was openly mocked as a honeypot due to how laughably easy its candidates were to conquer and poach. He stood with his eyes closed in supreme confidence. The trash-deer challengers from Earth had never even been capable of touching a single hair on his head, especially not after he triggered his blinding sword-like unique trait. A single generic sword form was usually more than enough to slaughter them all. Now, as he effortlessly slipped past Seong-yun's incoming trajectory, he felt entirely assured that history was about to repeat itself.
However, as he executed his backstep, a deep, unexpected laceration violently opened across his flesh. Ancient, glowing runic circles suddenly materialized across the sky, forcing Sanhak to retreat even further in shock. Seong-yun took a deep, calculated breath, while the old man found himself heavily panting for air. A series of grand administrative text logs began to pop up directly over their heads. The administrator of the White Crane Sword expresses deep admiration for the young challenger's execution. The administrator of the Northern Beast explicitly forecasts the old man's absolute defeat. The administrator of the Midnight Sovereign registers deep fascination with the challenger. The administrator of the Black Archipelago hero stands towerly spellbound by the challenger's technical proficiency. The old man locked a venomous, hyper-focused glare onto Seong-yun. Suddenly, a flood of elite offensive skill prompts flooded Seong-yun's interface. Skill, 1 strike 2 skins active. Total cutting potency of the blade is doubled for the next offensive sequence. Skill, Kui Lightning Sword active. High-yield lightning elemental energy is channeled directly into the weapon matrix. Skill, 1 slash active. Slashing authority is amplified twofold. Skill, Nim Step active. Base velocity is multiplied by 200% for a duration of 1 minute. Seong-yun let out a wide mocking grin, fully recalling how the old man had just been ranting about his reliance on borrowed system skills. Concurrently, a massive red systemic intervention warning flashed. Emergency directive. Enforcement penalty for Floor 2 has been actively deployed against the invader. All baseline parameters are reduced by 8 points, and multiple high-tier skills are forcibly restricted. The old man's face contorted into a mask of pure, unbridled rage as his 1 strike 2 skins and Kui Lightning Sword techniques were forcibly uninstalled and grayed out by the system engine.
At that exact second, the cooldown parameter for his unique trait, Sword Light, finally reset. The moment he frantically reactivated the blinding flash, Seong-yun deliberately allowed himself to be enveloped by the shadows. Having engaged the old man for several minutes, his perception had completely memorized and adapted to the enemy's offensive patterns. His spiritual eye tracked the field flawlessly through the light. The old man opened his mouth wide, screaming a frenzied, desperate roar that he would personally rip the mortal's life from his chest. A catastrophic beam of condensed radiant energy was discharged straight towards Seong-yun's position. Bracing his stance, Seong-yun countered by unleashing his 3 absolute non-negotiable ultimate techniques simultaneously. The 3 overlapping strikes were heavily amplified by his active skill multipliers. Seong-yun tightly grit his teeth and swung his blade with everything he had, leaving a blinding hyper-accelerated trail of destructive light hanging in the air. The final system log flashed across his vision, announcing that the dark effect of the sword light had officially expired. Seong-yun now stood calmly behind the old man, panting slightly to catch his breath, while his adversary froze completely motionless. A second later, Sunhak's legendary sword slipped from his fingers, clattering uselessly onto the stone floor. He desperately attempted to take a step forward, but his entire physical frame began to violently shudder. A massive horizontal laceration ruptured cleanly across his waistline. His eyes bulged out of his sockets, completely consumed by unadulterated fury and psychological denial. He shrieked into the empty arena that a defeat like this was mathematically and fundamentally impossible. Then a massive torrent of blood erupted from the wound and his severed torso collapsed heavily into the dirt. Seong-yun smiled as the system interface flashed a grand golden notification, warmly congratulating him on successfully conquering the 9th floor of the trial tower.